Imagine spending 10 agonizing years to beat the hardest game in history, only to be thrown inside it as a weak nobleman who is actively being poisoned to death by his own maid. In the real world, I was just an ordinary nobody who wasted my life staring at a screen in a dark room. Now I am trapped in a ruthless fantasy realm where my evil stepmother wants me dead. What looks like a guaranteed end to my new life is actually the ultimate playground for a hardcore player. My enemies think I am just a fragile boy ready to be slaughtered, but they have no idea they are dealing with the one and only game master who will force them to literally destroy their own powers. Let us go back to the very beginning to see how a lonely student transformed into the most terrifying mastermind of the entire continent. My story kicks off in a relatable but depressing way. My life was unremarkable. A classic slow burn intro setting the stage for major, life-altering changes. And here I am, your average student with glasses and brown hair. I must have looked so bored, just completely blank. I was just going through the motions of another dull day. The scene shifts to a typical suburban hallway in my house. It hammers home how normal my family background was. The definition of ordinary, nothing special or fancy going on here. I spent my days just existing, walking through school hallways while other kids socialized around me. I was a background character in my own life, living one unremarkable day after another. Even my hobbies were solitary. Just me, gaming in a dark room. I'd already accepted that my life would probably end without anything special ever happening. There I was, hunched over my computer desk late at night. The narration drops a hint, right? That wasn't the case. You know what that means. Things are about to get absolutely wild. Everything changed in an instant. My eye reflects my monitor's glow, and there's a sudden shift in intensity. I've finally seen something that actually caught my interest. I stared at this mysterious glowing screen, showing a small blonde character in a void. It looked like some secret game or a special prompt I wasn't expecting at all. Suddenly, a montage of epic battles and fantasy worlds flashes across the screen, titled Hero's Destiny. It was a total 180 from my boring life, showing everything from monsters to warriors. The character on screen transformed, and suddenly it was me standing in a digital space surrounded by memories. I was ready to trade my dull reality for this incredible new world. And check out this blonde-haired badass. Yeah, that's supposed to be me. Can you believe it? I lived like a completely different person, full of confidence and power compared to my real-life self. The transformation was complete, and I declared I became the ruler of the world. This version of me had glowing green eyes and an aura that screamed main character energy. School's finally out, and I'm practically rushing home to be alone. I was a total loner, claiming I neither liked nor disliked school, but clearly, I'd rather be anywhere else. First thing I did was hit that power button on my PC. This was my sanctuary, my escape from the boring real world. I sat down, lit only by the blue light of my monitor, feeling perfectly content. As long as I could play games alone, I felt like I had everything I needed. I cracked my knuckles and got in the zone, declaring that in this world, I am the protagonist. I looked way more excited here than I ever did in those school hallways. I explained the perks of single-player games to my stream, how you can save, reload, and do whatever you want. I saw it as a way to have perfect control over a world that valued me. My expression got super intense, with a close-up of my eye and a determined smirk. I wasn't just playing, I was living for the thrill of being in control. I believed the world existed solely for one player, me. I was fully immersed in the fantasy, forgetting everything about my unremarkable real life. I was getting ready to start my daily stream, putting on my headset and acting all casual for my viewers. I thought today was just another normal session, but boy was I wrong. The live start notification popped up on my screen with a glitchy effect. This is where things started to get interesting. The chat started rolling in, and some guy named Judy K was already roasting me for streaming on a weekday, asking if I even had classes. Yeah, the internet is ruthless, even to quiet kids like me. I tried to keep my cool while viewers argued over whether I was a genius or a loser. I just sat there thinking they couldn't decide if they were praising or roasting me. Suddenly, a notification popped up that AGJ sent $10. I was genuinely surprised because even a small donation was a big deal for a small streamer like me. I thought $10 was more than enough and prepared a quick thank you message. I looked humble and happy just to have some support. Then, out of nowhere, the screen exploded with a new donation. DEA sent $1,000. This wasn't just a tip, this was life-changing money for a student like me. I was frozen in shock, staring at the screen like I'd seen a ghost. My eyes were wide, my jaw practically on the floor. I started panicking, shouting and trying to process what just happened. Even the chat was going wild, wondering if it was a mistake or a prank. The chat was full of theories, people saying the donor might ask for a refund soon. Then, a message from DEA popped up, telling me they'd sent an email and to check it. I clicked over to my inbox and saw a single unread message with a notification. This was the moment everything started to shift. I stared at the screen, sweating a bit, murmuring about an email. I knew that whatever was in that message was tied to that massive $1,000 donation. The email was from a game developer who was a fan of my channel. They'd spent a long time making a game that was too hard for anyone to clear during the beta test. The text on screen emphasized that no one could beat this game during the closed beta. It sounded like the ultimate challenge for a hardcore gamer like me. I started thinking to myself about what would happen if I cleared the game. I was already hooked by the idea of being the first to conquer it. The screen repeated the challenge. No one could beat it during the beta test. It was like the game itself was taunting me to try my luck. A big grin spread across my face as I realized this was my chance to be special. I was tired of being ordinary and thought this game could be my path to greatness. The prompt to install the game appeared on my screen. It was titled Hero's Destiny, and it felt like a heavy choice. I slammed my mouse and shouted aloud, yes. I was fully committed, ready to dive into whatever Hero's Destiny had in store. The installation bar for Hero's Destiny filled up quickly, and the game started. The screen filled with a bright, digital blue glow. The game opened with dramatic lore about an imperial calendar and an era of chaos. There I was, a tiny figure standing in a vast, watery blue digital world. As the game loaded, I was a bit underwhelmed, thinking the graphics were worse than I expected. It asked me to enter my character's name. Pretty standard stuff. I shrugged it off. Since it was made by one person, bad graphics were expected. I decided my name was going to be... I typed on my glowing keyboard, choosing Game Master as my username. I was going for that ultimate gamer tag to show off my skills. The game welcomed me to the continent of Ellen, Game Master. It felt like a grand opening to a generic RPG, but I was ready for it. My character spawned in a basic-looking forest. I stood there, looking a bit confused by the simple surroundings. I noticed there was no tutorial and figured the controls must be simple enough. I felt confident, maybe a little too confident. I wandered a bit and spotted an NPC in the distance. I hoped this would lead to my first quest, or at least some basic info. The NPC was a creepy-looking village chief who asked me what business I had in his village. A text box popped up for me to type my response as Game Master. I was confused because there were no preset dialogue options. I had to manually type everything my character said, which is super unusual for a game like this. The cursor blinked in the empty dialogue box, waiting for my input. The game was giving me total freedom, which was both cool and intimidating. I typed on my keyboard, wondering if I really had to type out every single interaction. I thought there's no way that's right, but I went along with it. Trying to be a jokester, I typed out a message telling the chief to hand over his gold or I'd slaughter all the villagers. Clearly, I wasn't taking this seriously yet. I sat back with a smug look, waiting to see how the NPC would react to my edgy threat. I expected some generic response or a scripted fight. Big mistake. The village chief didn't play around and immediately struck me with a hoe. I was sent flying with a scream and a look of pure shock. My character hit the ground hard, and a message popped up. My eyelids feel heavy. I was already dying just moments after starting the game. The screen turned black with a "You died" message, followed by confirmation that the game master has perished. I was stunned, staring at the prompt asking if I'd like to retry. Back in reality, I was sweating and shaking, asking myself if I was really talking to an NPC. The level of AI interaction was way beyond anything I'd ever seen. The retry prompt just sat there, flickering on my screen. It was like the game was mocking my first failed attempt. I was pissed now, slamming my desk and shouting that I was definitely going to retry. My competitive gamer side was fully activated after that embarrassing death. I restarted, and the village chief asked the same question. This time, I decided to play it much safer and more humble. I typed a pathetic plea, saying I'd lost my way and hadn't had food or drink for some time. I asked the chief to show mercy to this pitiful soul, even putting on a fake cute face in my head. The chief fell for it and told me how unfortunate that was, inviting me to follow him. It seems acting like a beggar is the way to progress in this weirdly realistic world. We got to a house, and the chief offered me a cup, telling me to drink it to calm myself. I was grateful, thinking I'd finally gotten past the first hurdle. I took the cup without a second thought, giving a polite thank you to the old man. I was feeling good about my social engineering skills. I downed the whole thing in one go, thirsty from my long journey. I thought I was playing it perfectly, but the chief just watched me in silence. But then a message popped up. I'd been poisoned with slowly creeping death and my eyelids feel heavy. The old man poisoned me. I was dying again, sitting in the chair while my character slumped over. I couldn't believe it. This game was brutal and kept killing me in the most unexpected ways. I got a dark, determined look on my face and wondered what would happen if I did this. I was reaching my limit and was about to try something completely different. I started unplugging cables from my PC, shouting about what happens now. I thought I could bypass the game's logic by messing with the hardware or the connection. I was laughing like a maniac, thinking I'd found a loophole. I believed that even if the internet was down, I could still find a way to hack or control the NPCs. I typed total gibberish into the dialogue box, a jumble of random characters. I was trying to crash the system or confuse the AI. The game didn't care and gave me a gruesome death. It said the game master spouted nonsense, had his tongue ripped out, and bled to death. That is dark as hell. I let go of my mouse in disbelief as the screen glitched out. I was starting to realize this game followed its own terrifying rules. I was sweating bullets, realizing the game worked even without an internet connection. This wasn't just a weird indie game, it was something much more mysterious. I looked back at the email and saw the name DEA again. I started wondering who this person was and why they gave me this specific game. I was deep in thought, looking at the name DEA on my screen. I couldn't tell if it was a person's name or a development team, but I was definitely hooked. I looked at my digital clock and realized it was past 1:30 in the morning. I'd been so obsessed with this game I'd lost track of time. I decided to call it a night and clicked the save button. I looked exhausted but satisfied, knowing I'd found something truly special. As I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about how real the NPCs felt. I wondered if the world of Hero's Destiny actually existed somewhere. I was lying there with one arm over my eyes, thinking about why no one else could finish the beta test. I was already planning my next moves for when I woke up. A close-up of my face as I drifted off to sleep, lit by soft moonlight. I looked more at peace than I did at the start of the day. My eyes snapped open with a determined glow. This is getting exciting, I thought. I was no longer the bored student. I'd found a new purpose in this game. Fast forward, and the city buildings were back under a bright blue sky. Time passed as I continued my secret gaming obsession. I was back at my computer, clicking away at my mouse. I had to admit, ever since I started, I'd been so absorbed I had completely lost track of time. I clicked the load button on a high-tech looking menu. This had become my daily routine, the only thing I looked forward to. I clicked save again, showing how I was meticulously progressing. I was determined to see this through to the very end. There I was, hunched over in the dark, fully immersed. It was like the real world had completely faded away from me. I clicked load once more, ready for another session. This had been my life for a while now, and I wasn't planning on stopping. Suddenly, someone called out, "Oshiro," and I realized I was at an office job. I'd grown up. I was no longer that student in his bedroom. A big text box told me it was now 10 years later. I was a working adult, but some things never change. A pretty coworker with reddish hair brought me some files I requested. She looked at me with a soft, interested expression. I took the files with a polite, "Ah, thank you." I looked like a typical handsome office worker, wearing a tie and my familiar glasses. The clock on the wall showed it was past 8 at night, and she asked if I was finished with work. It was late, and we were some of the only people left. I told her, "Good work to you too, Suzuhara," but I didn't look at her. I was clearly focused on something else entirely. Suzuhara looked a bit hesitant, blushing slightly as she tried to find the words. She was trying to ask me something more personal. She finally worked up the courage and asked if I'd like to grab dinner before heading home. It was a clear invite, and she looked hopeful. I just stared back at her, and she started to look awkward under my gaze. The silence between us got heavy. I turned away and bluntly said, "Sorry, I have to head home." I shut her down without a second thought. She was left standing there with a shocked expression. She couldn't believe I just rejected her so easily after all that effort. I tried to soften the blow, saying today was an important day and maybe we could go another time, but I was already packing up. Suzuhara was left looking frustrated and disappointed, muttering about how she got dodged again. It seemed this wasn't the first time I'd turned her down. My apartment building at night, lit against the dark sky. This was where I was rushing to, my true sanctuary. I was back at my desk, looking more alive than I did at the office. I declared that today was the day I was finally going to beat Hero's Destiny. I let out a loud click as I made my final moves in the game. You could feel the tension as 10 years of gaming came down to this one moment. The final scene of the game played out against a beautiful sky backdrop. It was a peaceful, epic moment I'd been working toward for a decade. The screen flashed a congratulations message to Game Master. "You are the first human to join the ranks of the gods." I'd actually done it. I was the first one to ever clear the game. I sat there in my dark room, surrounded by notes and diagrams on my walls. I put an insane amount of effort into this, and it had finally paid off. I let out a huge cheer, shouting, "I finally beat it," with a pure, joyful smile. This was easily the happiest moment of my life. A close-up of my happy, blushing face. I glowed with a sense of achievement I never found in the real world. But then, my expression slowly faded into something more neutral and empty. The high of winning was starting to wear off, leaving me with a strange feeling. It had been 10 long years of my life dedicated to this one goal. I looked down at my hands, realizing how much time had passed. I reflected that even though I was a special hero in the game, My real life was still as ordinary as ever. I sat on the floor of my cramped apartment, back to reality. The text reinforced my mood, still as ordinary as ever. It was a crushing realization that my digital victory hadn't changed my real-world situation. I leaned back in my chair with a hollow look, saying it felt empty. The achievement I spent a decade on didn't feel as great as I thought it would. I thought back on the game, imagining myself as a hero standing in a beautiful, glowing field. It felt like I was living a different life during those gaming sessions. I remembered the complex characters I met, like the Black Prince Gale Krakow. The game world was so rich and detailed compared to my boring office job. I also thought of the Cardinal and the Witch of the Sealed Tower. They weren't just NPCs to me. They had unique personalities and charm that felt incredibly real. I recalled their reactions were so lifelike, it was impossible to tell them apart from real people. I truly felt those humans might exist somewhere nearby. I groaned and rubbed my face, muttering that it was really all over. I was grieving the end of the only world where I felt I belonged. Suddenly, I saw something on the screen that made me jump. I let out a surprised sound as a new prompt appeared. The screen asked if I wished for a new adventure, explaining that selecting yes would transport me to the continent of Ellen. I was stunned, wondering what this could be. I wondered if it was a hidden stage or a sequel. I was already getting that old familiar thrill back as I stared at the prompt. I thought if I could experience that thrill one more time, it would be worth anything. I reached for my mouse, my hand shaking slightly. I slammed the button and shouted that I had no choice but to do it. I was ready to dive back in, no matter what it took. The screen displayed it's transporting me to the continent of Ellen, with intense motion lines. This felt way more significant than a normal game loading screen. A deep, mysterious voice greeted me. "Welcome, Game Master, my apostle." This was definitely not part of the standard game dialogue. Everything went dark, and I panicked, feeling a burning sensation in my chest. I couldn't breathe and wondered what was happening to my body. I woke up in a luxurious room with high ceilings and fancy furniture. I was disoriented, wondering where I was and where my room went. A voice said they were so glad I woke up. It was a calm, reassuring voice, but I didn't recognize it. An older man with a mustache and a military-style uniform stood over me. He told me that if it weren't for a top-tier potion, I wouldn't have lived to see the light of day. A close-up of my eye, showing a reflection of the old man. My eye was a bright, clear teal color, definitely not my real eye color. The old man called me Calyx, and I saw I was now a beautiful, blonde-haired young man in a fancy bed. I'd officially been isekai'd into the world of my favorite game. Waking up in this new body was a total trip. The first thing I saw was this intense older guy reflected in my eye, and all I could choke out was a confused question about who he was. The old man stared back, a bit taken aback. Dressed like a high-ranking military official or a fancy butler, he just let out a thoughtful sound. He looked genuinely worried now, thinking the healer never mentioned any risk of amnesia. Great, I'd managed to confuse the locals within 5 seconds of waking up. I started to panic, clutching the blanket and looking around the unfamiliar room. I shouted at him, asking who he was and where we were, wondering if he really didn't realize I'd lost it. The man bowed deeply, placing a hand over his heart with total respect. He declared his name was Russell, but the name didn't ring a single bell. I lay back in bed, my mind racing. This wasn't Japan, and I was sure the language wasn't Japanese, yet I could understand every word perfectly. The situation was weird enough, but then something worse happened. A sharp, burning sensation started blooming right in my chest. I doubled over in agony, clutching my shirt as I screamed that my chest was burning. Russell lost his cool and shouted, "My lord," as he rushed to my side. Russell looked incredibly guilty, apologizing and saying it was his fault for rushing me. I was just trying to breathe through the fire in my ribs, barely hearing him. Russell told me not to worry, claiming the pain was just a side effect of using some potion. He promised it would subside later, but man, later couldn't come fast enough. Seeing I needed rest, Russell took his leave so I could recover. He said he'd be back in the morning, still calling me "my lord," with that heavy, formal tone. The heavy wooden doors clicked shut as he excused himself. Finally, I was alone in this strange, candlelit room to figure out what was going on. I groaned and rolled over, the pain finally dulling to a manageable throb. The room was dead silent, filled with shadows and the smell of old wood. On the nightstand was a flickering candle and a bowl of steaming porridge. It looked like typical sick person food in a fantasy setting. I let out a long, exhausted sigh. The immediate crisis was over, but the mystery of where I was had only just begun. I finally mustered the strength to swing my legs out of bed. My feet hit the rug, and I realized how much smaller and younger this body felt compared to my old one. I walked over to a tall, ornate mirror in the corner of the room. I had a sinking feeling in my gut, and seeing my reflection was the only way to confirm it. "Yup," I called it. The person staring back at me was a complete stranger, a handsome, blonde-haired kid with piercing eyes. This definitely wasn't my body. I stared at this new face, feeling a total disconnect and wondering who I was. The reflection looked back with the same confused, haunted expression I felt inside. I clutched my head as the realization hit hard. I could remember every detail of my 30 years as a gamer in Japan, but I couldn't remember my name in this world. I was hyperventilating, staring at my hands like they belonged to a ghost and shouting about who on earth I was. I needed answers, now. Just as I was about to lose it, a familiar blue glow lit up the air in front of me. It was a floating window, appearing out of thin air like a HUD in a video game. I froze, staring at the translucent screen floating in the middle of the room. I recognized this status screen. It looked exactly like the menus from the game I was obsessed with. My heart skipped a beat when I saw the Hero's Destiny logo at the top. This couldn't be a coincidence. Somehow, I'd ended up inside the game I just beat. The realization hit me like a lightning bolt. That new adventure prompt I clicked wasn't a sequel. It was a literal transport to the game world. I'd been isekai'd into the continent of Ellen. I flashed back to my old life, sitting at my messy desk in front of my PC. I was the guy who cleared the hardest game in history, and now I was its main character. A map of the continent flickered onto the screen, showing the vast lands I spent 10 years exploring virtually. It was all real now, from snowy peaks to deep forests. I forced myself to breathe, telling myself to calm down. I paced in my head, trying to process that my life had just become a high-stakes RPG. I stood by the massive bookshelves, deep in thought. If I was really here, I needed to know who this character was and how much power I had. Just as I was getting my bearings, that fire in my chest flared up again. The pain was back with a vengeance, reminding me I wasn't in peak condition. I collapsed, gasping for air as the pain tore through me. I wondered how this could hurt so badly, yet I hadn't woken up. It was ultimate proof this wasn't a dream. Lying on the rug, I finally accepted the truth. This wasn't a glitch or a hallucination. This was reality, and I had to survive it. I pushed myself up, my expression turning serious. If I was going to survive, I had to commit. I decided that for now, I should get used to the name Calyx Shekin. I am Calyx Shekin. The status screen flickered back into view as if responding to my resolve. The game interface was directly linked to my thoughts. I stood there, looking at the floating data as if I was back in front of my monitor. The familiar blue glow was actually comforting in this fancy room. I realized this status screen was a hidden feature only I could see. It gave me a massive advantage. I had a world-class player's information in a real fantasy world. It was incredible. Just thinking about the status screen made it pop up instantly. It was like having a super-powered encyclopedia built into my vision. I couldn't help but grin, thinking this was useful. Step 1 of my new life: gather every scrap of information I could find before I had to face the world. My face went dark and serious. I knew if I let my guard down, I'd die quickly in this world. I remembered how brutal this game was. One wrong dialogue choice and it's game over for real. I read my own stats. Name Calyx Shekin. Age 15, status noble. It was wild seeing my new identity laid out in cold, digital text like this. I realized I was part of the Shekin earldom's direct family. I thought I'd hit the jackpot. Being high-ranking nobility meant resources, power, and hopefully some protection while I leveled up. A sharp knock on the door broke my concentration. Someone was coming, and I needed to look like I knew what I was doing. I froze, my eyes darting toward the door. I wondered who it was. I had no idea how Calyx usually talked or acted. I told myself to calm down, my heart racing. If I messed up and they realized I was an imposter, I was a dead man walking. I repeated my new identity like a mantra, trying to burn it into my brain. I am Calyx Shekin, a direct descendant of the Earl family. I am Calyx Shekin. A maid was outside. I could see the back of her head through the gap. I tried to sound authoritative and asked, "What is it?" She held a tray with a small bowl on it. She said it was time for my medicine, her voice smooth and professional. I sat back, trying to act like a dignified noble, telling myself to act with dignity. I took a breath and told her to come in. She walked in gracefully, and I caught a glimpse of her dark skirt and white apron. She kept her head down, acting perfectly submissive. I watched her every move, my eye reflecting her image as she approached the bed. I was looking for any sign something was off. She set the tray down on the bedside table and quietly told me, "Here's your medicine," her eyes still averted. The camera gave a gratuitous shot of her chest as she leaned over. Seriously? Even in this world, some things never change, I thought. She knelt beside me, offering the bowl with both hands. She urged me to take it while it was warm, sounding perfectly helpful. I looked at her, my mind spinning, trying to remember if she was an important NPC in the game, but nothing came to me. I immediately caught myself asking for her name would be a dead giveaway. I wasn't the real Calyx. I had to play this cool and keep my mouth shut. She looked up, noticing my hesitation and asking if something was the matter. Suddenly, a status screen popped up right over her head. I stammered that it was nothing, waving it off. I realized I didn't need to ask her name. My cheat screen was already doing the work for me. The detailed status screen for the maid appeared, floating right next to her face. It was a wall of text filled with her life story. I scanned the data quickly. Her name is Lila. Okay, Lila, I thought, let's see what else you're hiding behind that polite smile. Her profile said she was 21, a commoner, and a maid. But then I saw it. Affiliation, Viscount Hosharan's territory. Wait, that's not right. My eyes went wide. I wondered why she wasn't affiliated with the Shikan family but with Viscount Hosharan's. Why was a foreign maid serving me medicine? I narrowed my eyes, looking closer at her stats. And on top of that, there was something else in her profile that was absolutely terrifying. I looked at her combat power and nearly choked. She was a Class 3 warrior, trained like an elite Special Forces soldier. This girl was one of the best of the best. I stared at her, my blood running cold. She looked like a perfectly normal, harmless maid, but she could snap my neck in 2 seconds. I looked down at the medicine, my mind racing. A Shikan noble gets wounded, and a foreign maid from another territory is bringing the medicine. My survival instincts were screaming. There was no way I should drink this. This wasn't a healing potion. This was almost certainly poison. Lila tilted her head, her smile never wavering, asking what the matter was. She was waiting for me to take the bowl, and she wasn't moving. I tried to sound casual, telling her to just leave it there, but she pushed back immediately, insisting that I please take it. She moved closer, her smile turning into a creepy, forced grin. She said again, "Please take it," her voice gaining a sharp edge. What was going on? I was panicking. This woman was planning to make me drink it by force. At this rate, I was trapped in bed with a super soldier assassin. I had to do something, fast. I suddenly clutched my chest and let out a dramatic scream about my chest hurting. I hoped my acting was better than my combat stats. My heart attack worked. Lila was so startled she lost her grip on the tray, and the bowl of dark liquid went flying. This should do it, I thought. The bowl flipped in slow motion, spilling the mystery medicine all over the floor. I thought my stunt worked perfectly. The tray hit the floor with a loud crash, and Lila reached out too late to save it. I watched the mess, trying to look like I was still in pain. Lila dropped to her knees, staring at the spilled liquid on the rug. Her face was hidden, and she was completely silent for a long moment. She looked up, and her expression had completely changed. She looked furious. This is bad, I thought. I'd just made a very dangerous enemy. I face-planted onto the bed as the poison bowl went flying, but this maid had absolute gamer reflexes. Lila moved like a blur, snatching the bowl out of midair before a single drop hit the rug. She settled back into a standing position, holding the bowl steady like nothing happened. I was internally screaming about her reflexes. I didn't expect a maid to be this cracked. My eye reflected the room as I realized I was in deep trouble. I knew if we locked eyes now, she'd see the panic and realize I spilled it on purpose to avoid being poisoned. I hunched over with a fake groan, playing off the heart attack I just faked. Lila stood behind me like a silent statue, which is terrifying when you know she's a secret assassin. She leaned back in and offered the tray again, cool as a cucumber. She said, "Fortunately, the medicine is safe," telling me there was no escaping my medication today. I sat on the edge of the bed, sweating bullets, while Lila loomed over me. I told myself to think of the worst-case scenario in this game. The worst things always have a habit of coming true. I knew that bowl was filled with a one-way ticket to the afterlife. I wasn't drinking that liquid death, but I was cornered by a woman who could kill me with a spoon. I got a determined look, knowing I had to do something about the situation now. I couldn't just sit here and wait to be served my final meal. Suddenly, I reached out and grabbed the bowl from her hands. Lila looked startled by my sudden movement, her eyes widening behind her bangs. She asked if I was all right while I clutched the bowl. I was suspicious, noting she rushed over to help way too quickly for a normal servant. I brought up her status screen again, deciding now was my only chance to find a weakness. I dug through her background info, trying to figure out which household she actually served. I pieced together the family drama, realizing I was the son of the Count's first deceased wife. It was the classic stepmother wants, the inheritance plot, and I was right in the middle of it. Everything clicked when I saw the name Koshalan on her screen. That was my stepmother's maiden name, meaning this maid was a plant sent to finish me off. I stared at the glowing blue screen, confirming my fears. Lila was a maid sent by my stepmother to make sure I never inherited the Shikan earldom. A shot of Lila looking cold and menacing in the shadows. She might look like a regular maid, but her eyes had that dead-inside assassin look. It was a simple but deadly motive. If I died, her son became the Count. She'd been trained as an assassin specifically to clear the path for the second wife's bloodline. Instead of being scared, I got this wicked grin on my face. This is amusing, I thought, realizing the game's high difficulty was finally starting to show. I played it off, telling her it was all good now, thanks. I handed the bowl back, but I was already planning my next move to turn the tables on her. I looked her dead in the eye with a smug smile and asked how my stepmother was doing. I basically threw a grenade into the conversation just to see her reaction. Lila visibly flinched, her eyes widening in genuine shock. She wasn't expecting the fragile young lord to mention the Countess so casually after almost dying. She tried to recover, claiming the Countess was deeply saddened when she heard about my attempted suicide. She was laying the guilt on thick, trying to keep up the facade. I went silent, realizing the previous owner of this body had suicidal tendencies. It made the stepmother's plan even more perfect. If I died from medicine, everyone would think I'd finished the job. I looked down at the scar on my chest, where the status screen said I had stabbed myself. The burning pain I felt earlier made a lot more sense now. I looked up and promised I wouldn't worry the Countess anymore. Lila bowed her head, telling me the Countess would be relieved to hear that standard NPC lies. I told her she could leave, trying to dismiss her so I could figure out a plan. I needed her out of the room before the next phase began. Lila didn't budge. She looked up with a terrifying, dark gaze and said she was sorry, but I hadn't taken my medicine yet. The nice maid act was officially slipping. I was stunned, my mouth hanging open in shock. This woman was insanely persistent, practically glowing with a purple murderous aura. I realized she wasn't leaving until she saw that liquid go down my throat. I was stuck in a room with a professional killer and a cup of poison talk about a bad day. I sat on the edge of the bed, cold sweat running down my face. I couldn't just refuse. I was dealing with an elite assassin, and I was in a very weak body. I lamented that even though I was a healthy 30-something on the inside, this body was just a fragile teenage boy. I was physically outmatched in every way. I wondered if I should scream for help, but I knew it was a trap. If I made a scene, she'd just slash my throat before guards could even reach the door. The pressure was making me nauseous. I knew if I resisted too hard, I'd be dead for sure, and it wouldn't be from poison. I looked at the medicine bowl again, wondering if I really had no choice but to drink it. I was cornered, but my gamer brain was still looking for an exploit. But wait a minute. A realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I stared at the bowl, a desperate plan forming in my mind. I asked myself why she was using poison instead of just stabbing me while I slept. Poison is much more complicated than a simple blade to the heart. It hit me. She was trying to avoid drawing attention. If I was poisoned, they could frame it as a suicide attempt that finally succeeded, keeping the stepmother's hands clean. I looked at the dark liquid, recognizing exactly what it was. It wasn't just any poison. It was the one that killed me 3 times back in the game. Lila offered to help me drink it if it was difficult. The text, "The slow creeping death," popped up, confirming my worst fears about the mixture. I clutched the bed sheets, thinking about the fundamental truth of hero's destiny. I realized that in this world, survival depended on being prepared for the absolute worst. My eye glowed with an intense, calculated fire. I wasn't the scared kid anymore. I was the Game Master Pro who beat the unbeatable game. I remembered the one mantra that kept me alive in the game, and I was using it now. Always expect the worst, because it will soon become reality. I knew if I kept refusing, she'd eventually pin me down and force it down my throat. I decided to take control of the situation. I started laughing like a psycho, shouting about how thrilling this was. I was actually enjoying that the game wasn't pulling any punches even after the tutorial. I grabbed the bowl from her, surprising Lila. She mumbled, "My lord," as she watched me take the liquid with a terrifying confidence. I brought the bowl to my lips and started chugging the poison. Lila stood there in silence. I chugged the poison like it was a refreshing energy drink, gulping it down without a second thought. You could hear the gulping sound effects as I drained the entire bowl. Lila was completely frozen, her red eyes staring in disbelief at my sudden boldness. She was probably thinking her job just got easier, but she wasn't expecting me to be so eager to die. The system message confirmed the worst. The slow creeping death poison has taken effect. I just smirked through the pain, thinking this was exactly as expected, like following a walkthrough. The poison hit me like a truck, and I doubled over in agony. I desperately tried to think of a way out, searching for any person or object that could save me before the timer ran out. I flashed back to Russell mentioning I wouldn't have survived without a top-tier potion he had in stock. It was a classic RPG hint. If a powerful item was used once, there might be a spare. I remembered Russell's formal greeting and realized the old man was likely the only one truly on my side. I pinned all my hopes on Russell, keeping the leftovers of that legendary medicine nearby. My eye snapped open with a sharp, desperate light. I realized my only chance at survival was to get rid of the maid so I could search the room. I looked up at Lila and ordered her to go outside and call for Russell immediately. She was hesitant, asking a suspicious "why" while watching me suffer. I went full arrogant noble, snapping back and asking if I must explain myself to a maid. It was a risky play, but using my status was the only way to force her to follow orders. Lila quickly backed down, apologizing for being thoughtless and heading for the door. I watched her go, my expression turning dark and focused the moment her back was turned. I knew that top-tier potion Russell used was my only lifeline. It was a once-in-a-lifetime item so valuable it could literally be traded for a castle, making it the perfect antidote. I watched Lila walk out, her dark dress disappearing through the doorway. I counted every second, knowing I had a limited window before she came back. The moment the door slammed shut, I leaped off the bed. I was shaking and sweating, desperately checking the hallway to make sure she was actually gone. I didn't waste any time and shoved my fingers down my throat to force myself to vomit. I tried to get as much of that poison out of my system as possible, no matter how gross it was. I was retching and coughing, the dark poison coming back up in a nasty mess on the floor. I was fighting for my life, looking absolutely miserable but determined to survive. I was hunched over on the rug, gasping for air as I continued to vomit. It was a brutal scene, showing just how far I was willing to go to stay in the game. I wiped my mouth, realizing vomiting wouldn't be enough to stop the slow creeping death. I knew the antidote had to be hidden somewhere in this room, likely tucked away by Russell. I tore through a large wooden chest, throwing clothes and papers aside. Hero's Destiny might be a tough game, but I was convinced there was always a hidden answer for a pro like me. I moved to the dresser, my hands trembling as I yanked open the drawers. I was panicking, muttering that it had to be somewhere as the poison continued to sap my strength. I searched another set of drawers, but they were empty too. I was losing hope, my vision blurring as the poison's final stage began. I slumped against the furniture, the dreaded message about my eyelids getting heavier appearing. I shouted in frustration, realizing I was almost out of time. A montage of my frantic, failed search. I'd searched every corner, thrown every paper, and I was still coming up empty-handed. The system message loomed over me as my vision faded to black. I looked defeated, my body finally giving in to the poison's lethal effects. I face-planted onto the rug with a heavy thud, surrounded by the chaos of my search. It looked like a total game-over screen as I lay there motionless. While lying there, I wondered if death here was permanent or if I would just restart. I was terrified I might die for real in this world before I even got to level 1. My eyes were halfway closed, the light fading from my beautiful teal pupils. I was slipping away, the silence of the room closing in. One final extreme close-up of my eye as it rolled back. I was on the edge of the void, but then I spotted a tiny glimmer of light reflected in my pupil. I saw a small, glowing bottle tucked way back under the furniture. I wondered what it was, my last bit of consciousness focusing on that mysterious object. I was lying flat on the floor, staring at the small, glowing vial hidden under a cabinet. It was my last hope, the top-tier potion Russell must have hidden away. I was on the verge of death, sprawled out on the floor. My eyes were glazed over, but I spotted a tiny glimmer of hope under the heavy wooden cabinet. I reached out with a trembling hand toward a small, white ceramic jar hidden in the shadows. This was it, my one and only chance to stay in the game. I dragged my poisoned body across the floor, every inch a struggle. I looked like a mess, but my gamer brain told me that treasure is usually hidden in annoying places. I finally got my hands on the jar, staring at it with desperate eyes. I wondered what it was, praying it was the legendary top-tier potion Russell mentioned. With the last of my strength, I popped the cork with a satisfying plop. I wasn't thinking about what was inside. I was ready to chug whatever it took to stop the burning. I started downing the liquid, the light from the window catching the jar as I drank. I was putting all my faith into this random bottle I found under the furniture. I immediately gagged and pulled the jar away, my face twisting in disgust. I shouted about how it tasted like spoiled milk, a total letdown when you're expecting a magical elixir. The system confirmed my worst nightmare, spoiled goat milk. My internal reaction was pure shock, goat milk. I really risked my life for expired dairy. But then it hit me. I remembered from Hero's Destiny that yogurt was the secret antidote to slow creeping death. I realized this spoiled milk might be my salvation. I looked at the chunky, smelly liquid with total doubt. I wondered if this spoiled goat milk could even be called yogurt. A fair question, but beggars can't be choosers when you're dying. The system timer wasn't waiting for me to finish my snacks, warning me my eyelids were getting heavy. I knew I was out of time, and this looked bad. I was fading out, clutching the jar as the warning message popped up for the third time. I thought I couldn't last another minute before the permadeath kicked in. I collapsed, my face hitting the floor as I muttered one last curse. I swore a final vow of revenge against Lila, the maid who put me in this mess. In a final, desperate act, I forced myself to finish the gross yogurt. I'll definitely get my revenge, I thought as I chugged the chunky antidote with pure determination. Everything faded to total darkness as I lost consciousness. It was that terrifying moment in a game where you don't know if you'll respawn or see a game over screen. Russell's voice cut through the dark, asking if I had woken up. The old man stood over me, looking as stern and formal as ever in his red military-style suit. I snapped awake in bed, my eyes wide and confused. I wondered if this was deja vu or if I was reset. I checked my surroundings, wondering if I just cheated death or if time looped. Russell just looked at me like I'd lost my mind, asking what I was talking about. The old man clearly had no idea about the gamer logic I was panicking through. Russell started complaining about the state of the room, shouting about what was going on with this mess. He pointed at the chaos I caused during my desperate search. Russell explained he found me lying on the floor and almost called for a healer. I was internally celebrating, realizing I was actually alive and the antidote worked. I was lying there, sweating and traumatized. I never wanted to experience that terrifying feeling of dying again. I was officially done with the beginner's difficulty. I got a look of pure steel in my eyes. I declared that no matter what happened, I will survive. I was fully committed to winning this game, and anyone in my way better watch out. I decided it was time to stop guessing and start knowing who I was dealing with. I turned my focus toward Russell, thinking I needed to check this guy's status. I activated my cheat skill, and a reflection of Russell's face appeared in my glowing teal eye. I was about to see what this old soldier was made of. The status screen popped up for Russell Hersley, and the first thing I noticed was the title, Acting Count. This guy wasn't just a butler, he held the keys to the entire territory. I read through the rest of the info, noting that since the previous count died without an heir, Russell was a temporary stand-in. This guy had serious political weight. I analyzed Russell's personality, deciding he seemed like a strict but trustworthy military man. Plus, the fact he used a castle-level potion to save me earlier meant he was probably my most loyal ally. I started to speak, but I tripped over my words for a second before formally calling him Acting Count. I was trying to match the formal tone of the world while feeling like a total outsider. Russell responded with a crisp, "Yes, my lord," while I looked out the window, looking for a way to bring up the attempt on my life. Russell's expression was hard to read. He looked like a man who's seen too many battles and wasn't easily impressed. He waited patiently for me to get to the point. The room was full of moonlight and long shadows as I tried to explain what happened with the maid. It was a tense atmosphere, knowing an assassin might still be lurking. Russell turned away, looking through the glass. He seemed skeptical of the poisoned by a maid story, which was the reaction I was afraid of. Russell apologized, but bluntly stated there was no evidence. He was a man of rules and proof, and right now, I had zero proof that the milk was poisoned. I looked frustrated, muttering a quiet curse. I realized having a status screen didn't mean NPCs would blindly believe everything I said. I admitted that even though Russell saved me, he didn't do it out of love. He just followed the rules and did his job as the acting count. Russell made his position clear. To him, me and my rival, Lord Grunbein, were equals. He was obliged to serve both of us fairly, a polite way of saying he was staying neutral. He emphasized his point by clenching his fist, stating that without witnesses or proof, he couldn't move against anyone. It was a total political stalemate. I got heated, asking if Russell was telling me to keep taking medicine said by my rival. I was pointing out how insane the current situation was. Russell asked if I had truly lost my memory, explaining that the Sheikhan family was in serious financial trouble. He tried to justify why things were so chaotic. He claimed it was a blessing that Lila, the maid from the rival house, was helping with the family business. Talk about being completely blind to the danger. Russell looked at me with a tired expression, asking if I didn't remember. He clearly thought I was just being difficult because of my injury. I clutched the bedsheets, realizing I had no choice. I had to show proof if I wanted anyone to take me seriously. I got a calculating look on my face, thinking about Lila. I believed that woman who poisoned me must think I was dead. I was already planning to turn her confidence against her. I sighed and told Russell, "Fine, let's leave it at that." I pretended to drop the subject to lull everyone into a false sense of security. Then I got this devious grin that would make a demon blush. I said I had one request and it was nothing too difficult. You know I was cooking up something wild. Russell watched me walk away, thinking to himself I was definitely acting different than usual. The old soldier was starting to suspect the fragile boy was gone. Fast forward 4 hours later, at Sheikhan Castle. The sun had set, and the castle was covered in dark, gloomy shadows, perfect for a bit of midnight assassination. An exterior shot of the castle towers under the moonlight. The guards were on high alert, their torches moving across the balconies as they patrolled the perimeter. A close-up of quiet, professional-looking boots moving along the stone walkway. This person knew how to move without a sound. It was Lila, not in her maid outfit. She wore a dark, hooded cloak like a proper assassin. She let out a relieved sound after slipping past the outer defenses. She peeked over the edge, watching the guards below. They were armed with polearms and torches, unaware an elite killer just bypassed them. She noted the security had tightened up exactly as she expected. Her expression was cold and focused. She was here to finish the job and wasn't taking any risks. She spotted a small vent or window and moved toward it with practiced ease. She was like a shadow, completely invisible to anyone not looking for her. She landed silently inside a hallway, her cloak billowing as she crouched. She was incredibly agile, moving with the grace of a Class 3 warrior. She reached my room and was surprised to find no guards at the door. She wondered why there were no guards, suspecting a trap for a split second. She slowly peeked through the door, her eyes searching the dark bedroom. She was extremely cautious, ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. She saw a lump under the bedsheets in the middle of the large, dark room. It looked like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, dead on my mattress. She stared at the still form on the bed, feeling a sense of relief. Everything was going according to the stepmother's plan. She thought to herself that since it was a special poison, I must have died without suffering. It was like she was trying to convince herself she was doing me a favor. She reached into her cloak and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This was the final nail in the coffin, the fake suicide note to explain away my sudden death. She moved to my desk and searched the drawers. She moved quickly, her hands gloved and efficient as she looked for the family seal. She found a small box and pulled out a stamp. This was the official seal of the Shikin direct family, exactly what she needed to make her forgery look authentic. She carefully pressed the stamp onto the handwritten note. The thud as the seal hit the paper was the only noise in the silent room. She whispered to herself that now she just needed to make it back safely, satisfied with her night's work. She thought I was history. Suddenly, a cold steel blade was pressed right against her neck. A dark figure had appeared behind her like a ghost, completely bypassing her elite senses. She froze, her eyes wide with pure, unadulterated terror. This voice, she thought, her heart stopping as she realized I, the dead lord, was holding a knife to her throat. Talk about a reversal. The tables have finally turned. I had a cold steel blade pressed against Lila's throat, and you can see me gritting my teeth as I held her life in my hands. Lila was panicking, her face twisting in terror and disbelief. She managed to choke out a desperate no as she realized her perfect plan just went up in flames. Even with a knife at her neck, she tried to act tough, screaming it was already too late. She was still playing the "he's already dead" card, hoping her poison worked. We see a shot of the rumpled bed, and she was still insisting that Lord Kalix was already a corpse. Little did she know, the guy threatening her was very much alive and well. She was already celebrating the fall of the Shekin family, thinking they were only left with the Grunbein heir now. Her internal monologue showed just how deep this inheritance conspiracy went. Lila shouted for Lord Russell as the acting count stepped into the light, looking as stern and unimpressed as a statue. She hoped he'd help her, but she was about to get a reality check. Lila's face was half hidden in shadows, her eyes narrowed in a look of pure, cornered malice. She knew she was in a bad spot, but an assassin like her always had a backup plan. She tried to lecture Russell, telling him he should be serving the family, not whatever he was doing now. Russell just stared back in total silence, not giving her an inch. I stepped out from the shadows behind her, keeping the blade locked to her throat. I said, as expected, it's just as I predicted, sounding way too calm for someone who was almost poisoned. Lila's eye widened with pure shock, the exact moment she realized she'd been totally outplayed. A shocked sound was the only thing she could manage as she saw the dead lord walking. I leaned in with a smug, backlight glow, mocking the poison she used. I called the slowly creeping death quite stimulating, which is the ultimate gamer flex. I dropped some cold facts, telling her I knew that in noble family feuds, poisonings are pretty standard. Lila looked at me like I was a ghost, her mind racing to find a way out. I picked up the fake suicide note she forged and looked it over with a bored expression. I knew her game, and I was not impressed by her handwriting. I held the note up, noting that if it were discovered, it would be troublesome. I was basically holding all the evidence I needed to have her executed on the spot. Lila gritted her teeth so hard you could almost hear them crack, letting out a frustrated sound. She'd realized her victim wasn't just alive, he was a complete monster. Lila tried to make a break for it, but Russell wasn't having it. He moved like a blur, ready to shut down her escape before she took a step. Check out that speed. Russell basically teleported behind her. Lila's eyes were wide with shock as she realized she was dealing with a high-level warrior. Russell delivered a devastating blow that sent Lila crashing down. She screamed as the acting count showed her exactly why he was in charge. Lila was pinned to the ground, gritting her teeth in pain and frustration. Russell's grip was like iron, and it was clear the fight was over before it began. A close-up of a powerful, armored fist. Russell wasn't pulling any punches. This guy was a total tank, and he wasn't letting this assassin go anywhere. Russell grabbed her by the collar and hair, hauling her up with zero effort. The power difference was insane, and poor Lila was just along for the ride. I watched the whole thing with a chillingly calm smile, impressed by the show. I wondered if this was the difference of 3 class stages I saw on their status screens. Russell stood tall, glowing with a terrifying purple mana aura that filled the room. This was the acting count in his full warlord glory, and it was absolutely epic. I looked down at the captured Lila, reminding her that even in common poisonings, no one leaves evidence or witnesses. I was really leaning into that game master role now. I laid down the law. Anyone who attempts to assassinate a noble will be executed, no exceptions. Lila looked up at me with fear and hatred as she realized her fate was sealed. I stood by the desk, casually mentioning all the evidence was right here in the room. I looked like a detective who just closed the easiest case of his life. I walked over to the bound assassin with my bare feet, looking relaxed despite the situation. I was showing her she was zero threat to me now. I got right in her personal space, pointing a finger and asking, "Are they here?" I was referring to the other evidence she was trying to hide or destroy. Lila looked completely broken, her eyes glassy and unfocused as the reality of her failure sank in. She'd gone from elite assassin to helpless prisoner in minutes. Lila suddenly passed out from the stress or injury, and I was left looking confused. I wondered why my prime witness just decided to take a nap. Russell knelt down to check on her, wondering why she suddenly changed and fainted. He looked concerned he might have hit her a little too hard. I just stood there with my hands on my hips, stating the obvious that they fainted. I seemed more annoyed than worried about the interruption. Russell reached out, likely using his mana to check her condition or search for hidden weapons. He was being thorough, just like an old soldier. A bright purple sphere of mana glowed in Russell's hand as he scanned her body. This was high-level detection magic, and I was taking mental notes. I recognized the mana hole technique and realized I could finally understand the class difference between Russell and Lila. I was using the system to power level my own knowledge. Russell stood up and noted the assassins couldn't use mana-breathing techniques, meaning they weren't top-tier threats. He looked relieved it was just elite soldiers and not worse. Russell estimated they were probably at the level of well-trained elite soldiers, so there was no need for high-speed mana restraints. He was already thinking about the logistics of holding them prisoner. Russell suddenly looked shocked as he noticed a strange expression on my face. He was starting to realize the fragile young master might be much darker than he thought. I had this knowing, eerie look as I stared into the distance. Russell was internally freaking out, wondering if I already knew everything that was going to happen. I flashed a subtle, dark smile and said it wasn't a big deal. I was acting like I just finished a boring tutorial mission instead of surviving an assassination. Russell stared at me, convinced my behavior was totally different from usual. He looked a bit intimidated by the kid he was supposed to protect. The two of us stood over the bound and unconscious Lila. I said there were plenty of things I wanted to ask, and you can tell I wasn't going to be gentle. Lila was tied up in a chair now, looking helpless without her dark cloak. We'd moved her to a more interrogation-friendly spot. Russell was pouring a small bottle of red liquid onto her bound hands, maybe an antidote or something to wake her up. It looked clinical and cold. She woke up with a sharp gasp, her eyes snapping open in terror. The first thing she saw was the dark room and the men waiting for her to talk. My face was completely shadowed, making me look like a villain in this lighting. I was just staring her down, letting the silence do the work. Lila looked up with tears in her eyes, looking completely broken. She'd finally realized there was no escape and no mercy coming from this new me. She was hunched over, murmuring about drinking slowly creeping death. She seemed haunted by the poison she tried to use on me. She explained the poison caused a slow, painless death in 3 to 6 hours. Her face looked ghostly as she recounted the details of her failed murder weapon. I leaned in close while she admitted that since I attempted suicide before, the poison would have looked like the perfect quiet end. I listened to her confession with pure, cold fascination. I stood up with a backlit, wicked grin mocking her plan. I pointed out everyone would have just assumed I finally finished the job, making her work easy. I told her if she'd used a fast-acting poison and had the resolve to die with me, she wouldn't have failed. I was basically giving her a critique on how to be a better assassin. I got right in her face, my eyes glowing as I asked a single, terrifying question. Why? I wanted to know the motive behind the woman who tried to end my new life. Lila looked completely lost, muttering a quiet, "What?" Russell was also watching from the back, probably wondering where this ruthless side of me came from. Russell looked at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. Even the loyal acting count was struggling to keep up with my sudden shift in personality. A big text bubble dropped the hammer. I asked if she didn't want to die. I'd seen right through her, and I wasn't letting her hide behind a fake duty. I kept the pressure on, telling her she didn't have the loyalty to dedicate her life to Countess Stella. I was tearing her down mentally, bit by bit. Lila was fuming, looking like she wanted to spit fire at me. I asked again, basically calling her a coward who valued her life more than her mission. I turned to Russell and ordered him to make her talk. I was done being the nice guy and was ready to use Russell's more direct methods. Russell grabbed her jaw with a brutal, crushing grip. Lila screamed. This was all nonsense, but she was clearly terrified of what was coming. A close-up of Lila's eye reflecting me. It was the look of a predator finally cornering its prey. She was staring into the face of her own nightmare. I held up a small, glowing purple gem I found in her cloak. I asked what it was, curious about the assassin's gear I'd just looted. Russell forced her mouth open while a thick gray liquid was poured in. Lila was gagging, thinking about the smell as she was forced to taste her own medicine. She was coughing and retching as the foul-looking gray vapor or liquid was forced down her throat. This was a brutal scene, showing Russell and I weren't playing around. Russell forced it all down with a simple, yes. I stood right there, ordering him to make her swallow it without a hint of remorse. Lila slumped in her bonds, making muffled sounds of agony and gasping for air. She'd been completely broken, her elite training no match for my cold-blooded tactics. Russell maintained a firm grip on her jaw, making sure she swallowed every drop. Lila was drooling and looking defeated, her eyes rolling back as she reached her limit. Lila let out a blood-curdling scream as she was forced to swallow whatever nasty concoction we prepared. She looked terrified, wondering what on earth we just made her drink. She was left gasping and tied to the chair. Her elite assassin composure shattered. She stared up at me with wide eyes, demanding to know what poison I just used on her. I stood there looking bored, like I was checking a grocery list, and told her plainly I just made her drink some poison. You can see the pure shock on her face as she realized the tables had turned. Lila was panicking now, her red eyes shaking as she repeated the word poison in disbelief. She never expected this fragile noble to have the guts to poison someone back. I dropped the hammer and asked if she was familiar with the poison, Sidis's puppet. A terrifying shot of a grim reaper surrounded by purple flames showed how legendary and lethal this stuff was. Lila screamed that it was a lie, claiming it was impossible for a young lord from a count's family to get his hands on such a rare substance. She was losing it, her face twisting in denial and fear. I got this intense look in my eye and told her that as long as you have enough gold, you can get whatever you want. I even started leaking pro jargon about key ingredients to flex my gamer knowledge. I started listing off rare ingredients like white nappas, and the sheer detail made Lila's jaw drop. Russell stood in the background, looking stunned by my sudden encyclopedic knowledge of illegal toxins. Russell stared at me like he'd seen a ghost, his mustache practically twitching with shock. He couldn't believe the kid he's protected for years knew this much about high-level assassination tools. I just gave Lila this blank, empty stare that said I knew everything. Lila was speechless, her internal monologue probably screaming she can't believe it over and over. I thought to myself that as long as I used the right jargon, nobody would suspect I was actually from another world. I was playing the hidden genius perfectly, using my 10 years of gaming experience to my advantage. I made a grand declaration, telling Lila I was going to release her today. Lila was on the floor, looking up at me in confusion while Russell watched from behind. I gave her a specific order. Go back to your master and report the assassination was successful. I was setting up a massive deception, and I was using her as my messenger. I started walking away, but stopped to ask if she really thought she had a choice but to follow orders. I had her cornered, and she knew it. I leaned in with a cold, piercing look and asked the ultimate question, "You don't want to die, do you?" Lila was still tied up, looking thoughtful as she processed my offer. The system information explained that Sidis's puppet had over 3,000 different antidotes depending on how it was formulated. It was the ultimate psychological weapon because only the brewer knew the cure. I got a wicked grin and told her the perfect antidote was right here in my hands. I was dangling her life over her head, and I was clearly enjoying the power trip. Lila was tied to the chair, looking down with a defeated expression. I told her to stop being stubborn and just listen if she didn't want to die a pointless death. Check out this shot of Lila's thighs. She was literally shaking with fear and physical discomfort. The Sidis's puppet might have been a bluff, but the psychological effect was real. Russell loomed over her in the dark, asking her one last time for her answer. The purple aura around Lila showed she was under immense pressure, both mentally and physically. Lila was sweating buckets, her eyes wide with desperation as she looked up at Russell. She'd reached her breaking point and was about to spill everything. Russell just watched her with a cold, unwavering gaze, waiting for the words to come out. He didn't look like he had an ounce of mercy left for this assassin. Lila finally snapped and screamed, "All right, fine, just untie me." She'd completely surrendered, giving up her mission just to save her own skin. I looked genuinely surprised, asking her what kind of tone that was. I pointed out I was technically the one saving her life, so she should be a bit more polite. Lila was broken now, pleading and begging me to untie her as quickly as possible. She was crying and shaking, a total 180 from the elite assassin we saw earlier. Russell was still suspicious, leaning in and asking what this was. He found her unusually compliant and wondered if she was up to something. He wasn't buying her sudden change of heart. A hilarious chibi version of Lila trembled and pleaded for mercy while I looked on with a smug face. I was thinking about how the rotten goat's milk trick was working even better than I hoped. I finally gave the order to untie her, and Russell looked shocked by the command. Lila was still tied up in the background, looking like a ball of nerves. Russell snapped back, asking if I was sure since she was trying to kill me. He clearly wasn't comfortable with letting a trained killer loose. I just sat on the sofa with a cool, nonchalant attitude, saying she was an important witness and should be treated with basic human dignity. I was playing the moral high ground, a classic protagonist move. Russell was floored, his face turning into a confused mess with a giant question mark over his head. He stammered about dignity, completely failing to understand my logic. Lila was still on the floor, even after being untied, and she yelled at us to hurry up. She was still acting bratty, which seemed to be her real personality. She was blushing, and looked like she was about to burst into tears from shame. She'd completely lost her cool assassin vibe and just looked like a frustrated young woman. The scene shifted to an exterior shot of the castle under a bright sky, but you could still hear her screaming for them to, "Please hurry," from the windows. The interrogation was getting more vocal. Lila was back in her hooded cloak, kneeling on the floor before Russell and me. I told her one more time to go and report that the assassination was a success. Russell and I watched her leave from the doorway, a heavy silence between us. I mentioned we'd need someone who could manipulate the knight's order to sell the lie. The camera focused on a closed door as my voice trailed off, saying, "And that person is." The suspense was building for my next big reveal. I looked Russell dead in the eye and finished my sentence with a calm, "My lord." I was officially tasking Russell with the dirtiest part of my plan. Russell looked skeptical, asking me where I could have possibly acquired all that knowledge. He was realizing I wasn't just different, I was practically a genius. I laughed it off with a casual smile, asking if Russell would even believe me if I said I read it all in books. I was avoiding the otherworld talk for now. Russell got serious and pointed out that publishing a book with that kind of info would be a death sentence. He said it was nearly impossible that a banned book like that would be lying around. I got the blue freeze effect, realizing my lie was a little thin. I thought to myself that they'd never believe I was someone from a different world. I tried a different approach, asking Russell if he remembered the dagger I used to stab my own chest. I looked solemn as I brought up that dark memory. Russell was confused, wondering why I was bringing that up now. I was standing by the bed, looking like I was about to drop some more family lore. I explained the dagger was a family heirloom passed down from my mother. I claimed it had a mysterious power, and this time, I had finally obtained it. Russell was totally stunned, his mouth hanging open as he asked, "Is that so?" He was hooked by my new backstory for my powers. I thought Russell didn't believe me, but I carried on anyway. I realized nobody would have guessed stabbing your heart was the secret to unlocking the dagger's power. Russell was deep in thought, looking at the door and muttering that it was strange. He was a smart man, and he was trying to reconcile this story with what he knew. I looked away, sweating slightly as Russell thought that if the item was that rare, it would be known worldwide. The lie was starting to crack again. My eyes went sharp as I realized I needed to pivot. Could it be? I thought as I searched my memory for something better. I stood up and asked Russell if he was familiar with Claire's dagger. I threw out a name from the game's lore, hoping it would land. The screen went black as Russell's face lit up with recognition. I got it, I thought. I finally found a legendary item name Russell actually knew. Russell was fully convinced now, praising me for my vast knowledge of legendary treasures. I stood there looking awkward, relieved my bluff worked. I looked around the room with a suspicious expression as a giant BUT text bubble appeared. There's always a catch in this world, isn't there? Russell suddenly got this terrifyingly intense face, leaning in and asking if anyone else knew about this. He looked ready to kill anyone who might have heard. I looked intimidated by the old soldier's intensity, stammering that Russell was the first one I'd told. I was definitely feeling the pressure of my own lies. Russell calmed down and returned to his usual self, saying, then, by the way, he was ready to move on to the next topic, much to my relief. Russell asked me what I thought about Lila's story. We stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by bookshelves and history. He got a very serious look, mentioning all of Count Corin's movements were leaked. It was clear the betrayal in the house went much deeper than one maid. I looked down, my hair covering my eyes as I mentioned a knight on the verge of class advancement dying from a mere monster attack. I was smelling a rat in the official story. Russell asked if I really believed such a ridiculous story. He wasn't buying the monster attack excuse either, showing he was just as suspicious. I leaned over, thinking hard about the situation. I admitted while I couldn't take sides in a power struggle, there was a rational suspicion regarding Count Corin's death. A hand gripped a sword hilt as a big, no bubble appeared. It seemed someone was making a firm decision about where they stood. A wide shot of me sitting while Russell stood over me. Russell declared that as a soldier, he refused to involve himself in politics. It was his core principle. Russell looked a bit emotional as he looked down at me. My thought bubble was screaming about why my father had to die, showing my true motivation. We were shown from behind, the room silent as we processed our next moves. I was clenching my fists, my body vibrating with repressed anger. The final panel shows me looking up with a terrifying, wide-eyed smile. I asked how we shall exact revenge, and you know it was going to be brutal. I dropped a total truth bomb on Russell, telling him straight up that his father, his former lord, was murdered. The dark, swirling background emphasized how heavy this revelation was. A shot of my feet as I paced, explaining that the mastermind behind the assassination was the Kosherin family, specifically to benefit Grunbein. I was laying out the whole political conspiracy. I stood tall, declaring that if Grunbein took the Count's seat, any hope for revenge was gone. I was rallying the troops, saying we couldn't quit just because the odds were against us. I looked incredibly intense, my face half shadowed as I stared into the camera. You could see the Game Master coming out as I calculated my next moves to dismantle the opposition. An extreme close-up of my glowing teal eye as I challenged Russell's sense of honor. I asked if it was true chivalry to serve a family that literally plotted a murder. Talk about a guilt trip. Russell was shown from behind, his shoulders hunched as he processed this moral dilemma. You could feel him shaking as he realized his 50 years of loyalty might have been misplaced. Russell was silent, his face a mask of conflict as he stared at the floor. He was a man of principles, and I just tore those principles to shreds. The old soldier made his move, stepping forward with a resolute look. He'd reached a decision that was going to change the entire course of the territory's history. Russell dropped to one knee and drew his sword, swearing his absolute loyalty to me. It was an epic moment as the territory's most powerful warrior officially switched sides. I gave him a gentle, almost sad smile, calling him Commander Russell. I knew the weight of what just happened, but I was already thinking about the however that comes next. Russell looked up with a terrifying purple aura, reminding me he just threw away half a century of beliefs for this. He looked like a demon unleashed, and he clearly wasn't patient. I was internally celebrating, realizing that Russell, a rank 6 warrior, was now my strongest ally. I was comparing it to bagging a legendary boss-level character at the start of the game. The narration described Russell as a tiger who's been walking a silent path, but now he was bound by the reins of revenge. The spectral tiger behind him was absolutely badass. Russell got back to business, bluntly telling me there was no need for him to pledge loyalty to someone without a knightly title yet. He was being a grouch, but you know he meant well. A funny chibi moment where Russell threatened to give me special training to make me grow strong. I was sweating bullets, thinking I better change the subject before he made me do 500 push-ups. The scene shifted to a wide shot of the library as I explained the plan. I noted the Countess was sloppy, leaving behind both evidence and witnesses that could destroy her. I flashed a truly devious, villain-level grin, declaring this was just the prologue to revenge. I looked like I was having way too much fun playing this high-stakes political game. Russell watched me, looking ready for action. He asked, "Well then, what should this old man do?" He was fully committed to whatever chaotic plan I had cooked up. My dark smile widened as I said, "For now." Transitioning to an outside shot of the castle, you could feel the calm before the massive storm hit. A grand view of the meeting hall, where the nobles were gathered in their finery. It looked like a typical court session, but the air was thick with tension. Countess Stella was there, looking regal and smug behind her red fan. She thought she'd already won, surveying the room like she was the queen of the castle. The common nobles were whispering, wondering why the Countess was sitting on the throne and why the knights were on high alert all night. The rumors were flying fast. Stella lowered her fan just enough to reveal a nasty smirk. She started her speech, mentioning that some of you may already be aware regarding my situation. She officially announced that I attempted suicide using the slow-creeping death poison. She was selling the lie perfectly, looking like a grieving stepmother. An old bearded advisor commented on how famous that suicide poison was, sounding like he'd already written me off. The court was accepting the lie as fact without a question. The whispering intensified as people agreed my death was inevitable. They were already treating me like a memory, which was exactly what the Countess wanted. Another noble pointed out that with the first prince dead, my political faction was now meaningless. The power shift in the room was visible as people looked toward Stella's side. Stella looked like she was on cloud 9, thinking that, with me gone, her son Grunbein was guaranteed the Count's seat. She was practically counting the gold in her head. The question of who will be the next Count hung in the air, but the consensus was that it was already decided. Everyone was just waiting for the official coronation. The narrator noted Stella was basically acting as a proxy Count right now, and the drama was getting interesting. The layout of the hall made it feel like a stage play. Stella turned to where Russell usually stood, asking if he was ready. A close-up of a teal eye at the bottom. The real star of the show was about to make his entrance. A close-up of fancy boots walking toward the hall. A voice responded, "Of course, we'll follow you to the end," sounding very confident. Russell stood at the entrance in full, gleaming silver armor, looking like a total powerhouse. He shouted for his lord as the doors were about to be thrown open. Stella and her son Grunbein looked toward the entrance, probably expecting some formal ceremony. Grunbein looked bored, totally unaware of the disaster heading his way. The massive wooden doors burst open with a loud thud, scattering dust and light into the hall. It was the ultimate "I'm back" entrance for a protagonist. There I was, my blonde hair catching the light as I stepped into the room. The hall went silent, with a giant shock appearing as everyone's brain broke. I walked calmly across the stone floor, my boots clicking with every step. I was taking my time, letting the shock of my presence sink into every noble in the room. Stella's face was a picture of pure, unadulterated horror as she screamed my name. Her perfect plan just walked through the front door and she wasn't handling it well. I stood there in a vibrant red cloak, looking more like a prince than I ever have. Russell and another high-ranking knight stood behind me, providing serious muscle. Stella was fuming, her face turning purple as she wondered, but how? She saw me drink the poison herself, so seeing me standing there healthy was a literal nightmare. The hall exploded into murmurs again. The first prince is alive. Why is Russell over there? Was the poison not consumed? The nobles realized they'd been lied to. Stella stared down at me from the throne, looking like she wanted to jump off and strangle me. I looked up and shouted for the countess to get the whole room's attention. I pointed a finger at her, telling her straight up the throne she was on didn't suit her. I was calling her out in front of everyone, and the disrespect was palpable. Stella tried to play it cool, giving a forced smile and asking how I was feeling. She was desperately trying to regain control of the narrative, but failing hard. A close-up of my devious smirk. I knew I had her cornered, and I was clearly enjoying watching her squirm in front of her peers. I admitted I did drink the poison thanks to someone, but luckily I survived by throwing it up right away. I was basically winking at her while accusing her of murder. I told her she was too hasty, and we saw Stella clutching her fan so hard it might snap. She was internally screaming while I casually dismantled her reputation. I made a mocking face, saying it wasn't good to make misleading statements. I was playing the audience like a fiddle, making Stella look like a desperate liar. Stella snapped, screaming that even if I wouldn't call her mother, treating her as a murderer was unforgivable. She went for the insulted noblewoman defense, but it was looking weak. The nobles in the hall started shouting that this was a place where you had to take responsibility for your words. The pressure was on me now to produce that proof. I stayed perfectly calm, asking Stella if she could stay composed once the truth was revealed. I had the ultimate ace up my sleeve and I was about to play it. Stella looked genuinely worried now, asking what I was plotting. She knew I wasn't the same weak kid I used to be, and she was terrified of what I'd found. I looked to the side and said, well, for now. I was dragging out the suspense, making everyone in the room hang on my every word. I let out a sharp clap as I gave a signal. This was the moment everything was going to change for everyone in the Shiken family. A shot of someone's bound hands as I called out for the witness to be brought in. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a dagger. A wide shot showed the knights escorting a mysterious figure into the grand hall. I repeated, let's hear what the witness has to say. Lila entered the hall, and the nobles were all whispering about who that woman was. They had no idea they were looking at a trained assassin who was about to spill all the family tea. Stella looked like she'd seen a ghost, her face turning pale as she thought, but still. She realized her favorite pawn had been turned against her. Lila dropped to her knees in the middle of the hall, surrounded by knights and the judging eyes of the court. She looked small and broken, a far cry from her previous elite self. I loomed over her, asking her name in a voice that carried across the entire room. I was being perfectly formal for the legal record. Lila looked up, her eyes empty as she started to introduce herself. She whispered her name, her voice shaking just a bit. A wide shot showed Lila kneeling in front of the throne where Stella sat. It was a perfect visual of the witness confronting the mastermind. She finished her introduction with a clear, "It's Lila." The name might not mean much to the crowd, but to Stella, it was a death sentence. Stella's eye was shown in a terrifying close-up, twitching with pure rage. All she could manage to think was a panicked, "Why?" as her world fell apart. The final panel showed the Countess's face twisted in an ugly, furious mask. She thought, "Why is that girl here?" realizing I had officially won this round. Lila finally spilled the beans on her secret identity. Turns out, she wasn't just some random maid, but a first-rank agent of the Shadow Corps from the Kosherin family. I was actually impressed by the title. I muttered about the Shadow Corps, clearly enjoying this new lore drop. Lila explained how they gathered orphans with potential and put them through brutal survival training in the Highlands. It sounded like a total nightmare. Only the strongest survived to become secret agents sent all over with fake IDs. I leaned in, asking her what her cover story was here. Stella was shaking with rage in the background, while Lila confirmed the obvious. She was posing as the Countess's personal maid this whole time. I hit her with the million-dollar question. Did Lady Stella know who you really were? The tension in the room was getting insane. I stared down at her, making sure every noble in the room felt the weight of her words. Lila kept her head bowed, ready to accept the consequences. Stella absolutely lost it, screaming about a conspiracy while a dark, murderous aura flared up around her. She was definitely feeling cornered now. One noble backed her up, shouting that Lila's been there for 5 years and calling her a spy was ridiculous. He was playing the law card, trying to shut this down. The rest of the crowd started getting rowdy, demanding an official protest against the Kosharin family. They were all shouting for proof that didn't exist, or so they thought. The judge was sweating bullets, thinking, oh no, we actually have a witness now. He knew this was heading south fast. He turned to Russell, demanding to know why he was silent and if he was really going to believe a lowly maid over the countess. Russell just stood there like a stone wall, towering over everyone. He didn't look bothered by the judge's shouting at all. Then he dropped the hammer. He pointed out Lila wasn't just a maid, but a criminal caught red-handed who just confessed to being a spy. Big mistake, Judge. Check out Chibimi back there, looking totally smug while Lila's confession hung in the air. My plan was working like a charm. The judge was completely flustered as Russell told him to pipe down and listen to the actual testimony before making a judgment. The nobles were still in total denial, screaming this was all nonsense. The judge looked like he wanted to disappear into his big beard. The whole hall was in an uproar, with people shouting over each other. Some wanted to hear the truth, while others still called her a liar. The judge finally gave in, asking Lila what her mission was while playing house as a maid. Stella looked like she wanted to murder everyone in the room. Lila explained she was basically a monthly informant, leaking every bit of dirt she found. She was even reporting on the territory's secret financial records and ledgers. Nothing was safe from her eyes. Stella demanded to know what else she leaked, her voice shaking. She knew she was in deep trouble. Lila went even deeper, admitting she leaked the late Count Corin's travel routes and the secret political moves of all the vassals. Russell looked absolutely disgusted. The crowd was stunned into silence. People were muttering, "Impossible?" as the scale of the betrayal started to sink in. I asked for the grand finale, her most recent mission. Lila admitted she tried to trick me into drinking the slow creeping death poison. She was ordered to fake my suicide by planting a forged note in my bedroom. Talk about cold-blooded. I looked down at her with zero emotion and just asked what the result was. I was completely in control. Lila explained she successfully poisoned me, but Russell caught her trying to plant the note. Chibi Grunbein in the back looked like he was about to cry. Stella finally snapped, screaming for her to shut up at the top of her lungs. She had completely lost her cool. She started screeching for proof and evidence, practically jumping over the table while her own people tried to hold her back. I just let out a devious little smirk. I asked if she wanted evidence, while Stella continued to scream about a conspiracy in the background. I turned to Russell, who gave me the nod. We were definitely prepared for this exact moment. Russell pulled out a scroll and shouted that here was the forged suicide note. It was the ultimate mic drop. He told the whole room he caught Lila trying to plant it in my room last night. Case closed, right? But wait, there was more. Russell brought out the Scroll of the Earth's Memory, a high-level magic item most of these nobles recognized. He explained this scroll was enchanted to reveal the true, wicked intentions of anyone who touched it through magical visions. The judge looked terrified as Russell declared this magic would show exactly who gave the orders. The truth was about to be laid bare. The judge was panicking, thinking they had to stop this evidence from leaking even if they had to silence everyone. This dude was desperate. Another noble looked just as terrified, knowing their heads were on the chopping block if that scroll was used. I looked over at them with a knowing look. I thought I saw right through them, perfectly predicting their next move. I reached out my hand, ready to call in the cavalry. This was where things got really interesting. I shouted for them to come in at the top of my lungs, and suddenly, the room got a lot more crowded. The judge was frozen in shock as the doors were thrown open. He definitely wasn't expecting backup. A squad of knights in full purple and white armor marched into the hall, looking ready for war. The nobles were all panicking, shouting in shock as their secure little meeting was completely taken over. They tried to protest, saying soldiers had no place here, but the knights weren't listening. They'd officially taken control, declaring the security of the hall was now under their jurisdiction. The power shift was complete. From high above, you could see the knights had completely surrounded the center of the hall. I had put the entire court under house arrest. The judge tried to demand an explanation, but he was clearly shaking. He knew he'd lost control of the situation. Russell held up the scroll and said he'd already seen its shocking contents. He brought the knights in to prevent a total riot once the truth was out. He asked for their understanding while the knights locked down the room with heavy shields. This wasn't a request, it was a statement. The noble from before was still screaming about a coup, but it was clear he was just shouting at a brick wall now. Grunbein was a total mess, sobbing and crying for his mom. This kid was not built for this level of drama. Stella was literally radiating purple anger. She knew the neutral knights officially backing me meant they had undeniable proof. It was game over for her. She was gritting her teeth, knowing there was absolutely nothing left for her to do. Her perfect world was crumbling around her. I turned to Russell and asked what the punishment was for a noble who tried to kill their own family. I asked like I was just checking the rules of a game. Russell's answer was straight out of a horror movie: death by hanging. A spectral noose appeared around Stella's neck as the reality hit her. Stella grabbed Grunbein, screaming she acted alone and he knew nothing. She was trying to save her son at the last second. She tried to play the family card, begging me to remember she was my mother, even if we weren't blood related. Talk about desperate. She'd cry for me to believe her, but I looked at her with ice in my eyes. Lila watched it all go down from the side. I just let out a hollow laugh. I questioned if she really acted alone. I turned to my star witness and asked Lila if that was actually true. Lila's eyes went totally dark and hollow. She began to explain that when she got orders from the Countess, she said the words that ended everything. Prince Grunbein was present as well. You could practically hear the collective gasp in the room. I gave her a terrifying smirk, my eye glowing with a sinister light. I'd won, and I was loving every second of it. Stella was shrieking about lies while holding her terrified, crying son. She'd completely lost her mind. I looked down at them like bugs, saying, yeah, that's a lie, but what if it isn't? I called them the real cowards for starting this. I pointed out the real cowards were the ones who planned the assassination from the start. I looked down at them on the floor with total contempt. Stella and Grunbein cowered in the shadows while I declared that the fox hunt was entering its final stage. Grunbein was shaking like a leaf as I announced the climax of the hunt had finally arrived. It was the ultimate victory lap for me. I stood there glowing like a god against this beautiful backdrop. I wasn't just a prince anymore. I was the undisputed game master of this world. Stella was sprawled on the ground, struggling against her bonds and letting out a muffled groan. She was a far cry from the proud countess we saw earlier. Grunbein slammed his hands onto the stone floor, shouting my name in desperation. He knew the family was at its breaking point, and he was willing to do anything to save his mother. I stood tall and impassive, flanked by the massive form of Russell. I looked down at my kneeling half-brother with a gaze that was both calculating and cold. Grunbein remained on his knees, his head bowed low in a sign of total submission. The weight of his mother's crimes and the threat of execution was clearly crushing him. Stella thrashed, her eyes wide with terror as she watched her son grovel. Grunbein was crying now, realizing his life as he knew it was effectively over. I observed the pathetic display with an analytical eye, almost as if watching a cutscene. I was already thinking 3 steps ahead to the next phase of my plan. I turned slightly, taking in the shocked faces of the nobles in the hall. The atmosphere was thick with tension as everyone waited to see how I would handle this. A close-up of the fine fabric of Grunbein's noble attire highlighted the luxury he was about to lose. He was clenching his teeth, trying to find the courage to speak. From a distance, the scene was hauntingly quiet, with me standing as the center of gravity. Even Russell seemed to be holding his breath, waiting for the verdict. The nobles in the gallery were losing it, their faces a mix of horror and disbelief. They never expected the weak first prince to turn the tables so completely. I broke the silence by calling out my brother's name with an air of authority. Every eye in the hall was fixed on us as the climax began. Grunbein burst into a desperate plea, sobbing he'd accept any punishment as long as I spared his mother. He was literally begging for her life on the floor. Stella let out a shocked gasp through her gag, her eyes filling with tears. She was watching her son trade his future for her life, and it was tearing her apart. Knights moved in to restrain Stella as she tried to shout to her son. The text indicated she was telling him to go back, but it only came out as muffled screams. Grunbein kept his forehead pressed to the cold stone, his spirit completely broken. He'd reached the ultimate point of defeat and was waiting for my judgment. The whispers among the nobles got louder, with some expressing pity for the young prince's devotion. They were amazed he'd go this far to protect a mother who tried to kill his brother. Grunbein looked miserable, his face pale and sweating under the pressure. The weight of the situation was clearly too much for him. I thought the wind had shifted and the crowd was starting to see me as the villain. I realized a too harsh punishment might turn the public against me. Grunbein looked up, his eyes filled with a desperate purple energy as he waited for an answer. He was clinging to the hope that I might show a shred of mercy. I stared down at him, my face shadowed and unreadable. I was deciding exactly what price I wanted to extract for the life of the woman who tried to end mine. I finally knelt to my brother's level, my voice deceptively soft as I acknowledged his care for his mother. I told him there was no choice but to reach a compromise. Grunbein looked up with a flicker of hope in his eyes, his mouth slightly open in anticipation. He hung on my every word. I leaned in with a dark, predatory smile and offered the deal. I whispered that if you admit your guilt, I will reduce your punishment, laying the bait. I continued, promising to plead with the Count to spare Stella from the death penalty if Grunbein confessed. It was a classic high-stakes bargain. A close-up of my eyes showing a cold, greenish glow as I delivered a final warning. I told my brother once, "These words are spoken, they can't be undone." Grunbein was sweating bullets, the reality of the choice hitting him hard. He was caught between saving his mother and a no-win situation. Stella was thrashing like a wild animal, her muffled screams telling her son to stop. She knew I was setting a trap. She glared at me with pure hatred, her eyes bloodshot as she mentally screamed at me. She couldn't believe a younger brother like me was giving orders to his elder. The nobles were stunned by Stella's brazen attitude even in bonds. They shouted about her audacity to try and kill me while still acting so arrogant. The judge-like figure was sweating profusely, realizing the political winds had shifted. He wondered why Grunbein was about to do something so self-destructive. I stood up, ignoring the chaos as someone shouted my name. I was the only calm person in a room full of panic. Russell stepped forward, his voice booming as he demanded Stella's attention. He was done with the games and was ready to enforce the law. Russell pointed toward the guards, ordering them to immediately arrest the criminal countess. The armored knights responded with a crisp, "Yes, sir." Stella was dragged away, struggling and shouting for them to stop and asking if they knew who she was. Her status as a noblewoman was finally worth nothing. Grunbein watched his mother being taken away, his voice small as he whispered, "Mother." The finality of the situation was sinking in. A close-up of Stella showed the gag biting into her mouth as she let out muffled, pained noises. She was crying, her pride finally shattered. Grunbein clenched his jaw, his expression a mix of agony and resolve. He'd reached the point where he was willing to pay any price to save her. From high above, the three of us, me, Russell, and Grunbein, looked like tiny figures in a massive arena. I officially began the formal confession. I stared down at my brother with an icy expression, asking for the final time if he admitted to attempting to poison me. It was the ultimate checkmate. Grunbein's face was cast in deep shadow as he struggled with the words. He was sweating, knowing this. I was the beginning of the end for his future. He finally said it with a look of pure misery. I do. He'd officially confessed his guilt in front of the entire noble court. I thought to myself, of course he did. If he hadn't, his last hope would have vanished. I was playing my brother like a master strategist. A shot of Grunbein slumped back as he realized everything he'd worked for was calculated by me from the start. He'd been completely outplayed. Russell looked at the kneeling prince and simply said, "Understood." The formal part of the trial was over now that a confession had been made. Russell announced that since Grunbein admitted his guilt, the memory of the Earth Scroll, which could ruin the family's honor, would remain hidden. He made it sound like a mercy. I reached out with a dramatic gesture, my red cloak flowing behind me. I was about to deliver the price for the reduced sentence. A wide shot of the hall showed the sheer scale of the consequences. I told the room that to ensure no further appeals, the criminal must pay a special price. I delivered the final condition with a chillingly calm look. I declared the criminal must close their own mana hall, effectively ending Grunbein's career as a knight. The narration explained that in this strict class-based society, using mana was the only way for a noble to maintain status. Losing it meant dropping to the level of a commoner. Closing one's mana hall was a ritual known as the social death penalty. It was a fate considered by many nobles to be worse than actual death. Grunbein was trembling, tears streaming down his face as he muttered for his mother. He realized the impossible choice I'd forced on him. Stella thrashed against the knights, her muffled screams showing her desperation to stop her son. She knew this was my ultimate victory. Grunbein's mind raced with fear. He knew if he didn't do it, his mother would be exposed and executed, but if he did, his future was destroyed. He thought of the alternative, but a hanging awaits beyond that. He was terrified and trapped, with no way out of the maze I built. Stella was still fighting, making desperate sounds to her gag as she watched her son. The knights were having a hard time keeping her still. She finally managed a muffled, "No, Grunbein," as she realized he was going to go through with it. She reached out, her eyes filled with tears of regret. Grunbein made the final, agonizing decision. He knew for a noble, shutting down their mana hall was a death sentence, but he couldn't let his mother die. He reached for the magical scroll, his voice a whisper as he mentioned promises. He was committing to the deal he made with me. He looked up with a gaze both terrified and determined. He said promises must be kept at all costs, trying to convince himself he was doing the right thing. Russell looked down at the boy with professional detachment, simply saying, "Of course." He'd seen enough of these political games to know how they always end. Russell handed over the scroll, asking for it, and I simply confirmed with a cold yes. The ritual was ready to begin. A close-up of Grunbein's hands gripping the scroll, his knuckles white and his fingers shaking uncontrollably. He was about to destroy the very core of his identity. The scroll exploded with a blinding golden light as the magic was activated. Grunbein was bathed in energy as the process of closing his mana hall began. Stella screamed and cried behind her gag, watching her son's future evaporate. "Stop," she thought as she thrashed in the knight's grip. Once the mana hall is closed, even the Grandmaster can't restore it. This was a permanent, life-altering change. Energy swirled around Grunbind's arm as the magic took hold. He was throwing it all away for a mother who would never have done the same. Grunbind let out a pained groan as the energy struck his chest. The ritual was clearly agonizing, both physically and spiritually. The entire hall filled with the magical glow from the ritual, casting long shadows across the faces of the stunned nobles. It was a moment of complete defeat for the Countess's faction. I watched the process with a cold, almost bored expression. I was no longer the victim. I was the architect of my family's social death penalty, and I hadn't broken a sweat. Grunbind was actually going through with it, clutching the magical scroll as it glowed with an intense, golden light. He was deleting his own future to save his mother, and you could see the sheer weight of that choice in his eyes. The ritual was in full swing now, with a massive orb of mana swirling right in front of Grunbind. This wasn't just a flashy light show, it was his power being sealed away forever. The light began to condense and fade, pulling back into a single point of energy. It was a quiet, heavy moment as the last of his mana drained from the room. The final spark of light sat right over his heart as the system confirmed the unthinkable. His mana hall had been officially closed, marking the end of his path as a knight. The crowd's reaction set it all complete in total shock. These nobles stared at him like they'd seen a ghost, realizing they just witnessed a social death penalty in real time. Stella was on the floor, devastated as she watched her son throw his life away for her. She cried through her gag, knowing her own greed led to this exact moment. Grunbind looked down at his empty hands, trying to convince himself he did the right thing. He thought if he could help his mother with this sacrifice, then maybe it was worth it. Stella slumped over, her spirit completely broken as the reality hit her. She realized it was over. Her plan, her power, and her son's future were all gone. Grunbind looked like he'd aged 10 years in a single minute, looking exhausted. He was biological royalty, but he was way too naive for a world this cruel. He tried to offer some comfort to his mother, telling her not to be discouraged. He was still trying to be the good son even though their world was crumbling. An extreme close-up of Stella's eyes. They were filled with nothing but pure, unadulterated rage. She wasn't sad about her son, she was fuming at me. She thrashed against her chains, the gag barely containing the scream she wanted to let out. She was staring a hole through me, blaming me for everything that went wrong. The chains rattled and pulled tight as she struggled on the floor like a cornered animal. It was a pathetic sight for a woman who was just acting like the queen of the castle. She finally let out a muffled screech, vowing to curse me for generations. She was shouting she'd tear me apart, but let's be real, she wasn't doing anything from that position. I just stood there, looking as cold and indifferent as a statue. I had done the math. Without mana, Grunbind would never even reach the level of a low-tier knight. I looked over at Lila, using her as a benchmark for how weak my brother had become. In my eyes, Grunbind was now officially a non-threat in the game of power. Grunbind reached out toward his mother, looking like he just wanted to go home. The tragedy was that he didn't have a home to go back to anymore. I had a moment of reflection, thinking about the guilt of taking away a child's future. I was looking a bit human for a second, but don't let that fool you. A chibi version of me popped up to shake that feeling off. No, it's just a character in a game, I thought, reminding myself this was all just a high-stakes walkthrough. Russell stood there with a massive question mark over his head, confused by my sudden change in mood. He had no idea I was currently arguing with my own internal gamer logic. My expression snapped back to that of a ruthless strategist. The game master was back in control, and I was ready to move on to the next phase of the cleanup. I signaled for Russell to follow me as we began the disposal process. There was no turning back. I was committed to seeing this through to the end. A wide shot of the Grand Hall showed just how small and isolated the former rulers looked now. The power had completely shifted, and the room was heavy with anticipation. I laid down the law. Until the investigation was finished, Stella and Grunbind were forbidden from talking to anyone. They were being treated like common prisoners in their own home. The two were led away, walking past me, the man who just dismantled their lives. Grunbind looked down in shame while Stella looked like she was planning her next murder. The knights escorted them through the massive wooden doors, officially removing them from the center of power. It was the final exit for the former countess and her son. I watched them leave with quiet satisfaction. I'd cleared the biggest obstacle in my way, but I wasn't done with the rest of the traitors. Gidros, the chief financial officer, looked like he was about to have a heart attack. He knew exactly who I was looking at next, and he was terrified. Russell pointed a finger and bellowed that Gidros was suspected of leaking confidential documents. This old guy's corrupt world was about to come crashing down. Russell officially declared him stripped of his title and ordered him to be detained immediately. Gidros tried to protest, but nobody was listening to a traitor. Gidros lost his dignity, screaming at the knights and calling them lowly soldiers. Big mistake, buddy. Those soldiers were currently dragging you to a dungeon. He tried to fight back as the knights grabbed him, but it was a losing battle. He was yelling for them not to touch him with their filthy hands while being manhandled. The knights didn't care about his insults and literally dragged him across the floor. He looked pathetic, a far cry from the high-ranking official he used to be. I watched the chaos with a subtle, dark smile. They're doing well, I thought, pleased with how Russell was handling the heavy lifting. The remaining nobles at the table were shaking in their boots, wondering if they were next on the list. The silence in the hall was deafening as they waited for the next name. I stood there, bathed in moonlight, looking like the ultimate protagonist. I knew the succession dispute was over, but I was just getting started with the internal restructuring. The whispering nobles were realizing that even without a title or faction, I had effectively taken control. They were terrified the entire Knight's Order was now aligned with me. I stood in the middle of the hall, the undisputed center of attention. I knew I'd sent a clear warning to everyone in the room, cross me and you're finished. I started walking toward the exit, my red cloak flowing behind me. Every eye followed me as I moved, the tension rising with every step. I paused to look back, and you could see the calculations running in my head. I wasn't just leaving, I was making sure everyone knew I was in charge. One noble in particular looked like he was about to pass out from the stress. He was sweating bullets as he waited for a single word from me. Russell got right in the guy's face, warning them all to stop making unnecessary misunderstandings. He was telling them to fall in line or else. A shot of the long council table, which looked a lot emptier now. The power dynamic of the Sheik and Count Dum had been completely rewritten in a single night. Garrett, the man in the white headgear, bowed his head in total submission. He was a symbol of scholarship in the territory, but right now he looked like a man who's lost everything. He formally requested to resign, taking responsibility for the mismanagement of the financial office. He tried to exit gracefully before I could throw him in a dungeon. I looked at him with a neutral expression, noting Garrett was well regarded by his subordinates. I was weighing the man's value against his potential for betrayal. Russell shut him down immediately, denying the resignation request. He warned that total turnover in staff would cause too much backlash and chaos. Garrett was handed a list of officials involved in the assassination attempt. He looked at the names with a mix of horror and resignation, knowing his department was a mess. He stared at the paper, realizing how deep the rot went. This wasn't just a few bad apples, it was a systematic betrayal from within. I watched him with a piercing gaze, my teal eyes reflecting the soft light. I waited to see if his man had the spine to do what needed to be done. I started walking away with Russell, but I wasn't done giving orders. I moved with a purpose that said I'd already planned the next 3 weeks of governance. I dropped a bombshell. Every financial officer except 4 was now under investigation. I'd effectively decapitated the entire department in one sentence. A close-up of my glowing green eye as I declared the need for new, trusted officials. I wasn't asking for permission, I was stating a new reality. Garrett was flabbergasted, shouting in shock. He begged for leniency for those with minor offenses, terrified of the scale of the purge. I wasn't having it, stating we must staff a department with people we can absolutely trust. To me, a 90% betrayal rate was a failure that required a complete reset. Garrett just stared at me, realizing for the first time I was playing a completely different game than everyone else. He was speechless in the face of such absolute resolve. I stood there with my arms crossed, wondering if these people would be grateful for my mercy, or just get cocky again. I was already thinking about long-term ego management. Garrett tried one last plea, but I cut him off with a sharp, "Very well, please." I was done listening to excuses. I got a dark, intense look and declared my mind was already made up. I was radiating a level of authority no one in this room had ever seen before. Garrett looked genuinely shaken, realizing the prince before him was a completely different person. He was looking at a ruler, not a student. A quick flashback of the old me, weak and indecisive, crying by a fountain. It was a stark contrast to the monster I'd become today. The nobles were watching the exchange with bated breath, noting even the brilliant Garrett was faltering. They realized the symbol of scholarship was no match for the prince. The tension in the room reached a breaking point as everyone realized this was actually happening. The weak prince had officially taken the reins of the territory. I let out a low, sinister chuckle in the shadows. I was enjoying the chaos I'd created, like a pro gamer who just cleared a difficult level. A wicked grin spread across my face as I declared the power of the Sheik and Count Dom was almost mine. I'd finally reached the win condition of this opening arc. My eyes glowed with an intense, otherworldly green light. I wasn't just a noble anymore, I was the undisputed master of my own destiny. The system brought up the status screen for Garrett Olson, showing his stats and evaluation. I was scanning the data, looking for any more info I could exploit. I looked through the translucent blue window, analyzing Garrett's administrative skills like a player checking a character sheet. To me, these people were just resources to manage. Suddenly, dozens of status screens popped up all over the hall. I was looking at the stats of every single noble at the table, searching for the best ones to recruit. I hid my face in the shadows, letting out a dark, satisfied grin. This is interesting, I thought. ready to build my perfect team from the survivors of the Purge. I looked over the grand hall, scanning the room like a complex game board. I knew I needed to restructure this entire government, but I was thinking 3 steps ahead. I pulled up the status screen for Garrett Olson, noting the chief administrator was worried about how much time this transition would take. I didn't have time to waste, so I was checking everyone's stats. I looked over my shoulder with a sharp, analytical gaze. To me, these nobles were open books with predictable patterns. If they're easy to read, they're easy to control. I looked at the gathered nobles, already mentally crossing names off my list. Opposing factions will be surely eliminated, I thought, treating this like a strategy game where you delete weak units. My eyes narrowed as I scanned the fence-sitters. In my new world order, even those with ambiguous positions were getting the boot. There was no room for uncertainty. I looked at the dozens of blue status screens floating around the room, highlighting the useless officials. I was basically doing a mass fire event of anyone who didn't meet my standards. I let out a dark, chilling laugh, my face shadowed with a sinister grin. I'll only use those who survive the loyalty contest, I thought, fully embracing the role of a ruthless mastermind. The nobles were terrified, whispering how scary I was while I stared them down. That one dark look was enough to make everyone in the room realize they were fighting for their lives. The panic was real. These guys were convinced if they stayed on my bad side, they'd literally lose their heads. They were shaking in their boots, trying to figure out how to survive. Suddenly, the hall erupted into a desperate mess as everyone started shouting their loyalty at once. They were tripping over each other, screaming my name and trying to suck up to me. I immediately flipped the switch back to innocent prince mode, putting on a bright, sunny smile. I told everyone to calm down, that there was plenty of time, acting like I wasn't just planning their executions. The nobles were left sweating and stunned by my sudden shift in personality. They stared at me with wide eyes, completely unable to keep up with my psychological warfare. Even Russell felt the pressure, rubbing his temples like he had a massive headache. Dealing with a genius prince who acted like a psychopath was clearly taking its toll. The scene shifted to the castle at night, looking peaceful and majestic under the starry sky. Inside, however, the real work was just beginning. Back in my bedroom, I let out a long, satisfied stretch. I groaned, finally letting my guard down after a long day of political maneuvering. I collapsed onto my bed with a relieved sound. Even for a pro gamer, running a real territory was much more exhausting than playing on a monitor. I lay there with my arms wide, staring at the ceiling and admitting I was so tired. The high of winning was fading into a much-needed need for sleep. My eyes fluttered as I started to drift off, my teal pupils glowing softly in the dim light. I was finally alone with my thoughts, reflecting on the journey that brought me here. I thought back on my old life, remembering how I used to be average in studies and looks. It was a distant memory now, but it's what drove me to be special in this new world. A montage of my old, boring, brown-haired self flashed through my mind. I was just another face in the crowd, living an unremarkable life until that fateful game changed everything. I remembered thinking, but what if I beat the game that no one could clear? That one spark of competitive spirit was the catalyst for my entire transformation. I recalled the lonely nights at my computer, surrounded by notes and diagrams. I was desperate to become someone special, someone who finally mattered in a world that ignored me. The memory of that final screen popped up. Congratulations, Game Master. I was the first human to ever reach the seat of the gods, a title I was now living for real. The voice of the game echoed in my head. You are the first human to acquire the seat of the gods. It still felt surreal, like I was trapped in the ultimate high-stakes dream. I remembered the moment I hit my breaking point, wishing I could be reborn on the continent of Ellen. I thought everything was over, never imagining my wish would actually come true. Suddenly, the memories of my 2 lives started to blur, blonde hair and brown hair mixing in a chaotic swirl. I was at the center of a cosmic shift I still didn't fully understand. I snapped my eyes open as a memory of the game's lore hit me. I thought about when I first started the game, realizing my knowledge might be both a blessing and a curse. The system message appeared on a blue sky: survive the turbulent times, deliver judgment, and any wish will be granted. This was my new mission, my ultimate quest for this world. I bolted upright in bed with a shocked realization as a massive idea hit me. I was sweating and wide-eyed, my heart pounding against my ribs. I thought back to that desperate wish I made in my old room. I asked myself if it granted my wish, looking at my new hands with a mix of awe and terror. I looked a bit green, clutching my stomach as I wondered if they thought that was my wish. It seemed the gods might have a twisted sense of humor. I flopped back down and rolled over, trying to process the magnitude of what had happened. I muttered that in any case, there was no turning back now, accepting my new reality. I stared into the dark, wondering if clearing this world and ascending again would let me make another wish. I was already planning my next endgame before I'd even finished the tutorial. I closed my eyes with pure determination, vowing to definitely clear this world. I'm a pro gamer, and quitting has never been an option for me. I settled in for the night, the room silent except for my breathing. I looked like a normal teenager sleeping, but my mind was a battlefield of stats and strategies. The camera pulled back to show the exterior of the castle towers under the moonlight. The silence was heavy, knowing I was currently resting for the battles ahead. Morning arrived, and bright sunlight streamed through the ornate wooden window. It was a fresh start for the newly motivated prince of the Shikan territory. I stood at the window, stretching my arms toward the sky with a loud sound. I looked more energized and ready than I'd ever been. I asked myself where I should start, my eyes sharp and focused. I was done with the games and ready to get down to the business of ruling. I paced across the room, noting that while I remembered the Earl's territory perfectly, I'd never heard of this Shikan territory. It was a major plot hole in my game knowledge. I tapped my chin, deep in thought. I wondered where this place was anyway. If it wasn't in the game I spent 10 years playing, then where was I? I sat on the floor and summoned my floating blue HUD. I thought I should look for it on the map, hoping the system had the answers I needed. Suddenly, a notification popped up acknowledging I had a history of conquering the continent of Ellen. The system was recognizing my past achievements as a player. A new message appeared, clear bonus, all map markers displayed. My eyes went wide as I shouted in surprise. This was the ultimate cheat code. I was glowing with excitement, my face flushed with a big, happy grin. This is like a treasure map, I thought, realizing I had a literal God's eye view of the world. A close-up of my eye reflecting the map data. Every ruin, dungeon, and secret feature in Hero's Destiny was being laid out right in front of me. The system explained this was a clear bonus that nobody else knew about because I was the only one to finish the game. I was finally being rewarded for those 10 years of obsession. I scanned the map, seeing names like Josefu and noting it even included information I didn't have before. I was basically holding the keys to the entire continent. I was so hyped I started rolling on my bed like a kid on Christmas. I laughed that this was going to be way too easy, feeling absolutely invincible. But then I stopped mid-roll, my expression turning serious. I wondered what year it was now. I needed to know exactly where I was on the timeline to use my knowledge. The system displayed Imperial Year 289. I realized the main story of Heroes' Destiny wasn't supposed to start until year 294. I was 5 years early. I sat up with a grave expression, my blonde hair messy from my rolling. Being 5 years early meant I could change everything, but it also meant I was in uncharted territory. I stared blankly into space, wondering why I'd never heard of the Earl of Shekin if I was in the same world. There was something major missing from the history books. My face twisted into a look of pure, wide-eyed terror. Does that mean this land is destined to disappear within 5 years? I thought, realizing my reward might be a sinking ship. I remembered Russell mentioning the territory's poor finances. I was sweating as I realized the real reason I almost got killed was they couldn't even afford security. I quickly pulled up the Shikan Earl's territory financial status window. I was dreading what I was about to see, my fingers trembling as I clicked the icon. I let out a horrified scream, clutching my head in total shock. I shouted in disbelief about what this was. The numbers were clearly worse than my most terrifying nightmare. An exterior shot of the castle emphasized my shout. This is unbelievable. My voice probably carried all the way to the village below. A final, extreme close-up of my bloodshot, wide-eyed gaze. I whispered a stunned, "No way," realizing my new kingdom was in a total economic collapse. Talk about a hard mode start. I stared at the financial ledgers with desperation, wondering if I should take the cash and run. But I couldn't run away with the land, trapped between my survival instincts and my noble duties. I leaned my head on my hand, getting serious as I contemplated the situation. Money could be made again, but the Shikan land was a one-time inheritance. It'd be a waste to abandon everything I gained. I started digging through all the financial records, slamming a massive book onto the desk with a loud thud. I was ready to pull an all-nighter to find where the money was leaking. I scanned the tax documents, noting farmland revenue was standard for the region. I spotted a temporary spike in the national defense budget from last year, but that wasn't the main cause. A vertical montage showed the hours ticking away as the sun set outside. I was buried in a mountain of paperwork, my desk covered in scrolls and ledgers as I hunted for clues. Finally, I face-planted onto my desk with an exhausted groan, complaining I was so tired. Sifting through 10 years of boring financial history was the most difficult quest I'd ever faced. I lay back, staring at the ceiling and identifying the first major red flag. All trade with the Madrosa Desert Kingdom beyond the highlands had been cut off, a massive blow to our income. A map of the Earldom of Shikan showed the Gorda Plateau blocking the route to the Madrosa Desert Kingdom. Without that trade flow, the territory lost a huge chunk of its customs duties. I let out a long, frustrated sigh. While the trade interruption was inevitable, something worse was hidden in these books, and it was clearly no accident. I exploded with fury, my aura turning into a wall of flame as I read the interest rates. I screamed about where they borrowed such a huge amount from, realizing the interest was higher than our yearly tax revenue. I was hunched over my desk, surrounded by open books and messy notes. I'd hit a wall with the paperwork and realized I needed more information from a living source. I closed my eyes, clearing my head after hours of number crunching. I muttered to myself as the gears in my gamer brain turned, looking for a shortcut. My eyes snapped open with a sharp, teal glow. I'd finally found my target. I thought about information, realizing the answers were currently sitting in a cell beneath the castle. I got a devious, calculating grin. I remembered Gidris, that pig who helped bleed the estate dry, was still locked up in the underground prison. A flashback showed Gidris looking like a terrified, sweaty mess. He was the one who knew who the money was borrowed from and why the trade routes were really closed. I headed down the dark, spiral stone stairs into the dungeon. The lighting was dim and the atmosphere was heavy with the smell of damp stone and old iron. I descended further into the gloom, my red cloak the only splash of color in the gray hallway. I was focused and ready to squeeze answers out of my former CFO. A guard stood at attention, shocked to see me in such a place. He asked Prince Calyx, "What brings you here?" clearly rattled by the sudden visit. I immediately covered my nose, disgusted by the smell. I groaned about what a stench it was, realizing the sewage system here had been completely neglected for years. The warden followed, stammering he never imagined I would visit. I was sizing him up, my analytical gaze checking every detail of the security chief's man. The warden was sweating and bowing, clearly the type that submits to power. I was unimpressed, thinking how easy it would be to manipulate a man like this. I scanned the warden's face, noting he was one of the chief of security's men. To me, this guy was just another predictable NPC in the political landscape. The warden was acting incredibly humble, telling me how honored he was to meet me. He was trying his best to look useful and obedient. I walked past him with a cold look, my eye reflecting the iron bars. I said, "Now then," my voice carrying an edge of authority that silenced the room. I looked back at the guard with a serious expression. This man easily betrayed his previous master, and I decided to make use of that weak loyalty. I noted the warden was weak to authority. I thought if there were innocent people captured, they should be given a chance to clear their names. I gave the warden a wicked, knowing smile. I asked what he thought, basically testing him to see if he'd follow a direct order to release certain prisoners. The warden was sweating bullets, nodding frantically and saying, "You're absolutely right." He was terrified of contradicting me. I told him that criminals who shouldn't be released should be reinvestigated. I was putting the warden in a high-pressure position, making him my personal investigator. The warden snapped a salute, shouting he understood, my lord. He was fully submissive now, eager to follow any command I gave. I watched him walk away, thinking how this man easily betrayed the chief of security. I realized I was acting like one of the ruthless politicians I used to despise. I warned the warden to be mindful of his terms since I wasn't a lord yet. The guard was terrified, stammering out a desperate apology. I looked away with a sigh, telling him there was no need to apologize. I was done with the games and wanted to get to the pig in the cell. Suddenly, a loud clang echoed as we reached Gidris's cell. The guard was following closely behind, still trying to suck up to me. Gidris was screaming from behind the bars, complaining about the disgusting food and shouting he'd be out soon. He was still clinging to his old arrogance. I stood at the bars, looking down at the man with a cold, mocking expression. I asked if he was planning an escape, my voice dripping with sarcasm. I let out a loud, taunting laugh that echoed through the dungeon. I was throwing Gidris's situation back in his face, showing him exactly who was in charge. Gidris looked up with a shocked expression while I told him he owed me one. It was a total mental attack, making the prisoner feel he'd already lost. Gidris tried to act tough, asking what he could possibly owe me. I stood tall, looking down through the bars with pure, unadulterated contempt. The warden looked on with a smug expression as I told Gidris it was almost time for his execution. The reality of the situation finally started to crack Gidris's composure. Gidris tried a different tactic, chuckling and mentioning his 20 years of experience. He thought his financial knowledge was a shield that would protect him. I leaned in, my face serious and backlit. I told the prisoner I knew he was the reason I took the trouble to visit, acknowledging the man's dark importance. Gidris muttered he thought he understood with a nasty grin. He thought he'd found a way to negotiate out of this mess using the massive debt as leverage. I called him former chief financial officer, making sure Gidris knew his title was gone. I asked if he really thought he could use that debt to save his life. My aura turned dark and heavy as I thought, this pig doesn't know his place. Gidris let out a frustrated sound, his smug grin finally starting to fade. Suddenly, I screamed for the warden with a voice that shook the dungeon. The warden snapped to attention with a frantic, "Yes," as he wondered what was coming. I asked if there was a torture expert here, and the warden looked like he was about to faint. I wasn't playing around anymore. I was ready to get the info by any means necessary. I ordered him to bring him, pointing toward the hallway. The warden stammered and asked if I meant right now, realizing I was in a very bad mood. I was fuming right now, looking like I was about to lose it. I got right in the warden's face with a terrifying aura, asking if I looked like I was joking. The warden was shaking in his boots, realizing he messed up big time. He stammered a panicked sound and promised to fetch the torture expert immediately. This dude was hauling tail down the corridor at top speed. I just stood there in the dark dungeon, radiating a menacing light that made the hallway feel even creepier. I thought it was hilarious. The warden thought he could smooth talk his way out of this because of his age. I walked with cold confidence, realizing the man in the cell was about to learn a hard lesson. Look at those glowing teal eyes. That's the look of a guy who was fully embracing his new role. I knew I was becoming the real power behind the Earl's estate and wasn't letting anyone stand in my way. Gidris was finally starting to sweat bullets behind those iron bars. He realized calling in a torture expert was a game changer, muttering a desperate curse as his situation went from bad to worse. I leaned my head against the iron bars, looking at the cowering prisoner. I casually mentioned I didn't think someone like Gidris had much endurance for what was coming. I told him to do his best, with a deceptively calm voice. Gidris was sweating, looking up with a face full of pure terror. I got a terrifying backlit glow, telling Gidris that if I was impressed by his resilience, I might change the hanging to a slow, creeping death. That was brutal. Gidris looked broken, his eyes watery and his face pale with fear. He finally realized he wasn't dealing with a weak child but a total monster. One last extreme close-up of Gidris's wide, teal eye reflecting me. He's serious, he thought, realizing his life was in the hands of a man with zero mercy. Gidris was desperate now, begging for his life as I stared him down with a cold, unreadable expression. He claimed he had valuable information, the last card a cornered rat plays. The former official screamed through the bars about a huge profit opportunity. He tried to sell me on a get-rich-quick scheme to save his own neck. I wasn't impressed, thinking this guy was just wasting my time. Still, I let out a bored, "Oh," and told him, "Let's hear it," giving Gidris one final chance. Gidris mentioned the entire debt of the Earl's territory, knowing that was keeping me up at night. He knelt in the dirt, trying to look like a helpful advisor instead of a traitor. He dropped a name, Gerard Mirsas, a merchant who apparently held the keys to everything. I looked thoughtful, as Gidris explained this guy managed the secret vault for the rival Kosharin family. The tea was piping hot. Turns out the Kosharin family used this merchant to divert mining taxes meant for the royal family. I stood there taking it all in, realizing I just found a massive political grenade. Gidris suggested that if we accused the merchant before the royal family, the debt became void. He looked smug for a guy in a dungeon, thinking he'd handed me a get-out-of-jail-free card. I narrowed my eyes, playing devil's advocate. I asked what would happen if the merchant sold the debt rights at a low price before he got arrested. I asked, for example, what if it was sold to the Kosharin family, looking unimpressed? I was telling Gidris his valuable info had a giant hole in it. Gidris looked like his brain just short-circuited. He hadn't considered the merchant would have a backup plan, and now he realized he was back to square one with a very angry prince. Suddenly, the warden came charging back, shouting he brought him. I didn't turn around, keeping my focus on the pathetic prisoner. Meet the best torturer in the Earl's territory. This guy lived like he stepped out of a horror movie, complete with a creepy mask and a giant, notched axe. The masked figure stood there radiating a dark purple aura that screamed, "Don't touch." Gidris looked like he was about to have a heart attack just from this guy's vibe. I started to walk away, acting completely bored with the conversation. Gidris lost it, grabbing the bars and screaming for mercy as the executioner loomed in the background. Gidris was shaking the bars so hard his knuckles were white, pleading for me to have mercy. He'd realized his little financial tips weren't going to save him from the guy with the axe. I gave him a wicked, glittering smile. I knew the Kosharin family slush funds should exceed at least 1 million gold, and I wanted every single coin. I used my Game Master vision, my eye glowing with that familiar green light as I scanned Gidris for more secrets. I looked right through his lies to the treasure hidden behind them. I started to leave again, casually glancing over my shoulder. I was playing Gidris like a fiddle, letting the fear of the torturer do all the hard work. I whistled a little tune as I walked away, my boots clicking on the stone. Behind me, Gidris was left in the dark with a masked freak who was definitely not there for a chat. It worked. Gidris cracked and screamed for me to wait. "Please wait," saying he knew where Gerard's secret vault was. This was the real jackpot. I stopped dead in my tracks, my expression turning sharp and dangerous. I asked about a secret vault. My interest finally peaked. The torturer didn't miss a beat and slammed Gidris against the stone floor with a loud thud. He told him to shut up, but I was already hooked on the lead. The masked man let out an ominous laugh, his red eyes glowing with a sinister light. Gidris was pinned to the ground, looking like a mess as he tried to bargain for his life. Gidris was practically sobbing, insisting it was true because he was a financial officer for so many years. He was willing to sell out every secret he had to get that torturer away. I walked back to the bars, looking down at the cowering man with total authority. I declared, "There is no doubt my presence filling the dungeon." I reached through the bars and grabbed Gidris by the face, forcing him to look up. I commanded him to speak, and you could tell I wasn't going to ask again. I asked how he could possibly know the location of a top-secret vault. Gidris was stammering, his eyes darting around as he tried to find the words. Gidris was clearly hiding something embarrassing. He looked like he was about to vomit from the stress of being caught between a prince and an executioner. I turned to the torturer and asked if we shall begin. The masked man responded with a crisp yes and a terrifyingly excited sound. The torturer grabbed Gidris's hand, his fingers like iron claws. He said, "Then, let's start by breaking your fingers, one by one." An effective interrogation technique. Gidris spilled everything. He shouted he tried to steal from the vault once but failed, admitting he's not just a traitor, but a bad thief too. I was genuinely surprised, asking if he didn't go himself. I couldn't believe the high and mighty financial officer would get his hands dirty. Gidris admitted he paid some thieves to do the dirty work. He was sitting on the floor of his cell, looking like a total loser as he recounted his failed heist. I was curious now, asking how much he paid these thieves. I was probably trying to gauge how much of the Earl's money this guy wasted. Gidris mumbled, 300, and I was baffled. I wondered if it was 300 gold and if this guy was serious. Even for a prince, that sounded like a lot for a failed job. 3,000, Gidris clarified, and I looked like I was about to have a stroke. I literally couldn't believe the level of stupidity I was dealing with. Check out the visual of the 3,000 gold coins. That's a massive mountain of cash. I stood there with a blank expression, my brain trying to process the sheer scale of embezzlement. I repeated 3,000 with pure disbelief. Gidris was glowing purple with shame, looking like he wanted to disappear. The torturer and the warden were losing it, laughing their heads off at how badly Gidris got scammed. Even the dungeon staff thought this guy was a total joke. They were laughing so hard they were practically crying. The warden joked maybe they should kill him now, while Gidris sat there sweating bullets. I got serious, pointing out that 3,000 gold was half the yearly tax revenue for the whole territory. I asked where he got that money, though I already knew the answer. My eye glowed with a cold, teal light as I accused Gidris of embezzling the Earl's funds. The shadows around me made me look like a game master punishing a cheating player. Gidris screamed he had no choice. He claimed if the key hadn't been a magical crystal ball, he would have pulled off the greatest heist in history. I was intrigued by the mention of a magical item. I asked about a magical crystal ball, my gamer brain already thinking about how to add that to my inventory. Gidris explained he was told duplicating the crystal ball would cost another 2,500 gold. He told his story to a very skeptical-looking me. I thought this information could be useful. I was already planning how to bypass the security and take the vault for myself. I dropped the hammer and told Gidris straight up, "You got scammed." Gidris looked like he'd just been slapped, his mouth hanging open in shock. I explained the thieves and the merchant Gerard Mirsas were obviously working together to bleed him dry. Gidris was left looking like the world's biggest sucker. Gidris was desperate to prove he wasn't useless, claiming he personally confirmed the entrance with his own eyes. He was begging me to believe him. I got right to the point. "Where is it?" I asked, where this vault was. I was done with the backstory and wanted the coordinates immediately. My face was shadowed and serious as I waited for the answer. You could feel the tension as the location of 1,000,000 gold coins was about to be revealed. Gidris whispered that it was in the Gorda Highlands. He looked like a man who'd just given away his last secret, hoping it was enough to keep his head on his shoulders. A map flashed on the screen as Gidris explained he was blindfolded, so we didn't know the exact spot, but he was certain it was in the Gorda Highlands. I looked at the map, my mind racing. I thought about the Gorda Highlands. I was already searching my memory for any ruins or dungeons in that area. The warden and the torturer watched me, wondering why I was staring into space. Gidris asked where I was looking, but I was already a world away. The map focus shifted to the Highlands as I thought about the surrounding ruins. I was using my knowledge of the hero's destiny map to narrow the search area. A system notification popped up, telling me to research surrounding ruins. I had a rough idea of where to look, but I knew I'd need to investigate further to find the entrance. I realized I needed someone familiar with the terrain. I was tapping my chin, thinking about which of my new assets could serve as a guide. I thought of Lila, the assassin who went through that brutal training camp in the Highlands. She was the perfect candidate, if I could keep her from stabbing me. My eyes snapped open with pure realization. I'd found my path to the treasure, and I was ready to move out immediately. I turned to the warden and snapped that we were leaving. The guard was so startled he practically jumped out of his skin, stammering for me to come this way. Gidris was left gripping the bars, looking confused. He called out for me, wondering if he was going to be left alone with the torturer. I walked away without a second look, my mind already on the highlands. Behind me, Gidris was still shouting, his voice echoing through the empty dungeon. The massive iron door slammed shut with a heavy bang, cutting off Gidris's pleas. The interrogation was over, and the hunt for the vault had begun. The warden and I walked back out into the castle hallway. I looked calm, but you can tell the gears in my head were turning at 100 miles an hour. I was thinking how infuriating it was that Gidris embezzled 3,000 gold while the warden was taking bribes from him. The corruption in this house was deeper than I thought. I stopped and thought, I couldn't let the warden off without doing something. I decided to give the man one final push to ensure total loyalty. I called out to Warden Shua with a deceptively calm voice. The warden stopped, looking nervous as he waited for what I had to say. I mentioned Gidris embezzled a massive amount of gold and asked if the warden was unaware. I was laying a trap, and the warden was about to walk right into it. Warden Shua was sweating buckets, stammering, "Of course, Prince." He was trying to play it cool, thinking he was safe because there was no proof he took bribes. I got a terrifying dark aura, asking myself, is there no way he knows I took money from Gidris? I was telling the man I knew exactly what he did. I told the warden I overheard something from Gidris while he was away. The psychological pressure was making the warden practically melt. The warden's face went pale as I told him I was a generous man, but wondered how much I could overlook. I held his entire career and life in my hands. The warden collapsed to his knees, his head hitting the floor in a desperate plea for forgiveness. He screamed for me to please forgive him, totally broken. Chibimi looked on with a smug face while the warden cursed Gidris in his head for snitching. He was thinking how that pig betrayed him from behind bars. He was bowing and scraping, promising he wouldn't do this again. He'd officially been broken and would now follow me to the ends of the earth. Warden Shua looked up with a face full of pure, unadulterated terror. He was waiting for a response, but all he got was the silence of the hallway. He realized I had vanished into thin air. He stammered my title, looking around the empty corridor like he'd seen a ghost. He was left alone in the dark courtyard, looking lost. He'd realized that the new prince was someone you never, ever wanted to cross. He gritted his teeth, his face twisted in rage as he decided to take his frustration out on Gidris. He vowed to show him hell, storming back toward the dungeon. I was actually peeking over a wall, wearing a truly devious little smirk. I was watching the warden go, pleased with how my little psychological game turned out. I watched the warden run off, thinking, well, whatever, now for Gidris. I'd successfully turned my subordinates against each other, ensuring they were too busy fighting to plot against me. Suddenly, my expression changed as I felt a presence behind me. I let out a surprised sound as I turned to see who was there. A massive dark silhouette towered over me in the alleyway. The text asked, "Who is it?" leaving us on a total cliffhanger as I faced a new mystery. The scene opened with a wide shot of the castle courtyard at night, looking quiet and unassuming. But in this story, something always lurks in the shadows. I was on high alert, my eye narrowing as I caught a presence behind me. I let out a sharp, "Who?" as I prepared to deal with whoever was tailing me. A young man with brown hair and a clean-cut knight's uniform stepped into the light. He looked formal and professional, asking a calm, "Who are you?" as he faced me. I sized him up instantly, noting his gear meant he was likely from the Blue Lion Order. I kept my guard up, asking what the stranger wanted at this hour. The knight placed a hand over his heart in a respectful salute, introducing himself as Kraut Salim. He explained Lord Russell's proxy ordered him to act as my personal escort. I activated my cheat vision, my eye glowing with digital data as I scanned the new guy. I muttered that I saw, ready to see if this Kraut was worth keeping around. The status screen for Kraut Salim popped up, and man, his stats were insane. He looked humble, saying, "Pleased to meet you," but the data said he was a top-tier combatant. I was internally geeking out over the stats, wondering if there was a character like this in the original game. I didn't remember the name, making me think he might have died early in the original timeline. I noted Kraut had a level cap in the late 700s, putting him in the top 100 strongest people on the continent. An A-rank military skill on top of that was like finding a legendary item. I stared at Kraut, who just stood there looking confused by my intense gaze. I was starting to put the pieces together, wondering if this guy was someone much more famous than he looked. My expression went serious as a wild theory entered my mind. Could it be? I thought, recalling a specific legendary figure from Heroes' Destiny lore. I immediately had a chibi freakout, shaking my head and shouting, "No, no, no, that can't be right." It was too much to process that a legendary Reaper was standing in front of me. I tried to rationalize it, remembering the Messenger of Death was described as thin and gloomy. This Kraut guy was built like a tank and didn't fit the description. check out that muscle. I noted Kraut was way too buff to be the thin reaper from the legends. I was trying to convince myself I was overthinking things. I looked at Kraut's face again and realized those eyes were way too clear and honest. There was no way this friendly-looking knight was a cold-blooded assassin. I decided to drop it for now, thinking there was no point in overthinking without more info. Kraut was just standing there asking for me, wondering why his new boss was acting so weird. I started walking, deciding even if he wasn't a legend, Kraut's A-rank potential made him an asset worth keeping. Kraut followed along, still trying to get a word in. I snapped out of my thoughts as Kraut finally caught my attention. It seems I was a bit too lost in my own head for a second. Kraut looked genuinely worried, asking if I was alright since he had to call my name several times. I played it off, stammering nothing was wrong and asking what the news was. Kraut dropped the news. A merchant named Gerard Mirsas had arrived at the castle to see me. I recognized the name immediately from Gidris's confession. A quick flashback montage reminded me this. Gerard Guy was the merchant who managed the secret vault for the Kosharin family. He was involved in the mining tax diversion and the massive territory debt. I got a sharp look in my eye, realizing the idiot Gidris was telling the truth. This was getting interesting. The merchant had walked right into my trap. I shouted for us to go, charging down the hallway with Kraut struggling to keep up. I was ready to face this merchant and see how deep this financial rot went. As we walked, I had one last thought about Kraut, still doubting he could be the legendary messenger. Kraut just looked surprised by my sudden burst of energy. The three of us marched through the long, ornate hallway of the castle. The scale of the building reminds you just how much is at stake. The heavy doors were thrown open with a loud sound, and an attendant invited us inside. This was where the real battle of wits began. I stepped into the room as a voice greeted me. I looked confident, my red cloak making me stand out as the highest authority. A close-up of my face as the merchant welcomed me. I looked bored and unimpressed, a perfect poker face for a high-stakes meeting. Meet Gerard Mirsas. He bowed deeply, looking like a typical middle-aged businessman with a slightly oily smile. He introduced himself as the head of a small trading company. I kept up the act, mentioning I'd heard Gerard's business was well-respected even if it wasn't the largest. I was buttering him up before going for the jugular. I put on a bright, waving hand smile, telling the merchant talented people are always welcome. It was a total mask, hiding the game master who knew all of Gerard's dirty secrets. Gerard looked humble, claiming I was flattering him. He was trying to play the part of a modest businessman, but you can tell he had his own agenda. I took a seat and got straight to business. I asked why a successful merchant would want an audience with me, since I technically held no official authority yet. I even suggested Gerard should have talked to Russell's proxy. Gerard let out a loud, booming laugh that filled the room. He was trying to break the tension, but Kraut was watching him like a hawk. Gerard leaned in with an oily grin, stating that while Russell was in charge for now, the territory ultimately belonged to me. He was laying the flattery on thick to win me over. The two of us faced each other across the sofa, with Gerard asking who in Shiken would dare defy my decisions. He was telling me he already saw me as the real boss. I played the humble card again, claiming I was just one of two heirs, and telling Gerard not to overestimate me. I was testing the merchant to see how much info he'd gathered. Gerard didn't miss a beat, telling me I was being too humble. He mentioned even if it wasn't official, rumors said the succession struggle was over and I was the winner. My expression sharpened as I noted Gerard had very sharp ears for news that hadn't been made public yet. The merchant had basically admitted he had spies inside the castle. Gerard let out a nervous little laugh as he realized he might have said too much. He was sweating slightly, realizing the naive prince might be sharper than he expected. He quickly tried to apologize if his words were upsetting, but he still wore that smug merchant grin. He was a professional at talking his way out of awkward situations. Gerard bragged about being a capable merchant, claiming if he didn't have access to secret info, he wouldn't be in business. He tried to turn his slip-up into a boast. Gerard's face went dark as he analyzed me. He was shocked because the rumors described me as a naive fool, but the kid in front of him was sharp and cynical. He wondered if I had been hiding my true self for a decade. The thought that a teenager had deceived the entire world for that long seemed impossible to him. The narrative shifted, noting that while the rumors of my personality were wrong, the rumors about my beauty making hearts flutter were 100% true. The flowery background made the point clear. A full-on shoujo manga shot of me looking incredibly beautiful and innocent, surrounded by roses. This was clearly how the world saw me on the surface. Gerard was literally blushing and drooling, thinking I was exactly his type. This merchant was a total creep, and it was making the room uncomfortable. Back in reality, I looked disgusted by the merchant's creepy blushing. I was radiating a dark aura, clearly reaching my limit with the small talk. I slammed my hand down and stood up with a loud sound. I was done being polite and was ready to end this meeting if Gerard didn't get to the point. I growled. I wasn't here to waste time. Telling Gerard if he had no real business, I was leaving. I was exerting my dominance and putting him in his place. A close-up of my glowing blue eyes, looking terrifying. I'd dropped the act and was showing the merchant exactly who he was dealing with. Gerard panicked and bowed deeply, begging me to stay. He knew if I walked out now, his plan to trap the territory in debt would fail. He tried to recover, claiming he was just mesmerized by my striking appearance. He was sweating and desperate to keep me in the room. I looked at him with a deadpan expression, thinking, what's with this guy? And what a creepy face. I wasn't buying the merchant's admiration. I commanded, that's enough small talk, get to the point, as I sat back down. I'd completely taken control of the room, and Gerard was visibly shaken. Gerard finally got serious, saying he was asked how he could help a prince in my position. He was trying to frame his predatory loans as a helping hand. A big text bubble dropped the hammer. I've come to speak to you about a massive debt related to the late Earl Corrin. This was the merchant's main weapon. I played it cool, acting like the debt was news to me. I mentioned the financial officer was in a dungeon for criminal activities, telling Gerard his insider source was gone. Kraut snapped and pointed a finger, shouting about how filthy the merchant was. He was not a fan of people who tried to exploit my family tragedies. Gerard smirked, thinking he was still in control. He pointed out it had been 5 years since the loan, so it was possible I wasn't aware of the paperwork. A shot of Gerard's wicked, jagged-toothed grin. He'd been waiting for this moment, eager to see the look of despair on my beautiful face when I realized the debt was insurmountable. This was Gerard's delusion. He imagined me crying and begging for mercy while roses bloomed around me. This merchant was on a whole other level of delusional. He thought to himself that watching that despair was the ultimate bliss in life. He was a total sadist who enjoyed destroying families for profit. Back in reality, Gerard was still talking about the contract. He explained since 3 years had passed, he could demand repayment of both principal and interest at any time. He looked down with a fake, somber expression, claiming he must not let his joy show. He told me the deadline was in just 2 weeks. Kraut was floored, screaming about 60,000 gold while Gerard confirmed the total. That was an insane amount of money for a territory that was already broke. I just sat there with a completely blank, deadpan expression. I just said, I see, which was not the reaction Gerard was hoping for. Gerard was trying so hard to keep his cool, thinking my calm behavior was painfully adorable. He was still waiting for the breakdown he thought was coming. Poor Kraut was having a total internal meltdown, visualizing a massive mountain of 60,000 gold coins. He realized just how deep the hole was we were standing in. Gerard Meersauce wore a disgusting smirk, thinking he had me right where he wanted me. I just looked back with a half-lidded, bored expression, not intimidated by this merchant's posturing. Poor Kraut was the only one panicking here, sweating bullets as he asked if we could extend the deadline. He knew the territory's coffers were bone dry and 2 weeks was a death sentence. Gerard pulled a not my problem face, looking away with total indifference. He's a professional shark, and he didn't come here to be a nice guy. The scale of this meeting hall emphasized the tension between our two sides. On one side, you have a predatory merchant, and on the other, me, a prince whose legacy was threatened by massive debt. Gerard laid it on thick, claiming with my late father's passing, the creditworthiness of the Shikan territory hit rock bottom. He used logic to back me into a corner, making it sound like business reality. The merchant leaned in, telling me it was time to reciprocate since they waited a whole year to request repayment. He was acting patient, but we all know he was waiting for the right moment to strike. Kraut looked like he was about to have a nervous breakdown, muttering about what he should do. He was out of his league, realizing sword skills can't fix a 60,000 gold coin hole. My eye narrowed as I realized Gerard was just pretending to be generous while giving us no room to breathe. I saw right through the 2-week deadline. It wasn't a courtesy, it was a trap. I leaned forward, catching the merchant by surprise. I began by saying, "You may not know this, but," my voice sounding way too calm for someone who owed a fortune. Gerard looked skeptical. As I mentioned, the annual revenue of the territory exceeds 6,000 gold. He wondered where I was going with this math lesson. I dropped a bombshell, confidently stating that finding a lender for 60,000 gold won't be a problem. I told Gerard there was no need to worry, the ultimate power move. Kraut's face was just pure shock. He looked at me like I'd started speaking a foreign language, wondering where on earth we were going to find a lender that crazy. Gerard let out a condescending laugh, calling me a naive little man. He thought I was bluffing to save face, and he seemed almost entertained by the attempt. The merchant stood up, shrouded in a dark, villainous green aura as he prepared to leave. He told me he'd return soon with a loan agreement, confident he'd already won. I watched him with that same blank stare, totally unbothered. I knew Gerard thought I was a clueless boy, and I was happy to let him underestimate me. A close-up of Gerard's wicked, jagged-toothed grin as he gloated. He was convinced the Shikan territory was practically his already, and he was just waiting for the final paperwork. Gerard bowed one last time, sarcastically wishing me luck before heading for the door. I was a silhouette in the foreground, my silence making the merchant even more overconfident. I glared at his back, my expression turning cold and sharp. I was thinking how satisfying it would be to see this noble hater kneeling and begging for mercy once the tables turned. The merchant's real thoughts were revealed. He's got dark plans for me. He thought I had a pretty face and was planning to sell me off to the slave market once he'd seized the estate. Gerard paused at the door, giving one final fake polite "Thank you very much, my lord." He was laying on the sarcasm so thick you could cut it with a knife. He left with a smug, "Good luck to you," basically laughing in my face. He really thought he'd just walked out of a successful heist. I stood in the middle of the room as the door slammed shut. The silence was heavy, but you could feel me already calculating my counteroffensive. Kraut had lost his mind, trying to calculate how many lifetimes it would take to pay back 60,000 gold on a night's salary. He was doing math for 53 weeks a year and realizing he was doomed. I told Kraut to stop the math and sit down, sounding more annoyed by the distraction than the debt. I'd already moved past worrying and was on to looting. Kraut screamed at the top of his lungs, wondering how I could stay so calm. He was convinced the territory was about to disappear, and he was the only one taking it seriously. I stayed focused, looking at a mental map of the Gorda Highlands. I remembered the prisoner mentioning a secret vault there, and I was certain I knew which ruin it was hidden in. A system notification popped up, showing I was researching nearby ruins. I was using my player knowledge to narrow down the coordinates of the merchant's secret stash. I reflected that the areas outside castles weren't places you could casually stroll through. The world of Hero's Destiny was filled with dangerous monsters that made exploration a nightmare. A shot of the Gorda Highlands, teeming with fierce-looking demi-humans and monsters. It was a high-level zone where one small mistake could lead to a quick game over. A close-up of a monster's red, predatory eye emphasized the danger lurking in the mountains. This wasn't a hike, it was a suicide mission for anyone who didn't know the game's mechanics. The scene shifted back to the castle town at night, looking quiet under the full moon. I was already on the move, walking through the streets with a purpose. Kraut was trailing behind like a confused puppy, asking where we were going at this time of night. He was clearly worried about my mental state after the merchant meeting. I explained I needed someone knowledgeable about the Gorda Highlands. I was thinking about my current assets and which one could serve as a guide through the monster-infested peaks. I thought specifically about an assassin who valued their life, realizing that person might be my most useful tool. I was heading straight for the high-security cells. A random guard looked up with a confused expression as I approached. He wasn't expecting royal visitors during the night shift. Kraut looked at me with a thought bubble about what a creepy face I was making. He was realizing that when I get that look in my eyes, someone is about to have a bad day. The guard snapped into a formal, "Good day, sir," salute as I arrived at the cell door. The discipline in the castle seemed to be improving, at least on the surface. I told the guard he'd worked hard and dismissed him, saying I had business with the prisoner. I wanted total privacy for this negotiation. I entered the room that used to belong to Gidris, but the atmosphere had changed. Kraut followed me in, looking wary of what we were about to find. I was surprised to find the room was organized and cozy. It seemed the new inhabitant had a better sense of interior design than the corrupt former official. I spotted the prisoner and said a quiet, noting she's clearly been busy. The room was tidy, and there was a sense of calm that wasn't there before. Lila stood up, revealing she'd ditched the assassin cloak for a more standard dress. She was looking more refined, though she commented Gidris had nothing but expensive, gaudy things. I gave her a sly grin, telling her she was looking well. I was trying to build some rapport before dropping the heavy lifting on her. Lila stretched out with a casual, "Oh, I'm doing fine, as you can see." She was surprisingly relaxed for someone who tried to kill me a few chapters ago. Kraut didn't like the attitude, shouting at the wretched woman to watch her mouth. He was taking his job as an escort seriously and wouldn't tolerate disrespect toward me. A split-panel reaction shot. Lila looked unimpressed while I kept my cool. The dynamic in the room was shifting as the three of us faced off. I stared her down and dropped the hammer. "You deceived us." I was reminding her that her life was still forfeit no matter how much she'd tidied up. Lila flinched as the subject of the poison came up. I mentioned I lightly retaliated with my own concoction, and you can see the fear creeping back into her eyes. A terrifying image of a reaper represented the Sidis's puppet poison. I asked if she'd heard of it, using the legendary toxin's reputation to maintain psychological control. Lila shouted it was impossible and a lie. She was convinced a noble brat couldn't possibly get his hands on a substance that rare and illegal. I leaned in with a cold stare, telling her that with enough gold, you can get anything. I was telling her my resources were way beyond what she imagined. Lila was sweating now, her eyes shaking as she realized I might not be bluffing. She looked totally cornered by my logic. I gave her a wicked backlit smirk. I enjoyed the fact she was finally realizing just how much danger she was actually in. I mocked her, saying she figured it out faster than expected. I was playing with her head, keeping the pressure on so she didn't try anything stupid. Lila sat back on the table asking, "So, you've come all this way, does that mean you need me?" She's a professional, and she knew when someone was looking for a specialist. My expression didn't change, but I was listening. I waited for her to make the first move toward cooperation. Lila got a rebellious streak, declaring she no longer intended to follow my orders. She suggested that if we shared an intense moment alone, she might reconsider. She was trying to use her charm to find an opening. She even licked her lips with a suggestive smile, trying to bait me. She's an assassin, after all, and she knew a distracted target was a dead target. She told me I'd have to do it very well if I wanted her help. The dialogue was getting spicy, but I didn't look like I was falling for it. Kraut had seen enough, drawing his sword and shouting at the insolent woman. He was ready to end her right there, but I put a hand up to stop him. I looked Lila dead in the eye and told her I was here to give her a chance to survive. I was dropping the games and getting down to the cold, hard reality of her situation. Lila looked skeptical, asking what I meant by that. She'd realized her seduction attempt failed completely, and now she was back on the defensive. I bluntly told her that even if I released her now, she'd be killed the moment she left the castle. I was reminding her that her masters don't like loose ends. I let out a sigh, letting the weight of the situation sink in. I was giving her the choice between certain death outside or a slim chance of survival by serving me. Kraut looked at the assassin with suspicion as I mentioned the feud with the Viscount Kosharin's family. The political landscape was getting messy for everyone involved. Lila sat on the table, listening as I explained that after her failure and sealing Grunbind's mana, her former family would have no mercy for her. She realized she was a dead woman walking to them. I called her the key witness who made all of this possible. I pointed out that to her former masters, she was the ultimate liability that needed to be erased. Lila was stunned, her face turning pale with a shocked gasp. She was finally understanding the full scale of her abandonment. She sat there looking broken, realizing recanting her testimony wouldn't save her. She noted even if she did, it wouldn't fix Grunbind's social death penalty, so her former family would still want her head. I explained that the Kosharin family's plot to seize the territory had been completely crushed. I was laying out the scoreboard, and Lila was on the losing side. I told her coldly that nobles don't let those who hinder their plans live, especially people of low birth. I was telling her that her life was worth zero to the people she used to serve. Lila looked haunted, admitting she'd seen many people die like dogs in service to nobles. She never thought it would happen to her, and the realization was crushing her spirit. She gritted her teeth, her eyes filling with a desperate, localized rage. She groaned, asking, "Why does it have to be me?" finally reaching her breaking point. In a moment of pure panic and fury, she reached out and grabbed a glass pitcher or candlestick from the table. She was moving fast, driven by a need to strike out at anyone nearby. Kraut reacted instantly, but she was already in motion. She screamed for me to die as she lunged toward me. Lila was a blur of motion as she jumped off the table, the glass object raised high above her head. She was going for a lethal blow, her face twisted in a murderous frenzy. A close-up of her hand gripping the improvised weapon as she swung it downward. She was putting everything she had into this one desperate strike. I was caught right in the center of her attack, looking up with wide, shocked eyes. It was the ultimate game-over moment. Could I survive a surprise attack from a cornered assassin? Lila's surprise attack was cut short by a massive hand catching her mid-swing. You could see the glass object she used as a weapon being stopped dead in its tracks by Kraut's sheer strength. The impact sent her flying backward as Kraut shoved her away with zero effort. He let out a disgusted shout at the filthy assassin, while Lila recoiled from the force of the blow. Kraut stood protectively between me and the attacker, his hand on his sword hilt. He was fuming, demanding to know how a common killer dared to defy me. Lila was sprawled on the floor, panting and clutching her side with a pained groan. She looked completely neutralized, realizing the new escort was way out of her league. I remained perfectly calm, telling Kraut that while I appreciated the protection, there was no need to belittle her too much. I looked down at her like a broken tool I was deciding whether to fix or scrap. Kraut bowed his head in a deep apology, feeling like he overstepped his bounds. I just waved it off, reminding him that Lila was technically the one who helped me secure my position as the heir. I started getting philosophical, mentioning that people usually hate the messenger who brings the truth more than the people who ruin their lives. I was lecturing her while she was on the ground, a total power move. Lila looked up at me through her hair, her eyes filled with exhaustion and bitterness. I asked her why she thought that was, forcing her to confront her own bleak reality. I explained that people choose hate over truth simply because it's easier. Lila just sat there on the rug, looking defeated while Kraut watched from a distance. I knelt down to her level, telling her that screaming and crying only makes you feel better for a split second. I was tearing down her mental defenses with cold, hard logic. I flashed a devious, sharp smile, noting her fierce determination to survive was actually her best quality. I'd already decided she was far from useless in my grand plan. Lila stared at the floor for a long moment before finally whispering, "Of course not." She still had that survival instinct, and I just found the exact button I needed to push. She practically screamed that she absolutely won't die with a look of pure, manic desperation. She was clinging to her life with everything she had, which was exactly what I wanted to hear. A close-up of my mouth as I wore a satisfied, knowing grin. I was thinking to myself, she truly can't afford to die, making her the perfect high-stakes asset for my next mission. I said, "All right, this should make you somewhat useful," as I stood back up, looking way too happy. Lila just stared at me with a confused look, like she missed a few pages of the script. I offered her a sweet deal. If she helped me, I'd act as her shield against the Kosharin family's hitmen. I even went as far as saying I'd take care of her family if she had one. Lila looked genuinely shaken, her expression turning suspicious as she asked what I meant by that. The mention of her family clearly hit a sensitive spot she didn't expect me to know. She snapped at me, demanding I leave her family out of it and asking if I was planning to use them as hostages. She was on the defensive now, telling me not to mess with her while cowering in the corner. I just let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed through the room. I was laughing at her fear, telling her not to get the wrong idea because honestly, I wouldn't care if she died right now. I looked down at her with total contempt, saying assassins like her were a dime a dozen. I made sure she knew she was 100% disposable if she didn't cooperate. Lila was fuming, but she couldn't help but agree that to a high noble, she was just a disposable tool. She asked me why I was even bothering to persuade her if there were so many other options. I looked over my shoulder, my eyes cold as I gave her the first reason. It saved me the time of finding someone else. I was being brutally efficient, treating her like an inventory item. The second reason was simple. I already knew she was a survivor. I looked her dead in the eye and told her I'd give her 1 minute to decide her fate. I held up a single finger, starting the literal countdown for her life. I told her if she didn't agree, I'd just grant her the freedom she's been so desperately seeking, which we know is code for death. Lila stared at my hand, the gravity of the choice finally sinking in. There's no other choice, she thought, realizing I had her backed into a corner with 0 exits. She looked down, her long hair covering her face as she reflected on her life as an assassin. She'd been dragged into countless operations to track down and eliminate traitors to her organization. She clenched her fist so hard it shook, deciding that even if she was called selfish, she had to do whatever it took to survive. She admitted she might not like this little runt, but she knew he was her only lifeline. Lila looked up with a resolute expression, saying, "All right, I understand." She'd officially surrendered her pride to stay in the game. I watched her with amusement, noting the Shikin and Kosharin families had already crossed a line they couldn't come back from. I predicted that soon, one of them would disappear. I got a villainous look on my face, declaring I'd benefit way more if the Kosharin family were the ones to vanish. I was finally talking like a true master of the territory. I told Lila that, "Finally, you're starting to think straight," with a wide, creepy grin. I was glad she finally saw things my way. Lila stood up, setting her own terms. She wanted to be treated like a mercenary under a contract, not just a lowly subordinate. She told me she wouldn't be ordered around for anything unrelated to the mission. Kraut was in the background, looking like he was about to blow a gasket at her insolence. I just let out a weary sigh while my new ally started barking orders. Kraut shouted at her again, telling her to watch her mouth when speaking to me. He was taking the loyal knight role way more seriously than I was. Lila put her hands up and told Kraut to calm down, even calling me her employer. She was trying to establish dominance in the room, which Kraut was not happy about. She gave Kraut a sassy look, asking if he was planning on roughing up his new ally. She even brought up the fact he was supposed to value chivalry, which was a total low blow. Kraut was literally steaming with rage, muttering about allies. He looked like he wanted to punch a wall just thinking about working with an assassin. The two of them were just glaring at each other, the tension in the room thick enough to cut. Kraut looked ready to draw his sword while Lila was acting unbothered. Kraut remembered that I mentioned something the other day, and the light bulb finally went off in his head. He was realizing my plan had been in motion for a while. Lila confirmed the location. It was at Golda Highlands. That was where the merchant's secret vault was, right in the middle of her old stomping grounds. A quick flashback of the campsite where the Kosharin shadow troops train war orphans. It looked like a bleak, high-heat camp for Gol's special unit, not a summer vacation spot. Back in the present, Kraut asked what that was as he watched me get excited about the location. I was already planning my next big heist. I pointed a finger and explained that only I could access the window map. I claimed I had a special map detailing the entire kingdom and the area around the Kosharin territory. Kraut looked skeptical, pointing out there was a perfectly good large map in the military council room. He was trying to use real-world logic on a guy with a gamer HUD. I just shouted for them to go and charged out of the room with a massive grin. Kraut was trailing behind, complaining about how much useless energy I had. Kraut held the door open with a polite, "After you, my lord." He still tried to maintain his knightly dignity while following his chaotic boss. Lila and I were walking together, but I kept looking behind me. I wondered why the knight was following us instead of leading the way. Kraut asked if I didn't know the way since he was ordered to be the guide. I snapped back. I did know, but told Kraut to just go on ahead. Chibi-me was practically pushing Kraut forward, shouting for him to just hurry up. Kraut was sweating bullets, thinking knights are supposed to follow their lord, not the other way around. We finally reached the military council room, which was filled with bookshelves and massive tables. I looked around and said a quiet, "This is," as I prepared to show off my map knowledge. Lila and I stood by a table, looking at old documents. The room was dimly lit, adding to the high-stakes atmosphere of our planning session. A top-down view of the map spread out on the table. The narration mentioned this contained the highest level of military secrets on the Ellen continent. I was deep in thought, repeating the words, Golda Highlands. My eyes were searching for that one specific landmark that would lead me to the gold. I declared I found it, pointing my finger at a specific spot on the map marked Golda. I asked the others what they knew about this specific area. Kraut jumped in, saying it was a well-known area where the Kosharan family and Baron Erebon were currently disputing over territory. It sounded like a geopolitical nightmare. A close-up of Kraut's eye as he explained the region had high-quality copper mines, but development had been stalled due to the constant fighting. It was a gold mine nobody could touch. I asked the most important question. Is Baron Erebon on our side? I needed to know who my allies were before I started digging for treasure in a war zone. Kraut confirmed with a yes, that's correct, but I was skeptical. I asked how accurate this map was and when it was last surveyed. Kraut admitted he didn't know for sure, while Lila chimed in that the map seemed outdated but shouldn't have any major errors. She was already proving her worth as a local guide. I asked if she could navigate just by looking at the map, still testing her. Lila gave me a confident smirk and said of course, claiming she'd been playing that area since she was a kid. Kraut asked what was in the Golda Highland that was so important. I revealed my true goal, an ancient ruin I intended to explore. Lila looked genuinely surprised, saying there shouldn't be anything like that. She'd lived there her whole life and never heard of ancient ruins in the Highlands. I went silent for a moment, thinking back. I remembered the adults always saying that place was off-limits, which usually means something huge is hidden there. My expression sharpened as I recalled the warnings. I had realized the off-limits area was the exact location of the secret vault I was hunting. A final close-up of Lila's face, looking stunned. She was realizing I knew more about her own home than she did, and the mystery of the Golda Highlands was about to get deeper. I was in full interrogation mode, asking Lila about the Kosharan family's secret unit. Kraut was standing by looking lost as Lila confirmed it existed, admitting her former bosses had a secret army. I leaned in with a sharp look, asking when they started training these shadow troops. I wasn't just looking for a date, I was looking for a motive. Lila explained she was a 6th-term grad and had been on site for 5 years, so she estimated the program had been running for a while. She looked confused as to why I was so interested in the fine print of her job. Kraut jumped in with some useful info for once, noting the border dispute between the Kosharans and Baron Erebon blew up about 15 years ago. The timeline was starting to look suspicious to me. A close-up of me tapping the table thinking. You could see the gears in my head turning as I connected the dots between the war and the secret units. Kraut asked if I'd found a clue, but I just pulled a classic, no, I don't understand. Yeah, right, buddy. I know you just figured out the entire endgame. The tension in the room was rising as I just stared them down. Kraut was already losing his patience with Lila's casual vibe, snapping at her about her insolent attitude. My two allies were grabbing each other's faces and shouting. Kraut's yelling about being mocked while Lila's screaming about who he thinks he is. These two had zero chemistry and it was hilarious. I stood up to stop the catfight, pointing out the obvious. Scaling up an army like that required a tremendous amount of money. I was saying you don't build a shadow corps on a budget. Kraut was still scowling and nursing his bruised ego in the background. Lila sighed and asked what my point was, bored with a logic lesson. I dropped the hammer. It meant the Kosharan family found a massive new money source somewhere. Kraut was still grumbling, "Idiot," under his breath, while Lila looked like she finally got it. I began by saying, as Krauto said, using the knight's info to confirm the Kosharans got rich around the time the war started. I looked like a detective hero in this lighting. I explained they likely used that secret cash to fund their shadow soldiers and secret ops. It was the classic evil family strategy. Illegal money leads to an illegal army. Lila realized she was just a gear in a much bigger, dirtier machine. She looked down, wondering what those secret operations were really about if money was the main goal. Lila got intense, asking what this money source had to do with the ruins she was supposed to show me. She finally realized I wasn't looking for history. I was looking for their wallet. I dropped some pro-gamer geology explaining copper mines are often near silver mines. I noted copper ore frequently contains silver if you know how to look. Kraut was floored, asking if I was saying the Kosharan family was secretly mining silver. He knew silver mining without a crown license was a straight-to-the-gallows offense. I told them to just use their heads for a second. Imagine discovering a silver vein on your land. That's the kind of secret families kill to keep quiet. I pointed out that no noble in their right mind would report a silver find to the king when they could keep it for themselves. I was exposing the Kosharans as total tax-evading traitors. Kraut asked the final question, so what about the ruins? Lila chimed in that she knew exactly what was up there, though she was still not convinced there was treasure. I got that creepy, confident smile, saying the ruins were the perfect place to hide something. I confirmed the Kosharan vault was hidden in plain sight. Lila was still skeptical, asking how this related to us right now, and if I was crazy enough to start a war just for the funding. She was clearly worried about my sanity. Kraut looked pained as he admitted our territory didn't have the resources to even think about a war. He hated saying it, but we were broke and outmatched. I explained why we couldn't just report it to the royal family. I knew if the king found out, they'd seize the mine themselves and the Shikan territory wouldn't get a single coin. We had to steal it first. I bowed my head, looking defeated for a moment. I admitted the territory was on the verge of bankruptcy and this heist was our only chance to stay afloat. Kraut and Lila watched me with a mix of pity and confusion. I was counting on the money that had been steadily accumulated being right there in the highlands waiting for me. I got a wicked look, noting that since the money was earned illegally, the Kosharans couldn't even call the cops if it went missing. It's money earned illegally? They can't sue anyone? I thought. Talk about a big brain move. The scene shifted to the castle that night under a dramatic blue moon. You could feel the tension as the team prepared to head out on our tax collection mission. Down in the courtyard, Russell shouted for me as he saw the crew getting ready. The veteran soldier looked like he had something on his mind. Kraut looked nervous while Russell expressed his concern to me. The old man asked if it was really okay to trust this inexperienced young man with a mission as dangerous as the Golda Highlands. Russell was being the ultimate party pooper, lecturing me about how rushing into danger only leads to problems. He desperately tried to get me to rethink the whole thing. I gave him a cheeky grin, telling Russell he sounded like a worrying grandparent. I explained it was important for talents like Krauto to grow under pressure so they could reach their goals. Check out Kraut's face. He was blushing because I believed in him that much. He whispered, "My lord," officially becoming my lifelong fan. I dropped the act for a second, looking Russell in the eye and acknowledging leaving the base during unstable times was a significant risk. I wasn't being reckless. I was taking a calculated gamble. Russell was stunned into silence, finally giving in with a quiet, "I see." He realized the fragile prince he knew was officially gone. Russell bowed his head, admitting his own thinking was shallow. He pledged his support, telling the others to serve me with everything they had. The commander got back to business, shouting at the troops to serve me diligently. He warned them, if a minor injury befell me, they were all in deep trouble. Kraut was back to his usual self, giving 2 thumbs up and shouting, "Don't worry and leave it to me." This guy's energy was exhausting, but you gotta love the enthusiasm. Russell delivered a heavy chop to Kraut's head, telling him to do it seriously. Poor Kraut was just getting bullied by the old man while I watched on. The boots of the soldiers hit the ground in perfect unison as they lined up. You could feel the discipline and the serious business vibe as they prepared to march. Russell addressed the entire unit, looking like a total boss in his red uniform. He was making sure every soldier knew my safety was the #1 priority. The troops looked determined, listening as Russell reminded them my wounds were still fresh. He was using my recent recovery as a way to fire them up. He continued the speech, claiming, "I planned this dangerous endeavor solely for the sake of the territory." He was doing a great job of turning me into a charismatic leader in the eyes of the men. The commander gave the final order to follow faithfully, and the soldiers erupted with a thunderous, "Yes," and "Understood." It was a total height moment. A close-up of my eye as I watched the display. I had that game master look again, probably calculating how many loyalty points I just earned from this little scene. The soldiers were all whispering about how no soldier would want a lord so weak he'd attempt suicide. I knew I was winning them over, thinking that raising their loyalty was also my homework. Lila was watching everything from under her hood, her expression unreadable. She was like a shadow in the middle of all this noble drama. The scene shifted to a terrifyingly dark and deep well. This looked like the entrance to the ultimate secret route that only an expert player would know about. Kraut led the way, climbing down a long rope ladder into the darkness. The motion lines showed how deep and narrow this tunnel was. He was holding a lantern between his teeth like an absolute legend, muttering for me to please be careful. He was clearly not comfortable with me being in such a damp, creepy place. I followed right behind, letting out a casual sound. I was crawling through a tight stone tunnel, the lantern light casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. The team finally hit the ground with a splash, their boots landing in a shallow pool of water. We'd reached the bottom, and the real crawl began. Kraut pointed the way, explaining this was an underground waterway leading outside the castle. He looked a bit nervous, noting it was quite a distance to the exit. The lantern light revealed a spooky cave passage filled with water and stalactites. It was a perfect setting for a secret mission or a monster ambush. I shouted for us to go, and Kraut gave a resolute yes as we waded into the dark. We were moving with a purpose now, heading deeper into the unknown. A shot from behind the team as we trudged through the dark, wet tunnels. The light from our lanterns was the only thing standing between us and total darkness. The soldiers were following in a neat line, their torches reflecting off the water. It looked like a scene straight out of a dungeon crawler RPG. We were moving through a foggy area now, looking like ghosts in the mist. The splashing of the water was the only sound in the silent, oppressive cave. Kraut suddenly stopped, his eyes wide as he looked ahead. He shouted, "Here it is," his lantern illuminating a massive stone structure or mechanism. I was huffing and puffing, looking completely worn out by the hike. Kraut announced we'd arrived, and you can tell I was just happy to be out of that water. I reached for a huge iron wheel on the wall, straining and muttering about how hard it was. Kraut praised me for noticing the hidden switch like a true pro. There was a massive grinding sound as the mechanism finally turned. I gritted my teeth, thinking I heard it, as the secret door finally began to open. Kraut reached out a hand, telling me to grab on. He was being the perfect loyal knight, making sure I didn't trip on the final step. I grabbed his hand, and you can see the contrast between my small hand and Kraut's armored glove. We were working together to conquer this hidden stage. I gasped in shock as I pulled myself into the new area. I looked absolutely stunned by what I'd just seen. This was it. The secret of the Golda Highlands was finally revealed. I popped my head out of a hidden trapdoor in the floor, looking like a confused gopher. I asked where we were as I took in the dusty old surroundings. Kraut was already at the exit, leaning against the door of an abandoned watermill. He gave a cheerful smile and gestured outside, telling me to come this way. I got a good look at the outside world and let out a surprised sound. I looked genuinely impressed by the scenery, a nice break from the dark tunnels we were crawling through. An overhead shot showed a small, bustling camp set up right outside the mill. Kraut was being persistent, telling me to please get on the horse. Kraut was practically glowing with excitement, gesturing toward the waiting mounts. This guy really loved his job, but I wasn't matching his energy. I walked past him with a stern look, telling him to shut up with the "my lord" stuff. I pointed out we were heading into a war zone and announcing I was a boss was a great way to get killed. I laid down the new rules, telling him to call me young master from now on. Kraut looked stunned, but gave a simple, "understood." I looked at the group, thinking wearing merchant outfits felt totally awkward. I knew if we didn't look convincing, our stealth mission was a disaster. Kraut shouted back in affirmative, but then tripped over his words, saying, "young master," instead of "my lord." Old habits die hard, and this guy was struggling to keep his mouth in check. I asked if everything I requested was ready. Kraut looked nervous, stammering out a shaky, "yes," but like he was about to deliver bad news. I held up a merchant outfit that looked like it hadn't been washed in a decade, complete with wavy stink lines. I was grossed out, asking if I really had to wear something that smelled this bad. I got a devious smirk and told Kraut if he didn't like the smell, he could switch to the porter's gear. I even teased that we could play newlyweds with Lila, the ultimate threat. Kraut absolutely lost it, screaming that he'd do it. He looked like he'd rather eat dirt than pretend to be newlyweds with a scary assassin woman. Lila just stood there in the background, a dark silhouette under her hood. She looked unbothered by the fact that everyone was terrified of her. Our merchant caravan finally started moving out through the misty forest. It was a humble look for a prince and his elite knights, but perfect for a secret heist. I was looking down with a dark, annoyed aura, clearly tired of Kraut's dramatic outbursts. I thought the knight was saying way too many unnecessary things. The internal tension was palpable as Kraut walked ahead and I fumed behind him. Even in chibi form, you can tell we were not on the same page. Kraut had a serious, slightly sweaty look as he led the horse. He tried to justify his reaction to himself, thinking it wasn't like he was lying about being scared. Kraut tried to be a gentleman for a second, reaching out a hand and asking if they shall go. He tried to bridge the gap with Lila, but it looked awkward. He was left standing there with his hand extended while the hooded figures just stared at him. The silence was deafening and incredibly embarrassing for Kraut. Lila just brushed him off with a cold, "You're in the way." She refused to be called a lady and told him to move, completely crushing his attempt at being nice. I was watching the whole disaster from the sidelines with an awestruck expression. I realized the teamwork in this group was currently non-existent. I watched them walk in opposite directions, reflecting on how bad this interaction between my subordinates really was. This wasn't the synergy I was hoping for. I got a dark, worried look, thinking about the perks of characters getting along. I knew if they didn't sync up, they would start forming factions and fighting each other. A close-up of Lila's face under her hood, looking as gloomy as a rainy Monday. I was genuinely worried one side might die or quit if I didn't fix this vibe soon. I had a dark vision of Kraut and Lila clashing blades in a lethal duel. In my head, a rift between my followers was the quickest way to end up alone and dead. I looked up at the sky, wondering if this world was more than a game program. I thought it might be something created by a god, mirroring the real world with all its complex emotions. I watched Lila walk toward the wagons, wondering if I should secretly help her out to build some loyalty. I was starting to think like a true manager. Kraut snapped me out of my deep thoughts, shouting everything was ready to go. I was back in the present, ready to move on. I told him we needed to get as far from the castle as possible before sunup. Kraut gave a firm, "Yes, young master," and we were finally ready to roll. The caravan moved through the dark forest, with Kraut holding a lantern to lead the way. It looked like a classic RPG travel scene as we left the safety of our territory. A close-up of the wagon wheel turning in the dirt emphasized the long journey ahead. The sound of creaking wood was the only thing breaking the silence. An overhead shot showed the long line of carts winding through a narrow forest trail. It was a slow and steady pace, perfect for avoiding unwanted attention. The team stopped to make camp, with porters and guards sitting around a warm fire. It looked like a peaceful night for a group of simple merchants. The journey continued into the next day, with the wagons rolling along a sun-dappled road. We were making good time, moving deeper into the rural outskirts. Kraut stood in a village market, blending in perfectly as a common merchant near a fruit stand. He was keeping his eyes open for any trouble as we passed through. I was wrapped in my red cloak, sitting on a crate in a busy town square. I was taking a moment to rest while observing the locals of the border region. The caravan traveled across a wide, dusty plain under the hot sun. We were well away from the castle now, reaching the edges of the known maps. Another night at camp showed the men huddling around a small fire to stay warm. They kept their voices low, aware we were getting closer to hostile territory. Kraut and I sat by the fire, with me noting the village we passed today was the last rural one. Things were about to get much more dangerous. I gave the order, tell everyone to remove their disguises. I looked cool with my hair blowing in the wind as I prepared for real combat tomorrow. A pot of stew bubbled over the fire, a final bit of comfort before the storm. Tomorrow, the merchant act was over. I stared into the fire with a fierce, determined look. I declared this was where the real work began, and you can tell I was ready to finally show off my skills. The whole crew was back in their full night gear, looking absolutely formidable. I led the charge with Kraut and Lila right behind me. The wagon wheels were churning up dust as we picked up the pace. There was a sense of urgency now that we'd shed our disguises. An overhead shot showed the caravan moving fast through a forest clearing. We were heading straight toward the Gorda Highlands with everything we had. Kraut suddenly stopped, his eyes narrowing as he sensed something ahead. He was on high alert, looking toward the dense trees for any signs of ambush. Kraut shouted with excitement as he saw the scouts returning from the front. I was right there with him, eager to hear what they found. A scout ran up, breathless, reporting a group of forest Sasquatches blocking the path ahead. This was the first real encounter of the mission. Kraut looked shocked, repeating, 5 of them, in disbelief. He knew 5 of those monsters together was a death sentence for a standard patrol. Someone's gloved hand adjusted a hood, looking calm despite the threat. I already had a plan forming. I turned to Kraut and gave a specific order, lift me into the trees. I wanted a better look at the battlefield before we engaged. Kraut gave a massive, toothy grin and said a simple, yes. He was always happy to help with my unorthodox requests. Kraut grabbed me by the waist, using his massive knight strength to boost me upward. The motion lines showed how much power he was putting into the lift. Kraut was literally holding me like a toddler as we jumped. I let out a surprise sound as I was suddenly flying toward a high branch. We landed perfectly on a high limb, looking out over the forest toward the mountains. It was a great vantage point for scouting the enemy camp. Kraut held me steady as we perched in the treetops. I spotted the monsters in the distance and shouted, "There they are," pointing toward the clearing. A close-up revealed a terrifying forest Sasquatch, a massive gray ape with sharp tusks and a nasty grin. These things looked way meaner than standard mobs. The monsters gathered around poles decorated with skulls, surrounded by a thick, purple aura. It looked like they were preparing for a feast, and we were the main course. Another Sasquatch stared out with glowing red eyes, looking primal. The text warned these things were not to be underestimated. Kraut was still holding me in the tree, asking a practical, "So what's the plan?" He was ready to jump into action whenever I gave the signal. I didn't hesitate and barked orders. First, block the retreat with flaming arrows. Kraut was caught off guard, shouting for me to wait a minute. I looked intense, my eyes wide and mouth open as I shouted my ruthless strategy. Kraut was terrified, screaming at me and asking if I was crazy. He realized I wasn't just playing games anymore. Lila was leaning against a tree, looking at me with a serious expression. She told me, "Young master, I'm sorry, but," like she was about to rain on my parade. Kraut jumped in with a worried look, backing her up. He told me this wasn't about a cool plan, it was about the lives of the soldiers under our command. I looked fuming, my eyes narrowed as I gritted my teeth. I was taking the criticism personally, but I wasn't backing down from my strategy. A wide shot showed the scale of the forest as I stood high on a pine branch, while Lila waited at the bottom. The height difference highlighted how much of a game master I was acting like. I was scowling, thinking that while I knew more about monsters than anyone on the continent, I had no way to prove my gamer knowledge to these guys. I was stuck in a trust me bro situation. Kraut hopped up and carried me down from the tree like a sack of potatoes. I sighed and agreed to drop the fire attack, promising to come up with a better plan that wouldn't get everyone killed. I looked determined as we headed back to camp. I knew even if I convinced Kraut, the rest of the Blue Lion Order Knights were going to be a tough crowd to win over. I walked past Lila with a focused look, my red cloak flowing behind me. I was already running the numbers in my head for the next phase of the operation. The scene shifted to the Knights' camp where everyone gathered around a tent. These guys were waiting for orders, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a sword. I was having an internal meltdown, my face purple with frustration. I thought their current strategy was just leaving everything to chance and individual skill, a big no for a pro gamer like me. I got a serious look, realizing if I didn't prove my own worth and establish some prestige, I was just going to be a burden to the expedition. It was time to level up my leadership. Lila was leaning against a tree, looking cool and collected. She told the group to get ready immediately, signaling the talk portion of the mission was over. An overhead shot showed the wagons and soldiers preparing to move out. The scale of the task ahead was daunting, but I was already 2 steps ahead. I was back in the wagon, sitting alone in the hay and looking deep in thought. I was taking a moment to breathe before the real chaos started. I looked out from the wagon and told Lila I had something to discuss. I was ready to try a new angle on our scouting mission. Lila walked over, looking curious as she faced me. We were starting to develop a weird kind of working relationship. Lila dropped a truth bomb, telling me point blank the current plan was going to fail and most of the expedition would be wiped out. Talk about a total buzzkill. Kraut stood tall in the sunlight, looking like a hero from a storybook. He told me he believed I would save everyone, even if it cost him his own life. I looked at Lila and admitted I understood the risks too. I wasn't as naive as she thought. Lila was getting frustrated, asking me why I was staying silent if I knew the plan was bad. She wanted answers, not quiet brooding. I was gritting my teeth, my face shadowed with stress. I admitted I was trying to figure out how to maintain control over my men while also stopping a total massacre. Lila looked at me with a neutral, almost pitying expression. She was waiting to see if I had any fire in my belly. I got a serious, intense look and told her, "Let's hear your idea." I was finally ready to listen to the professional assassin's perspective. Lila started breaking down monster psychology, explaining that Sasquatches are super protective of their young. Once the fighting starts, their only goal is to hide their babies. A close-up of a Sasquatch's red eyes made it clear that once their kids were safe, a fierce revenge drama began. These things wouldn't stop until everyone was dead. I slumped over, rubbing my head and admitting I knew it wouldn't be easy. I was finally asking Lila for her actual idea to bypass the beasts. Lila looked surprised by my reaction, saying it was unexpected. She had a few things to confirm before she laid out her master plan. I looked toward the forest, noting our goal wasn't to kill all the Sasquatches, but just to sneak past them as quietly as possible. Sneak 100 was the goal. Lila agreed and suggested a diversion. We needed to make the monsters believe their hiding places weren't safe. If the Sasquatches were distracted, the path would open up. We get a strategic overview showing Kraut leading a charge while the Sasquatches are grouped up. This was the tactical map I was visualizing in my head. The strategy continued. If another unit made a commotion near the hiding spots, the Sasquatches would retreat to save their young, creating a gap for the main force. It was a classic bait and switch. I looked cool and composed, admitting I'd thought of that strategy before. I asked Lila if that was the official plan she was proposing. I got a sharp look, asking the most important question, who's going to do it? Someone had to be the bait for this to work. Lila pointed out whoever went for the hiding spots was going to have a mob of enraged, desperate Sasquatches hunting them down. It was the ultimate high-risk job. I shouted that it was a suicide mission, and I'll do it. I was volunteering for the most dangerous role, a total shock to everyone. I was left with question marks over my head as I realized I intended to handle it from the start anyway. I was more confident in my own ability to survive than anyone else's. Lila was pointing a finger like she'd finally caught onto my secret game. She wasn't buying the hero act. An intense close-up of my teal eye as Lila dropped the name of a legendary item. She asked if I had a potion of sirens. My secrets were leaking. Lila's mind was blown, asking how I could possibly know about that. I hit her with cold logic, saying I knew she wasn't dumb enough to sign up for a suicide mission without an ace up her sleeve. I was chilling on the back of the wagon, explaining I needed a specific herb to outsmart the Sasquatch's noses. I was treating this like a walkthrough while everyone else panicked. Lila was looking at me like she was seeing a ghost. She admitted I felt like a completely different person lately, and honestly, she wasn't wrong. I was a whole different beast. Suddenly, I started coughing up a lung, and even Lila looked worried. I tried to brush it off, muttering my crazy plan was actually going to work if we pulled it off. I wiped my mouth, telling her not to worry. I was fully confident, thinking to myself I'd been running around this world since I was 8 in the game, at least. A sparkly chibi Lila, looking totally impressed by my resolve. It was a funny moment in the middle of all the heavy planning. I got a pensive look, wondering what the real reason was for Lila going out of her way to help me. I was trying to figure out her true motivation. I gave a confident smirk, telling her there was no reason not to believe in my plan. I asked if she was okay with not getting any recognition for her help. Lila looked neutral and focused as she listened. She was officially on board with my crazy strategy. I stood up and said I had one final thing to ask before she departed. I was making sure every detail was perfect before we split up. Lila looked up and asked what it was. She was curious what I had planned for her specifically. I pointed out toward the forest road, telling her to look over there. I was showing her the exact terrain where we were going to execute the plan. Lila explained that when dealing with Sasquatches, you should always assume there are more hidden than you can see. These things are masters of ambush. I agreed, noting the ones out hunting would come back and attack the group from behind. We were predicting the enemy's movements before the fight even started. Lila pointed out 2 specific spots in the woods, asking me what I thought about them. She was testing my observational skills. I was certain one of those spots was a goblin settlement, which the Sasquatches loved. I was using my internal map to find the perfect hiding places. I gave a thumbs up and thanked her for the info. I thought we could handle things easily now, and I didn't expect Lila to put herself in too much danger. Lila gave a quiet, "You're welcome," thinking to herself, I would definitely instruct the knights to guard those spots. She was trusting me to lead properly. Lila looked back and said she had a few requests of her own. She wasn't doing all this work for free. Kraut looked up with a suspicious sound from the front of the wagon. He was always wary of the assassin woman talking privately with me. The wagons continued down the road with Lila and me talking in the back. It looked like a peaceful scene, but we were literally planning a massive monster baiting operation. Lila and I looked at each other intensely as the wagons rolled along. The silence between us was loaded with unspoken tension. Lila got a devious smirk, saying that sounded interesting. Whatever request she just made, it was clearly something that amused her. Lila leaned in close, laughing as I stammered for her to wait. She was totally taking control of the conversation now. I looked shocked and flustered while Lila looked thoughtful in the small frame below. She definitely had me off balance. Lila reached out and grabbed me by the face. I was startled, letting out a surprised sound as she pulled me closer. She pulled my face right toward hers, and I was blushing like crazy, muttering a shaky sound. I was not prepared for this much physical contact. An extreme close-up of Lila's mouth as she got right in my personal space. You could practically hear the intense heartbeat sound effect. I was completely red-faced with swirls in my eyes, shouting a panicked, "What?" I'd totally lost my Game Master cool in the face of a girl. Talk about a weakness. I was looking absolutely flustered, blushing like a schoolgirl after that awkward face grab from Lila. I'd completely lost my Game Master cool and was just staring into space. I finally snapped out of it, looking annoyed and muttering trash under my breath. I was clearly trying to play it off, but that red face wasn't fooling anyone. Lila gave me this innocent-looking smile, holding up a little piece of leaf. She told me there was some trash on my face, but she was enjoying how much she'd messed with my head. I turned away, still blushing furiously while the wind whipped my hair around. I realized that even if I knew the game mechanics, real-life interactions were a whole different level of difficult. A hilarious chibi reaction shot of me literally steaming from embarrassment. I thought to myself, I finally understood the feeling of an otaku meeting their favorite idol for the first time. The scene shifted as Kraut called out from the front, shouting for me. Lila and I sat in the back of the wagon, still caught in that heavy silence as we turned to see what was up. Kraut rushed over with a big, goofy smile, asking what happened. I was still looking suspicious and flustered, probably praying the knight didn't see anything. I snapped back with a panicked, "It was nothing," making the whole situation look even more guilty. Kraut was left there looking confused, wondering why the air was so awkward. I regained my composure and gave a formal order. "Ah, that's right, you, go and prepare Lila's equipment." I was quickly changing the subject to get back to the mission. Kraut looked surprised, but he snapped to attention. He's a simple guy. If the boss gives an order, he follows it, even if things feel weird. Lila looked totally serious as she prepared for her part of the plan. I explained she'd be carrying out a solo mission I specifically requested, which was a big gamble. Kraut wasn't buying it, leaning in and whispering his concerns. He bluntly told me he didn't trust the assassin yet and wanted to know what this secret mission was about. I gave him a confident look, telling Kraut I needed him to trust my judgment. I reminded the knight we were all in the same boat now, so we had to work together. A close-up of Lila's face, her eyes looking hollow and pensive. She had a lot on her mind as she prepared to head into the most dangerous part of the Highlands. Kraut reluctantly agreed to go along with it for now. Lila chimed in, saying she'll take her equipment on her own and didn't need anyone's help. Check out the chibi reaction shots. Kraut was floored, shouting a shocked, "What?" I just looked like I was already over the drama, giving Lila a flat look. A wide shot of the camp as the commoners and porters continued their work. The atmosphere was tense, with the sunset casting long shadows across the group. Lila stood by the side of a wagon, starting to shed her outer merchant cloak. Underneath, she was wearing a sleek, dark combat suit that looked way more professional. Kraut was having a total meltdown, blushing intensely and shouting about what she was doing. Even I was in the back looking like a boiled lobster from the sudden transformation. Lila just stood there with her arms crossed, looking cool as a cucumber. She was finally in her element, rocking that high-tier assassin gear like a total boss. A close-up of her new gear. It was clearly designed for maximum agility. She looked ready to ghost through the forest and take down anything in her way. The view from behind Lila showed just how much she stood out now. Kraut was still standing there with his jaw on the floor, completely overwhelmed by her presence. The random porters were stopping what they were doing to gawk, letting out a collective sound of awe. The whole vibe of the group just shifted from humble traders to deadly strike team. Lila reached for a small jar filled with those black, stinky herbs I mentioned. She was getting ready to pull off that high-level siren's potion trick. She started applying the smelly stuff to her face and arms with pure determination. She was totally dedicated to the role, even if it meant smelling like a dumpster fire. Lila's internal monologue confirmed the strategy. She was trying to fool the Sasquatch's noses by applying that specific scent all over her body. It was a classic game master tactic to bypass monster senses. Kraut had to cover his nose, complaining the stench was making his nose curl. He admitted she had some serious nerve for going this far to ensure the mission succeeded. Lila checked her reflection, noting the color of her eyes had changed as expected. She already had her daggers out, looking absolutely lethal in the dappled sunlight. She gave her daggers a professional spin, looking totally focused. She declared she didn't care about any commotion around her. She only had one goal in mind. I watched her with quiet satisfaction. I realized my worries were unnecessary. Lila was a pro who knew exactly how to use the cheat knowledge I gave her. I asked the final question. "It's time, so shall we start the plan?" Lila gave a firm yes, and you can feel the hype building for the actual encounter. I offered to let her take a few soldiers for backup, but Lila shut me down immediately. She knew the knights wouldn't listen to a former assassin anyway, so she was better off alone. Lila looked sharp as she prepared to depart. I gave her the nod, saying, "I see, and I'll leave it to you." It was the ultimate show of trust for me. Lila disappeared into the dense trees, moving like a shadow through the branches. The speed and grace of a Class 3 warrior was no joke. I turned back to the rest of the group and shouted the order, "We are leaving too, let's go." It was time for the main force to move into position. The Blue Lion Knights were running full tilt through the tall grass. They were moving fast, hoping to catch the Sasquatches by surprise before the diversion started. The Knights reached a high ridge and looked down into the valley below. They'd finally found the Sasquatch settlement, and it looked way more crowded than they expected. Kraut led the charge, drawing his blade with a fierce look. He shouted for everyone to finish it off with one shot, aiming for a decisive first strike. The Knights charged down the slope, their blue capes billowing. I noted the wind was blowing right toward the Sasquatch village, while Lila had gone upwind to set the trap. I was looking incredibly intense as I watched the battle unfold. I admitted I hadn't learned everything from watching Lila yet, but I was taking mental notes of every move. A close-up of a massive Sasquatch sniffing the air with a suspicious sound. These things had a sense of smell better than dogs, and it had picked up the Knight's scent. The beast let out an alerted sound and turned around just as the Knights arrived. The surprise element was gone, and this was about to become a full-on brawl. Kraut came flying in from above like a literal meteor. He was aiming for a devastating drop attack to take the lead monster out of the fight early. Kraut delivered a massive downward slash right on the Sasquatch's head. The impact kicked up a huge spray of dust and leaves, but something felt off. Kraut's expression was hard to read as he muttered that it was too shallow. He realized his first strike didn't do nearly as much damage as he wanted. I was watching from the back and I was not happy. I shouted that Kraut was an idiot, saying, "If you're doing a surprise attack, you have to hit the weak spot, not just slash randomly." Kraut was caught totally off guard by my critique, letting out a confused sound. He was expecting praise, not a tactical lecture in the middle of a fight. The Sasquatch recovered instantly and swung a massive, hairy fist right at Kraut's head. The impact sound showed the sheer power of the counterattack. A massive thud echoed as the monster's fist slammed into something. The dust was everywhere, making it impossible to see if the Knight survived that blow. Kraut was holding his ground, blocking the Sasquatch's huge arm with his sword. He was gritting his teeth, thinking, "This is awesome, and we are fighting for real," clearly enjoying the challenge. I was watching with stars in my eyes, thinking it was completely different from the battles I saw on my computer screen. This was real-life, high-level combat, and I was loving it. The Sasquatch let out a thunderous roar, its red eyes glowing with rage. Kraut was still right in its face, totally unfazed by the monster's presence. Suddenly, the knights realized they were in deep trouble. A giant shock appeared as they noticed even more monsters emerging from the shadows of the forest. The forest was filled with roars as the rest of the Sasquatch pack joined the fray. It looked like the diversion hadn't started yet, and the main group was currently surrounded. I was looking pale and stressed, muttering that this was bad. I was wondering if my plan was flawed and if attacking with fire would have been the safer bet. Kraut didn't have time for second thoughts and ordered the Blue Lion Knights to charge. He was going for a full offensive to break the encirclement. I called out for them to wait a second, but the knights were already in motion. I yelled for them to stop, trying to get someone's attention as the chaos began. 2 knights stood guard over me. One introduced himself as Albu, while the other said his name was Thomas. They told me not to stray from their side, taking their job as bodyguards seriously. The clearing exploded into a brutal melee as the knights clashed with the massive Sasquatches. It was a total bloodbath, with steel meeting fur in every direction. Kraut's eye glowed with an intense teal light as he drew on his mana. You could see the blue electricity crackling around him as he prepared his ultimate technique. Kraut was surrounded by a massive vortex of blue mana and lightning. The power level in the room just shot through the roof as he prepared to drop the hammer on the Sasquatches. A close-up of his eye, and he was 100% in the zone. His pupil was tiny and focused, showing the mental strain of controlling this much magical energy. Kraut screamed as the power reached its peak, his face looking pale from the exertion. The lightning was everywhere now, turning the forest into a literal danger zone. A massive vertical pillar of lightning obliterated everything in the center of the clearing. He roared, unleashing a blast that looked like it came from a god. A huge explosion of white light filled the frame as the lightning hit home. I was just a silhouette in the foreground, watching in total awe as Kraut showed off why he was an A-rank talent. The dust started to clear after that massive explosion of energy, leaving a trail of blue sparks in the air. You could see the sheer power that was just unleashed, rippling through the clearing like a physical force. Kraut landed back on the ground with a heavy thud, his boots digging into the grass. He was moving with the grace of a pro, even after taking a gamble like that. He let out a long breath, looking a bit exhausted but satisfied. You could see the sweat on his face as he checked the results of his attack. This guy really left it all on the field. One of the Sasquatches got sent flying back into the trees, its massive body looking like a ragdoll against Kraut's strength. Blue energy was still flickering around the impact zone as the monster hit the dirt. Kraut gave a cheeky, confident grin and announced that he got him. He was looking way too proud of himself, acting like he didn't just almost get his head swept off. I was in the background, and I was not impressed by Kraut's showboating. I was yelling at him to stop acting cool and go help the other knights who were currently fighting for their lives. Kraut snapped back into reality with a panicked gasp. He realized he messed up his priorities and shouted a quick curse as he turned back toward the main fight. A knight got absolutely hammered by a Sasquatch's fist, crying out in pain. The power difference between the common soldiers and these forest monsters was honestly brutal to watch. The poor guy was sent spinning through the air, completely defenseless after that blow. It looked like the formation was starting to crumble under the pressure of the Sasquatch pack. One of the monsters was charging right at a downed knight, its red eyes glowing with murderous intent. These things were fast for their size, and they were closing the gap in seconds. We see a close-up of a terrified eye reflecting the massive beast looming over it. The shadow of the Sasquatch was covering everything, and it looked like game over for this soldier. Just in the nick of time, Kraut slid in and delivered a savage blow to the Sasquatch's head. He was using his momentum to smash the beast aside, his face twisted in a look of pure focus. Kraut was screaming at the top of his lungs, telling the knight to quick, grab the sword. He was holding the monster back with everything he had, but you could tell the weight was massive. The knight scrambled to his feet, shouting his thanks to the captain while a Sasquatch was pinned down in the background. It was a total mess out there, and they were barely holding the line. Kraut glared at the remaining monsters, realizing they didn't have the luxury of taking these guys on one by one. He was looking for a way to end this quickly before more subordinates fell. The battle was getting even more intense, with Sasquatches throwing boulders and smashing trees. A giant shadow loomed over the knights as they prepared for the next wave of attacks. Kraut let out a powerful slash, his blade glowing with that signature blue mana. He was a one-man army right now, cutting through the chaos to protect his men. Blood splattered across the frame as another Sasquatch took a hit. The monsters were roaring in pain and rage, turning the forest into a literal slaughterhouse. Kraut was panting heavily, sweat pouring down his face as he muttered a curse, saying, "There's no end to them." Even with his stats, the sheer numbers of the pack were starting to wear him down. Another Sasquatch leaped into the fray, and Kraut noted that even the old ones were way stronger than he initially thought. He was starting to realize that his gamer logic might have underestimated the hard mode of this world. I was watching from a distance, my eye glowing green as I scanned the battlefield. I spotted something crucial and pointed toward the trees, shouting for them to look over there. Kraut turned his head just in time to see a massive shadow moving through the brush. He was on high alert now, realizing that they missed a sneaky one in their initial count. A giant blade came crashing down, splitting the air with a terrifying whistle. The power behind this hidden attacker was on a whole different level compared to the others. A Sasquatch with glowing red eyes and a nasty scar snarled at them. This thing looked like the alpha of the pack, and it was clearly not happy that its group was being cut down. Kraut was gritting his teeth, blood dripping from his arm as he thought that, now's our chance. He was ready to bet everything on one final clash with this boss-tier monster. A line of Blue Lion Knights stood ready, their shields locked and spears leveled. They were trying to regroup, but you could see the exhaustion on their faces. Kraut was screaming that they were wrong as he realized the formation was too slow. The Sasquatch was already mid-leap, and the Knights were about to get smashed. He remembered their initial scout report said there were 8 of them, but now he realized one was missing. This guy was sharp, but being sharp doesn't help when you're being ambushed. Kraut looked genuinely panicked, shouting for it not to be as he scanned the area for the last monster. He knew that a missing Sasquatch usually meant an assassin type was lurking nearby. A terrifying shot of the missing Sasquatch. It was smaller, faster, and its eyes were glowing with a deep purple aura. It was standing right in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Kraut shouted that one as he spotted the purple-eyed beast charging. He was trying to intercept it, but he was already engaged with 2 other monsters. The monster wasn't going for the Knights though. Kraut screamed in horror as he realized it was aiming for me. The alpha had a brain after all, going straight for the VIP. I was looking toward the charging beast, and man, I looked surprisingly calm. I wasn't running, I was just watching it with my sharp blue eyes, like I was waiting for a specific frame to dodge. Kraut was desperately trying to reach me, shouting for someone to catch it and hurry. He was pushing past his limits, but he was still too far away to stop the impact. A knight threw themselves in front of me, shouting for me to please step back. He was trying to be a human shield, but against that purple mana, it was looking like a suicide mission. Suddenly, a massive pillar of blue lightning struck the ground. Someone was letting out a roar of, "You scoundrel," as the whole clearing got lit up like it was noon. The knight who tried to protect me was left blinking in the aftermath, letting out a confused sound as the lightning dissipated. I was just standing there behind him, looking totally unfazed. The knights were all staring at the crater, wondering if they got him. The smoke was thick, and the silence that followed the lightning strike was deafening. Dust and sparks were falling all over the field. It was that classic, did the attack work moment in every boss fight. A massive, hairy fist emerged from the smoke. The lightning didn't finish it off, it only made it angrier. The Sasquatch was glowing with a chaotic purple energy now. The protective knight let out a shocked gasp as the beast loomed over them again. It was way more powerful than it was a second ago, and its physical stats had clearly been buffed. The Sasquatch swung its fist, and the motion lines were just insane. It was a blur of speed and power that was headed straight for the knight's head. The impact was insane. Dust and debris went flying as a massive shockwave ripped through the clearing, and you can see me in the back just trying to hold my ground while everything around me got wrecked. I was looking completely overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the destruction. I was staring into a literal wall of exploding earth, realizing the power level here was way beyond anything I expected. A massive, dark silhouette loomed over the battlefield, hidden behind a cloud of dust and wind. It looked like the boss monster had finally entered the chat, and its presence alone was enough to change the entire vibe. A close-up of me, and man, I was sweating bullets and panting for air. The look of pure terror in my eyes told you everything you need to know. I knew we were in deep trouble. Thomas wasn't letting me down though. He stood firm with his sword drawn, shouting for me to stay close because things were getting way too dangerous. Meanwhile, a giant hairy fist was already closing in on us. The Sasquatch brought its massive arm down with a bone-shattering smash. The speed and force behind this strike were terrifying, turning the ground into a crater in an instant. Kraut was fuming, his face contorted in rage as he screamed, "You bastard!" He was charging back into the thick of it, his eyes glowing with that intense teal light. He hit the Sasquatch with a barrage of lightning-infused slashes. The blue energy was everywhere, looking like a literal storm was centered right on top of the beast. I was being escorted back by Thomas, but I was still looking over my shoulder at the fight. I knew if Kraut didn't finish this now, the whole group was toast. Thomas got hit and fell to one knee, grunting in pain. He was reaching out, shouting his own name, which was a bit weird, but hey, battle stress is real. I pointed toward the back of the clearing, screaming at them to deal with the old Sasquatch first. I realized that if we didn't take out the leader, we were going to get wiped out by the pack. Thomas was looking back, panting and sweating. He was trying to hold on to his reason, but he told me if we just held on a little longer, backup might arrive. I wasn't buying it, my face twisted in desperation. I asked if someone would come to help us if we held on. I was pointing out the obvious. We were in the middle of nowhere, and we were on our own. Thomas was struggling with the order, his hand shaking on his sword hilt. He was telling me to think carefully before sending him away to certain death. I pointed out that if the frontline soldiers fell, Thomas would have to face 2 Sasquatches on his own anyway. I was using that cold gamer logic to show that I would be in even more danger if we didn't act now. Thomas looked down, completely torn between his duty and his survival instincts. He remembered that Senior Knight Kraut told him to never leave my side, which made this decision even harder. I lost my patience and screamed Thomas's name at the top of my lungs. I asked if he was planning to defy my direct orders, which was basically the ultimate threat in this society. Thomas's expression changed, a look of resolve finally crossing his face. He whispered that he was a knight too, and you can feel his pride finally overriding his fear. The knight stood tall and drew his sword, admitting a knight's duty was to follow their lord's command no matter what. He gave a final understood and prepared to charge the alpha. I watched him go with a grim look, simply saying, "All right." I was sending a man to his death and I knew it, but I believed it was the only way to clear the stage. A shot of me moving through the high grass looking for something. I muttered to myself that I thought this was the place as I searched the edge of the clearing. The wind was whipping around me, and I was looking small and vulnerable in the middle of the monster-infested woods. I was breathing hard, the steam from my breath visible in the cool air. My eyes widened as I finally spotted my target. I shouted, "There!" I found him, and the look on my face was a mix of relief and intense focus. I had finally found my win condition. We open with a grim scene as Albu lies motionless in the grass, his armor shattered. The wind is whipping through the clearing, making the whole situation feel even more desperate. I looked horrified as I took in the damage. I whispered a panicked sound, realizing my knight was in much worse shape than I thought. A close-up of a blood-soaked bandage or piece of cloth. The red stain was spreading fast, and the dripping sound effects were just adding to the tension. Albu was sprawled on the ground, looking like he was already halfway to the afterlife. The pool of blood under him was getting bigger by the second, and he wasn't even moving. I rushed to his side, screaming for Albu to stay with me. I was trying to stay calm, telling myself I needed to stop the bleeding and get the armor off to see the actual wound. I looked down with a grim expression, muttering, "Well?" I was already thinking 3 steps ahead, but you can tell the weight of a life in my hands was hitting me hard. I pulled back the fabric to reveal a massive, ugly bruise on Alba's stomach. It was clear we made it through the worst of the immediate impact, but the real trouble was just starting. The text confirmed the nightmare. Albu's stomach was swelling due to severe internal bleeding. This wasn't something a simple bandage could fix. I pulled out a small vial but immediately realized it was useless. I shouted that this low-grade potion wouldn't do, frustrated by my limited inventory. I looked around desperately, thinking I needed to find a healing mage as soon as possible. If I didn't, I'd be forced to use a much rarer mid-grade potion that I couldn't afford to waste. I gripped my sword and made a silent vow for Albu to stay alive. I was about to head into the heart of danger to find a solution. I took off at a full sprint into the dense forest. I yelled back at the unconscious Albu to hang in there until I come back. Talk about high-stakes drama. A heartbreaking close-up of Albu's face, his eyes barely open and glazed over. He looked like he was slipping away, and he was all alone in the grass. Suddenly, a massive thud echoed through the woods as a Sasquatch hit the ground. The force was so strong it kicked up a huge cloud of dust and leaves. A massive Sasquatch with bright red fur stared into the distance. This thing looked like it stepped straight out of a nightmare, and it was looking for trouble. I was peeking from behind a tree, sweating bullets. I thought to myself, just as I thought, Layla was right. The assassin's intel was proving to be 100% accurate. The red beast was standing in the middle of a literal goblin settlement, surrounded by carnage. I realized this was the specific hunting ground the Sasquatches used. The Sasquatch let out a blood-curdling roar that shook the very trees. It was a primal display of power that would make any normal person turn and run. I covered my ears, letting out a pained groan as the sound waves hit me. I was way too close to the action, and I knew it. I looked at the scene with pure revulsion, muttering that it was disgusting. It seemed the Sasquatch's eating habits were even worse than its roar. We see a gruesome shot of blood and gore on the forest floor. I realized the stakes had never been higher. One wrong move, and I was just another pile of meat. I was trembling, my face shadowed as I admitted I was scared. I knew Layla probably set a trap, but the plan was still terrifyingly dangerous. A terrifying close-up of the monster's jagged teeth. I realized this wasn't like the game I played at home. There was no keyboard to protect me here. I was panting in the shadows, trying to get my breathing under control. The silence of the forest was heavy, broken only by the monster's heavy footsteps. I had a quick mental image of Albu looking pale and close to death. This was the motivation I needed to stop shaking and start acting. My expression turned to steel as I told myself, "It's fine, I won't die." I was officially entering Game Master mode. I stepped out from my hiding spot, my boots hitting the grass with a resolute thud. I declared that I had to do this with total conviction. I stood in the open and shouted, "Hey!" at the top of my lungs, drawing the monster's attention. I was acting as the ultimate bait. I got a fierce look in my eyes, my aura practically sparking with blue energy. I yelled that today is as I prepared my move. The massive Sasquatch towered over me, looking like a mountain of muscle. I finished my sentence with a thunderous, "Death Day." The monster lunged forward with a screech while I readied my sword. The motion lines were wild, showing just how fast this beast was. I unleashed a series of lightning-fast slashes. The blue energy from my blade carved through the air as I countered the monster's charge. The Sasquatch roared in agony as blood sprayed from its wounds. I wasn't just hitting it, I was systematically tearing it down. The monster's face was a mask of pure rage and pain, its eyes wide with shock. It never expected a weak human like me to land such a devastating blow. The Sasquatch hit the ground with a massive thud. I stood in the aftermath, my red cloak blowing in the wind as the beast groveled at my feet. A close-up of the monster's teeth as it snarled, its pride completely shattered. It was beaten, and it knew it. Another Sasquatch suddenly loomed behind me, casting a massive shadow. It looked like I'd been surrounded by the pack. I looked over my shoulder, my eyes wide with the realization. I wasn't panicking though, I was just calculating the next move. A massive explosion of white fur and dust filled the frame. It looked like a huge impact just happened, and someone was yelling in surprise. I was struggling to hold something back, sweating and yelling for it to take this. I was putting every ounce of my strength into this final gambit. A close-up of my gloved fist punching or triggering a mechanism. A sharp click echoed as the trap was finally sprung. A massive net or cage made of vines exploded out of the ground. It was headed straight for the sky, catching the Sasquatch right in its tracks. The beast was caught. It was roaring and thrashing as the thick vines wrapped around its limbs, pinning it to the earth. The system identified the trap, Arachne's vine. These weren't just normal plants, they were magical restraints designed for high-level mobs. I explained my siren's potion trick. I attached the anesthetic to the thorns of the vines, making sure the monster would be knocked out the second it started struggling. Lila's intel was perfect. Most monsters can be captured without any real struggle if you just use the right tools and a bit of siren's potion. The Sasquatch let out a final, weak groan as its eyes rolled back. It worked, I thought, watching the massive beast finally go limp in its bonds. I stood tall and pointed my sword forward, shouting for us to go. I wasn't wasting a single second now that the path was clear. I let out another battle cry, looking more like a warrior than I ever have. I was finally embracing the hard mode reality of this world. I brought my blade down hard, right through the skull of the pinned beast. The sound of the crack was brutal, ending the fight for good. I felt the sword hit bone, a sensation that clearly rattled me. I thought about this feeling, realizing that killing in real life was nothing like a game. Blood sprayed everywhere, soaking the grass and my cloak. It was a messy, violent end to a terrifying encounter. I looked at my hands, my expression one of pure disgust. I muttered that it was disgusting, clearly traumatized by what I just had to do. I stood among the wreckage, thinking about how I never imagined I'd actually be involved in killing. I'm a gamer, not a murderer, but in this world, the line was getting blurry. I looked down at the dead Sasquatch, realizing I just took the life of a living creature with my own hands. The weight of it was clearly visible on my face. I was covered in blood, looking absolutely broken. I shouted about how detestable this was at the empty forest, grieving my lost innocence. From the shadows, a mysterious goblin-like figure watched me. It noted I fought evenly with a Class 4 knight, but for my level, I seemed surprisingly weak. Talk about a harsh review. I sensed a presence and snapped my head toward the brush, my eye glowing with an intense blue light. I let out a surprised sound as I realized I was still being watched. The chapter ended with a massive blast of blue energy lighting up the forest. Something, or someone, had just made a very loud entrance. An extreme close-up of my eye, and man, the intensity was real. I was covered in blood splatters, and my teal pupil was wide with a mix of shock and pure adrenaline as I stared down a new threat. The scene was absolutely brutal. One of our knights was lying there in a pool of his own blood. This wasn't a training exercise anymore. The stakes just hit a whole new level of real. I was on the ground, sliding through the grass and looking completely wrecked. I was covered in dirt and blood, trying to catch my breath while the chaos of the forest surrounded me. Check out this creepy little dude. A small, pale, goblin-like creature was crouching right in front of me. Its eyes were glowing pink with murderous intent, and it looked ready to pounce. I looked up, my face pale and eyes wide with terror. I was completely cornered, looking at the creature while the bloodied body of my knight lay just a few feet away. We get another look at Albu, and it wasn't looking good for our boy. He was lying motionless in the grass, and the amount of blood on his white armor was making me think we might be down a knight. I was absolutely fuming now, my face cast in deep shadow as I gritted my teeth. I let out a low, dangerous sound, and you just know I was about to snap. The goblin was actually talking back. It screamed, "You bastard," as it charged forward with a surprising amount of speed. This thing had way more personality than your average mob. I wasn't playing around and swung my sword with everything I had. The white motion line showed I was aiming for a total decapitation, but this little monster was slippery. Another intense eye shot. You can see the reflection of the goblin in my pupil. I was tracking its every move, refusing to let this thing get another hit in. I unleashed a flurry of slashes, sparks flying everywhere as my blade connected. I was pushing the goblin back, my face a mask of pure, concentrated rage. I was panting hard, my hair messy and face covered in grime. I was realizing that fighting for your life was a lot more exhausting than clicking a mouse. I delivered a massive downward strike, my sword glowing with a faint blue light. The impact was so heavy it literally kicked up the grass and dirt around us. The goblin barely dodged, and I muttered a shaky, "That was close." I was realizing that one small mistake was all it took for a game over in this world. I had a moment of realization. I was only saved because my arms were shorter than expected. I was analyzing my own physical limitations in the middle of a deathmatch. I looked down at my gloved hand, which was shaking from the effort. I admitted my body was way too weak, and I could barely even swing my sword properly anymore. The purple goblin lurked in the tall grass, looking like a literal demon. I noted that the monster actually had a longer reach, making this fight even more unfair. I was doing some quick math in my head. I thought if I combined the length of my sword and my arm, I might have just enough range to score a winning hit. The goblin jumped high into the air, spinning toward me like a purple blur. It was a high-flying attack that was headed straight for my neck. I planted my foot firmly in the grass, bracing myself for the impact. I wasn't running away this time. I was setting up for a counterattack. Check out that massive swing. I spun my blade in a giant arc, creating a wall of steel between me and the flying monster. Yes, the blade connected right with the goblin's head. Blood sprayed across the frame as I finally landed a solid, clean hit on the little scoundrel. "But wait," I screamed. "Oh no!" as I struggled to pull my sword back. It looked like the blade got stuck, or the monster was trying to drag me down with it. A massive impact as the goblin crashed into the ground. The force was so strong, it sent a shockwave through the grass, kicking up a huge cloud of dust. I was slumped on the ground, sweat pouring down my face. I was panting, thinking to myself that I barely avoided being cut down to the shoulder. That was way too close. The goblin was actually standing back up. I was wide-eyed with panic, shouting that it was coming again. This thing just wouldn't stay down. I swung again, but my movements were getting sloppy from exhaustion. The goblin was dodging easily now, looking like it was just toying with me. A shot of me looking absolutely desperate, blood dripping from my sword. I was reaching my limit, and I knew I needed to end this right now. I used a kick. I drove my boot right into the goblin's chest, sending the creature flying back. That was some solid CQC for me. A dagger was spinning through the air toward the monster. I screamed for it to die, with everything I had left, putting all my hopes on this one throw. My face was a mask of pure desperation as I screamed for the monster to die. I was covered in so much blood, I looked like a different person. The goblin looked up, eyes wide with shock as the blade closed in. It never expected a weak human like me to have a hidden weapon ready to go. A massive impact as I slammed the creature right into a tree. I was using all my momentum to make sure this one stuck. I was panting, leaning forward with a weary, bloodied smile. I finally managed to stop the little monster, but I looked like I was about to collapse. The goblin's legs were dangling from the tree trunk. It wasn't moving at all, and the panting sounds showed I was just trying to stay conscious. The goblin's feet were totally still. It looked like I actually pulled it off my first real kill in this new world. I gripped the hilt of my sword, which was buried deep in the tree. My hand was shaking, and you can tell the weight of what I just did was starting to sink in. A wide shot showed the gruesome scene. The goblin pinned to the tree by my blade. It was quiet now, but the forest felt a lot more dangerous than it did 10 minutes ago. I was staring blankly at the ground, my eyes vacant. I looked like I was in total shock, my brain trying to process the fact that this wasn't a computer screen. I was sweating bullets, my face pale behind all that blood. I looked like I was about to break down right there in the middle of the woods. I couldn't take it anymore and let out a loud sound as I started to vomit. The reality of taking a life was hitting my stomach hard. I was hunched over a tree, throwing up my guts. I realized with a crushing weight that this was nothing like a game. The smells, the blood, it was all way too much. I was trembling, sweat dripping from my face as I admitted I really thought I was going to die. I just got a brutal reality check. Suddenly, a familiar ping echoed through the air. I looked up, confused, as my glowing blue status window started popping up out of nowhere. The system message confirmed the victory. You have defeated a D-class monster. It even noted that since I fought an overwhelmingly strong enemy, my rewards were getting a massive boost. Another notification popped up. You have defeated an F-class monster. It seemed there were more than just the one I fought directly. Level up. I jumped all the way from level 8 to level 11 in a single fight. I even unlocked a new reward, inventory. Talk about a massive power-up. I heard something in the distance and snapped my head around. I was still on high alert, my eyes wide and ready for the next fight. It was Kraut. He was running through the tall grass toward me, shouting for me and asking if I was safe. He looked genuinely worried about me. Kraut arrived and was absolutely floored by what he saw. He was blushing from the run, but his face turned to shock as he yelled in disbelief. The knight was staring at the goblin pinned to the tree with total disbelief. He never imagined a weak prince like me could take down a monster like that on my own. A close-up of the goblin's head pinned to the tree. It was a grisly reminder of my first real battle and the hidden power I was starting to tap into. Kraut rushed to my side, grabbing me by the shoulders. He was frantic, shouting and asking if I was hurt at all as he checked for wounds. I was surrounded by the Blue Lion Order knights now. They all looked like they'd seen a ghost, while I just tried to act cool and muttered that I was fine. Kraut pointed out that we were lucky. The other Sasquatches retreated after we killed 2. I was looking off into the distance, my mind already on something else. I got a cold, serious look and told Kraut it wasn't luck. I credited Lila's plan for our success, showing I still valued my Game Master strategy. Suddenly, I snapped my fingers and yelled, "Oh, right. I just remembered something incredibly important that I forgot in all the excitement." I grabbed Kraut by the front of his armor and demanded to know where the soldier who was lying over there was. Kraut looked totally confused by the sudden aggression. I was screaming for Albu, a vision of the bloodied knight flashing in my mind. I was desperate to know if my friend was still alive. Kraut just pointed behind us with a simple sound. A close-up of Kraut's finger pointing toward the woods. He said, "He's over there," calmly, while I looked like I was about to have a heart attack. I turned around, my face looking totally haunted. The dark purple aura behind me showed just how close I was to my mental breaking point. The scene opened with a heavy, reflective mood as leaves drifted across a clear blue sky. I admitted that while my goal was survival, the reality of losing people was starting to sink in. A heartbreaking close-up of Albu, lying dead with blood pooling from his mouth. I was absolutely crushed, crying out his name in a desperate final apology. I was hunched over on my knees, my face hidden in shadow as I spiraled into guilt. I kept beating myself up, thinking that if I hadn't been so careless, things would be different. From behind me, the rows of knights stood in silence, watching me mourn. The weight of the loss was hanging over the entire group as I continued to whisper, "If only I." Kraut stepped up, trying to be the voice of reason while looking down at me. He told me straight up that it wasn't my fault and that the soldier died an honorable death in battle. I wasn't having any of that honor talk and snapped back, shouting, "Don't be ridiculous." I'd officially reached my breaking point with the knightly platitudes. I looked absolutely unhinged, my face covered in blood and eyes wide with grief-fueled rage. I screamed that there was no such thing as an honorable death. To me, death was just death, and it was always a tragedy. Kraut looked genuinely taken aback by my outburst. He tried to soften his tone, acknowledging that this was the first time I had lost a subordinate and that my reaction was totally understandable. The rage faded back into hollow despair as I let out a quiet sound. I was just sitting there in the grass, surrounded by a dark, oppressive aura. A wide shot showed the grim reality of the battlefield. 2 knights were preparing to move a body covered in a white sheet. The Blue Lion Order stood by, looking like a bunch of statues in the middle of the forest. I was shown in profile, looking completely drained and defeated. My Game Master confidence was nowhere to be found right now. Kraut reported the final butcher's bill, 3 dead and 1 injured. He tried to put a positive spin on it, saying that considering the circumstances, the damage was actually light. I didn't care about light damage. I just stared at the ground and muttered that it was all my fault. I was carrying the weight of those 3 lives on my shoulders alone. I reflected that if I had just used my meta-knowledge to force a better plan from the start, no one would have had to die. I was realizing the difference between playing a game and leading real people. A vertical montage showed the trap that saved me and Albu's bloodied face. I realized I only survived because of Layla's prep and because Albu literally acted as my shield. I slammed my gloved fist into the dirt with a frustrated sound. I was tired of being the one who needed protection while everyone else paid the price. I let out a guttural scream of pure agony. This was the moment the gamer truly died, and the Lord started to be born from the pain. The other knights were watching this display with worried expressions. They'd never seen me this vulnerable or this intensely emotional about their lives. Kraut looked down, asking the hard question, what do we do with the bodies of those who died in battle? He was looking for orders to get us back into a mission mindset. I stood up, my eyes sharp again despite the grime on my face. I gave a firm order to retrieve the bodies and take them back if the situation allowed it. I looked over my shoulder with a cold, resolute gaze, telling them to make sure they followed through. I was done with the morning. It was time for action. Kraut snapped to attention, shouting for them all as he began relaying my commands to the rest of the unit. Kraut was actually looking a bit impressed in the background while the other knights started moving. My aura had shifted from despair to a sharp, commanding presence. The knights were whispering among themselves, moved by how much I cared for their fallen comrade. They were starting to see me as a lord worth dying for. They all stood tall and saluted, swearing on their lives to protect me at all costs. The loyalty meter just hit the max level for this unit. Kraut noticed the shift, thinking to himself that everyone's expressions had completely changed. The morale of the troop was higher now than it was before the fight started. I looked at my men, and Kraut realized I had finally won over their hearts. This was the true turning point for my leadership. A wide shot of the forest clearing showed the knights gathered around the wagons. The immediate crisis was over, but the mission was still very much active. Kraut approached me by the horse, reporting that the bodies had been treated with preservation potions. Everything was ready for us to move out. The knights stood in a neat line, their blue capes fluttering as they waited for the signal. You could feel the new sense of discipline and purpose radiating from them. I looked back at my troop, noting that the way they looked at me had completely changed. I was no longer just a young master. They had to babysit. Kraut stood next to me, telling me that this wasn't the time to be wallowing in the past. He was pushing me to keep moving forward. I agreed, telling myself it wasn't the time to be feeling guilty. I was locking my emotions away to focus on the goal. I stood at the head of the caravan, looking like a true protagonist. I shouted to the soldiers, praising them for their work against the Sasquatch and telling them we needed to march to our destination immediately. I ordered the healthy to take care of the wounded, making a grand declaration that we will never abandon a comrade. This was the ultimate main character speech. I pointed forward with total authority, asking if they understood. The knights responded with a thunderous, "Yes, my lord," that echoed through the trees. A title card dropped 1 hour ago. It looked like we were about to get a flashback to what was happening elsewhere while the main fight was going down. A close-up of a dark boot stepping silently onto the forest floor. Someone was moving with extreme stealth through the brush. It was Layla. She was back in her hooded cloak, standing in the middle of a dense thicket. She looked focused and ready for her part of the plan. A Sasquatch was lurking in the shadows behind a tree, its red eyes glowing. It seemed Layla wasn't as alone as she thought. Layla sensed the threat, thinking, "A curse." They noticed me. She was trying to be a ghost, but these monsters had better senses than she expected. She reacted instantly as a Sasquatch swung at her. Layla was a blur of motion, her cloak billowing as she narrowly avoided a massive fist. Layla retaliated with a sharp, mana-infused blade or projectile. The bright white flash showed she wasn't holding back against these forest beasts. She was mid-fight now, spinning through the air to dodge another Sasquatch. Her agility was insane. She was literally dancing around these massive creatures. Layla delivered a fast, lethal-looking strike, blood splattering through the air. She's a professional assassin for a reason, and these mobs were finding out the hard way. She retreated to a high branch, breathing hard as she told herself she had to hurry. Time was of the essence for her part of the bait mission. We see a close-up of a rope tied firmly to a thick branch. This was part of the elaborate trap I mentioned earlier. Layla dived off the branch, her sword leading the way. She was using the height to add some serious momentum to her next attack. She landed perfectly on the ground, crouching low as she checked her surroundings. She was like a shadow moving through the green labyrinth. Layla stood in a clearing, surrounded by the heavy footsteps of an approaching monster. She looked completely unfazed by the looming threat. A massive Sasquatch emerged from the trees right behind her, its silhouette covering her completely. This thing was huge compared to the ones we fought earlier. The monster let out a roar or made a heavy move, but Layla was already preparing her counter. She was baiting it into the perfect position. She looked back over her shoulder with a sharp, determined look. She was playing a dangerous game of cat and mouse with a very large cat. Layla gave a confident smirk, thinking they took the bait. Everything was going exactly according to my script. She faced the beast head-on, declaring, "All right, with this." She was about to spring the final part of her trap. The Sasquatch looked absolutely furious, its teeth bared as it prepared to crush the tiny human. It had no idea what was coming next. A sharp cracking sound echoed as a rope or trigger snapped. Layla's trap was finally going off, and the timing was perfect. The Sasquatch swung its massive arm, but Layla was already gone. The impact kicked up a huge cloud of dust and sparks, showing the beast's raw power. Layla was caught in the middle of a massive blast of light or magical energy. She shouted in shock as something completely unexpected happened in the middle of her mission. Big mistake.